Howard Hamlin is a very extensive but underrated character in the Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul universe, especially throughout the first 5 seasons of Better Call Saul leading up to its 6th and final season. Even though Howard is often overlooked and disregarded throughout the course of the show, he actually goes through an incredibly expansive character arc and transformation. Due to this, he's always been one of my favorite characters to analyze. Hey guys, Kiwi here, and welcome to my next full story of Character Spotlight and Retrospective. Today we'll be dissecting the character Howard from Better Call Saul, which I've been excited to do for some time now. But before we start digging into Howard's entire journey, let's first quickly hear a word from today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Exter. Exter is known for inventing the first trackable wallet, and with their help, I'm on a mission to upgrade the rest of your carry essentials. They make sustainable wallets, bags, and accessories that help you get more out of every day. They provide a variety of super slim wallets that are half the size of conventional wallets, but carry over 12 cards and cash. Take a look at a few of their card holders, which are made with space-grade aluminum and carbon fiber. There's also the Parliament wallet, made with environmentally certified premium leather with extra pockets for cards and cash. All their wallets contain quick card access at the click of a button with their signature trigger mechanism at the bottom. Their wallets also all have RFID protection, which protects you from data theft and wireless skimming. One of my favorite items from Exter is their solar-powered tracking device, which lets you track your wallet's location from your phone, helping to prevent those sheer moments of panic when you've lost your wallet somewhere but can't find it. Now, being able to help locate your wallet with your phone is a lifesaver, but what about if you lose your phone itself? Fear not, because with the two-way wallet and phone ringing feature, if you ever lose one, you can use the other to make your lost item ring to help you find it. Plus, it only takes 2 hours of solar charge to charge the tracker for 2 whole months. Also, check out their stainless steel 7-in-1 tool card, which includes 5-inch wrenches, a screwdriver, a SIM card, metric and inch rulers, a bottle opener, and a box opener. I partnered with Exter to give you an exclusive discount. Enjoy up to 25% off using my code or link. Use code VIVIDKIWI during checkout at exter.com or by clicking the link at the top of the video description and pinned comment. Show some love to today's sponsor by clicking that link and checking out some of their amazing products. Also, thank you so much to Exter for supporting the channel by sponsoring today's video. Speaking of which, let's jump right into it. Howard Hamlin was born in 1960, with his father George Hamlin being the co-founder of HHM alongside Chuck McGill back when Howard was still young. In episode 309, Chuck mentions how Howard's father was in a 2-room office before Chuck joined him to found their law firm, which at the time was simply called Hamlin and McGill. Throughout the first 3 seasons, we get many implications that it was Chuck who truly drove the success of Hamlin and McGill, both before and after Howard would eventually join the fold himself. Speaking of which, Howard was persuaded by his father to become a lawyer as well. Also in episode 309, we learned that Howard was actually mentored by Chuck to help pass the bar, further implicating why and how Howard has always looked up to Chuck for most of his life as a mentor, even before becoming partners and close friends, due to Chuck being close friends with his father. In episode 208, Howard admits to Kim that he once wanted to start a solo practice himself before being once again persuaded by his father to join Hamlin and McGill in order to, quote, add another H to the logo, turning Hamlin and McGill into the HHM that we know from the start of the show, of course being short for Hamlin and McGill. So by the age of 24 in 1984, Howard was hired by his father to join HHM. We know this date to be true because in episode 310, Howard states how Chuck and himself have ran HHM together for almost 18 years as of 2002. Howard was hired due to nepotism, even though that may not have been what he truly wanted. In episode 305, while Howard is on the stand, he's called out for being hired due to nepotism, something he's not particularly proud of, especially due to the hypocrisy of not wanting to hire Jimmy for the same reason. From all this information, we can assume that Howard has always had a need to impress his father, in turn doing whatever his father wants him to do, even if it's not initially what Howard wanted with his life, both in regard to joining HHM, but also possibly even being a lawyer in general. Side note, there's never any implication that Howard wanted to be something else, but we can infer that Howard only became a lawyer to make his father happy. When he talks to Kim in 208, there's this implication that Howard regrets how he's now stuck working at HHM, enduring his father's legacy and keeping it alive instead of being able to make his own name for himself. Not much is known about Howard's father, with even less being known about his mother. We're not sure exactly how Howard's father passed away, but Howard and Chuck took over HHM after his passing. So HHM has become one of the most successful law firms in New Mexico throughout the 1990s and going into the early 2000s. In 1992, Howard agreed to hire Jimmy to work at the mailroom at HHM, with Chuck wanting him to clean up his act. In episode 406, we get another flashback, this time to 93, after Jimmy's been working at the mailroom for about a year. During this flashback, flashback, Jimmy can see how much Kim and everyone else truly admires Chuck. And then by 1998, Jimmy had secretly been doing online schooling, passing the bar on his third attempt, which we see in yet another flashback during episode 108. Now, that's interesting and all, but how does this pertain to Howard? Well, Chuck wanted to deny Jimmy the job at HHM, but didn't want to do so directly, so Chuck instead got Howard to be the bearer of bad news. By the end of the flashback, while Jimmy and his fellow mailroom cronies were celebrating Jimmy passing the bar, Howard interrupts the party, asking for the room. As we come to see throughout the show, whenever Howard asks for the room, it's a polite way of implying that we're about to privately get some bad news. Howard tells Jimmy that although he's happy for him passing the bar, he won't be getting the job at HHM, creating the everlasting tension between Howard and Jimmy that we see for the rest of the show. Fun fact, even though we can't hear what Howard says to Jimmy in this flashback, the creators confirmed in an old article interview back in 2015 that Howard says, "We don't have any associate positions open right now, and my hands are tied. I wish we could help you. It's really great that you've done this, but it's not gonna happen right now." Then he ends with, "Well, we'll think about it again in 6 months. So Howard tried letting him down easily, giving a vague excuse as to why they can't hire him, and then gave him a time frame that he'll have to wait before applying again, which is just long enough that Jimmy may as well try and find work elsewhere. The real question is, why did Howard do this? Well, throughout the rest of the show, we'll eventually elaborate on why Howard did this for Chuck, with Howard eventually even coming to accept his mistakes. But for now, I do have somewhat of a theory as to what pushed Howard to even do this in the first place. Since Howard always did what his father wanted for him, even if it wasn't what he truly wanted himself, he eventually adapted this behavior towards Chuck as well, due to seeing Chuck as somewhat of a father figure, especially after his own father passed away. Moving on though, when Chuck got sick sometime around 2001, Howard took up the mantle of HHM, which is why he's acting like the main face of HHM going into Better Call Saul Season 1, keeping everything together while Chuck is absent. So even just going into Season 1 of Better Call Saul, HHM is already technically on somewhat of a decline, as Hamlin McGill is essentially currently just one Hamlin, and that's it. So this leads us into Better Call Saul Season 1, which is from May 13th to July 18th, 2002. Our first introduction to Howard in the show is during the pilot episode when Jimmy goes to HHM to confront him about wanting to have Chuck withdraw from the firm after getting mailed a $26,000 stipend for Chuck. Chuck's absence due to his condition has gone to the point that Jimmy doesn't necessarily believe that Chuck will ever work there again, so he wants to cash Chuck out. Howard, on the other hand, believes that Chuck will eventually beat his illness and return back to work one day and pick things up where he left off. Howard initially comes across as a stiff and self-centered businessman, constantly getting in Jimmy's way as somewhat of a foil. Howard does look like a typical prick and somewhat acts like one too, so it's easy to perceive him as one, even though he's actually a pretty good guy. When Jimmy antagonizes Howard, it may skew the viewers into naturally antagonizing him as well. Since Howard is portrayed as Jimmy's roadblock to cashing out Chuck from HHM, this naturally puts Howard in a negative light for the viewers, as he's seemingly what's stopping our protagonist from getting what he wants. Even though viewers are more likely to side with the protagonist due to following their journey from their perspective, it doesn't always mean they're correct. Even though Jimmy vilifies Howard, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should too. Getting back to whether or not Chuck should withdraw from HHM, who's really in the right here? Jimmy and Howard are both doing what they believe is in Chuck's best interests, or so they say, even though they have directly conflicting viewpoints. Jimmy feels like there's no point in delaying the inevitable and that they should cash Chuck out and just be done with it. However, Howard holds out hope and believes that Chuck will recover and that he will one day return to work, as that is what Chuck actually wants. Even though Jimmy is trying to speak on behalf of Chuck, what Jimmy's demanding here isn't what Chuck wants.
So these are Chuck's own wishes that you're conveying?
This is what's best for him.
So he personally told you that it's his wish to withdraw from the firm. See, that would surprise me.
Jimmy's putting up a front that he's looking out for his brother when his brother can't look out for himself, but would Chuck leaving HHM truly be in Chuck's best interests, or rather Jimmy's? Jimmy's potentially being greedy and selfish, acting like he's in the right, when in reality that's not the case. Although this video is mainly focused on Howard and not Jimmy or Chuck or their brotherly relationship, since Howard is constantly caught in between the McGill brothers, it's essential to know where both Chuck and Jimmy stand in order to assess Howard's own motives and actions properly. Since Howard is the supporting character on the lawyer side of the show, anything he's involved in will most likely have Jimmy and or Chuck involved as well. So analyzing Jimmy's motives to withdraw Chuck from the firm is to highlight how Jimmy isn't morally or ethically correct, which in turn helps prove Howard as being the better person than he's originally shown to be from Jimmy's perspective. The way that Jimmy confronts Howard in such an abrasive way implies that there's been this pre-existing issue and ongoing battle that's now coming to a head. Jimmy accuses Howard of cheating Chuck out of giving him his rightful share of the company, as Jimmy seems to think that Howard wants to keep Chuck as an an employee on the books for superficial or nefarious reasons, making both himself and the firm look better on paper. Although it is true that Howard could want to avoid Chuck cashing out due to HHM potentially having to downsize or liquidate assets in order to pay for Chuck's departure.
In order to pay out my share, suppose my partners are forced to liquidate the firm. My clients are out in the cold. Cases are scattered to the winds. 126 people lose their jobs. What happens to your cronies in the mailroom? The assistants, the paralegals, the janitorial staff, all of them out on the street. Your friend Kim, a promising career, over and done with.
In reality, Howard is just trying to be a good friend to Chuck and do what he wants. Howard always acts in the best interests of the firm, but he also respects his friendship with Chuck greatly, and so he's created a solution that works towards both the firm's interests and Chuck's interests in mind as well. Howard wants to keep both the firm and Chuck happy, whereas Jimmy doesn't care about the firm and only wants what's best for himself and supposedly his brother. Even though Howard initially comes across as an irritating roadblock for Jimmy, when you actually listen to what Howard says here, he sounds genuinely caring and reasonable, especially towards the way that he treats Chuck. As Jimmy and Howard go back and forth, Jimmy acts like Howard's just stringing Chuck along with these minor pins checks in order to keep Chuck on the payroll, when Howard only wants Chuck to remain financially stable while he recovers. Howard even explains how he only sent Chuck's check to Jimmy for convenience, as Chuck is unable to leave his house and go to the bank, with Jimmy essentially acting like his caretaker. As Jimmy leaves, Howard catches up to him to give Jimmy some documents to hand over to Chuck, but Jimmy declines. Howard then tries to level with Jimmy, as Howard thinks that Jimmy's so focused on the idea of winning against him that Jimmy's not actually listening to his heart in regard to what is truly best for Chuck and what Chuck really wants. Since this scene occurs before the first reveal and introduction of Chuck's character and his illness, it's initially hard to gauge who is correct about whether or not Chuck will return to work, along from what is truly in his best interest. So after Jimmy leaves HHM, we get our first scene introducing Chuck as Jimmy goes to visit him to discuss his confrontation with Howard. And after seeing Chuck's point of view, it's clear that Chuck doesn't want to withdraw from HHM, as he does believe that he'll recover and go back to work. It's revealed that Howard has gone to visit Chuck first before Jimmy to hand deliver another stipend to Chuck, this time only for $857 instead of $26,000, which is quite a huge difference. This must be in response to him being annoyed over Jimmy barging into their conference room at HHM and confronting him. Since Chuck believes that money is besides the point, while Jimmy believes that money is the point, this is clearly Howard trying to send a message to Jimmy. According to Chuck, Howard also brought concerns to him about how the name of Jimmy's solo legal practice at James M. McGill is too similar to HHM, because even though Jimmy is just using his full name, using his last name McGill could be misinterpreted as Jimmy having an affiliation with HHM, especially when it's on a blue background. It seems that Howard has known that Jimmy was potentially trying to ride off of Chuck's success by using the same last name in his law practice for a while now, but Howard never acted upon it until now as somewhat of a petty response to Jimmy irritating him in the previous scene. Since Chuck frowns upon Jimmy taking any shortcuts in life, Howard knew that if he brought this to Chuck's attention, Chuck would back it up and insisted upon Jimmy. So this petty play of wanting Jimmy to not use his own name plays perfectly into this misdirection, as from Jimmy's perspective it seems like something Howard would do, when really this perfectly lines up with Chuck's true secret motives to prevent Jimmy from piggybacking off of his own success. From Howard not hiring Jimmy at HHM back in '98, not allowing Jimmy to cash out Chuck, or even Jimmy seeing the Kettlemans choose Howard and HHM over himself, Jimmy's many reasons to have this pre-existing resentment against Howard. Now, Howard essentially implying to Jimmy that he's not allowed to practice under his own name is the final straw, causing Jimmy to want to fight back. Chuck calls it a professional courtesy, even stating how Howard would pay for the cost of Jimmy to change his brand, but Jimmy still feels incredibly insulted that Howard doesn't want him to use his own name, as Jimmy feels like Howard is now attacking him personally. Now, speaking of the Kettlemans, the next time we see Howard is in episode 103 at the residence of the Kettlemans when Jimmy goes to their house after hearing that they've disappeared. Jimmy lies about his true motives for being there, with Howard essentially brushing him off while quickly giving him the rundown about the Kettlemans' disappearance. Jimmy then speaks to Kim, even though Kim implies to Jimmy that she'll get in trouble if Howard sees her talking to him for too long. Kim seems to believe that Howard dislikes Jimmy so much that Kim even being around him makes her look bad, as if she's embarrassed to be seen with him around Howard. Now, I'm mentioning this because in episode 104, Howard approaches Kim at HHM and asks her to take a ride with him. He drives her out to a billboard sign off the highway that he takes to work every morning, which has a brand new advertisement of Jimmy's law practice that's completely ripping off Howard's likeness along with HHM's brand in general. Howard asks Kim about her friendship with Jimmy, which Kim tremendously downplays. Kim already thinks that being affiliated with Jimmy makes her look bad in the eyes of her boss, so Jimmy pulling a stunt like this definitely wouldn't help her case, as it makes her want to completely separate herself from Jimmy's activities. Howard knows that Jimmy and Kim still talk, especially after Kim was the one who Jimmy called when he found the Kettlemans. Howard can tell that Kim is nervously downplaying how close she actually is to Jimmy, but Howard implies that he doesn't judge her for it, nor will he punish or crucify her for interacting with Jimmy. I don't think Howard brought Kim out to the billboard to prove her of how bad of a person Jimmy is or to turn her against him, but rather, he brought her there because she's the closest friend to Jimmy that he knows. So Howard hopes that by showing her this absurdity, she'll go speak to Jimmy about it. Though Chuck is Jimmy's own brother, Howard knows Chuck's vendetta against Jimmy well enough to know that Kim is more likely to approach Jimmy about it in a nicer way than Chuck would. Howard knows that Chuck would just shame Jimmy for doing this, whereas Kim may actually be able to get through to him. The scene ends with Howard stating how Jimmy is really forcing his hand here, implying how he doesn't want to have to take drastic measures to do something about the billboard to get it taken down, but that Jimmy isn't really giving him much of a choice in the matter. So later that night, Kim visits Jimmy at the nail salon to hand over a cease and desist paper from Howard wanting Jimmy to take down the billboard and stop using his and the firm's likeness. Jimmy gets a smug tone in his voice when Kim hands him this, implying that he purposely wanted to piss off Howard by doing this. Jimmy implies how this is an act of him essentially doubling down after Howard didn't want him to use his own name. Jimmy also implies how Howard doesn't appreciate how good of a lawyer Kim is, which is currently a small thread that will be expanded upon later this season along within season 2. The very next scene consists of Howard and Jimmy in a judge's chambers where Howard is threatening to sue Jimmy for trademark infringement. Jimmy tries acting naive, but Howard makes a pretty solid case. From the font that HHM has been using for upwards of 12 years, their tri-rectangle graphic as he puts it, along with their trademark Ham-Lindigo blue color, which yes, Howard really did name after himself.
Whoa, back up. Ham-Lindigo blue? Holy crap. You seriously named a color Ham-Lindigo? That is... yikes.
Howard also brings up the fact that the name McGill is in both logos, bringing things to the core root of the problem that started all of this, as Jimmy argues that he should be able to use his own name. After the judge has heard enough, she agrees that Jimmy is within the right to use his own name. However, the billboard ad is clearly a ripoff of HHM, which is unacceptable and must be taken down. Jimmy seems upset about being forced to take down the billboard, while Howard shows a smirk on his face as he feels like he's won the argument and is happy that Jimmy can't leave the billboard up. This may lead casual viewers to assume that Howard got a fat W while Jimmy took home the L, but that's just the surface level outcome, when in reality the significance of Jimmy going through with this was all for his ulterior motives. As it was never about the billboard, the whole thing was all because Howard didn't want Jimmy to use his own name. So Jimmy created this billboard as an elaborate setup to get himself and Howard in front of a judge so that he could have the judge say to both of them that Jimmy has the right to practice law under his own name. So in a way, Jimmy's tactic of doubling down worked. Jimmy always knew that he'd be forced to take down the billboard, but through the process, he was proven right in regard to the fact that he can still practice law under his own last name. Whether Howard realizes this or not, I'm not sure, as we never really get a true indicator. Now, speaking of the billboard being taken down, after the meeting, we can see Howard walking past Jimmy in the courthouse hallways as Jimmy not so sneakily gives him the middle finger, as Jimmy's already planning his next scheme. Jimmy uses the situation to his advantage by staging a publicity stunt where he pays off a worker to purposely fall while taking down the billboard, so Jimmy can coincidentally film himself saving the worker. Howard can clearly see right through this publicity stunt, and he doesn't seem happy with Jimmy essentially getting his cake and eating it too. I don't think Howard is actively wishing for Jimmy to fail or anything, but since the billboard was a mockery of his likeness, he must not like seeing Jimmy figure out a way to profit from it by fooling the masses of Albuquerque even after he was forced to take it down. In episode 105, as Jimmy is giving Kim a botched pedicure at the nail salon, Howard calls Kim about Chuck. It's at this point in the first season where Chuck gets tased by some cops after, quote, stealing his neighbor's newspaper, so of course once Jimmy hears about it, both Kim and him rush to Chuck's aid at the hospital. After discussing Chuck's condition with the doctor, even to the point that the doctor proves how Chuck's condition is all in his head, Jimmy still denies committing Chuck to an institution for his own good, even though Jimmy currently has the power to testify and make it happen. So why am I getting into Chuck and Jimmy again? Well, after the conversation with the doctor, Howard arrives to check in on Chuck. Since both Jimmy and Chuck adamantly don't want Chuck committed, Howard tries putting Jimmy's mind at ease by stating how the DA won't sign off on committing Chuck, as they still see Chuck's condition as a physical one, not a mental one. Even though Chuck has this particular illness, his symptoms are seemingly all physical, as he can still think and communicate properly with a sound mind. Even though Howard is coming from a place of sincerity for his friend, Jimmy spins it as a selfish motive, calling Howard out over the fact that he thinks Howard doesn't want Chuck committed because if he was, that'd make Jimmy Chuck's legal guardian, which Jimmy would then cash Chuck out of HHM, crippling the firm in the process. Although it's true that Chuck staying at HHM is in the best interest of the firm, I don't think that Howard has a secret ulterior motive to do so. Jimmy thinks that Howard is putting the firm first over Chuck, whereas I personally believe Howard is just genuinely trying to support Chuck and its wishes. Howard disapproves of Jimmy bringing up the whole cashing Chuck out argument out of spite and Chuck's time of need while he's currently in the hospital, stating how they all love Chuck very much and should put their petty differences aside to help do what's best for him. Jimmy doesn't buy Howard's sincerity, instead declaring that he's committing Chuck before storming off. Kim quickly catches up to him, to which Jimmy admits how he's bluffing about committing Chuck and how he only said that in front of Howard to quote, make him sweat, and that he's actually just gonna bring Chuck home. Moving on though, a few episodes later in episode 107, Kim fails to get through to the Kettlemans and convince them to take the deal, as they are in denial and stubbornly won't admit to any wrongdoing, even though they're clearly guilty. Even though the Kettlemans are beyond listening to reason at this point, Howard still blames Kim for losing them as clients. This results in the Kettlemans going back to Jimmy and trying to get him to do what HHM couldn't, resulting in Jimmy arriving at HHM to take all the case files from Kim's office. When Jimmy asks where Kim is, Howard states how he moved her to the East Wing, aka Doc Review, which Jimmy quickly picks up as being a punishment for losing the Kettlemans as clients. This is one of the first of multiple examples throughout the first few seasons of the show, how Howard is potentially too hard on Kim, not only punishing her for things out of her control, but also punishing her worse than she deserves, which was foreshadowed back when Jimmy called Kim out at the nail salon for working for someone who seemingly doesn't respect her or appreciate how talented of a lawyer she truly is. You know the drill, put a pin in that for now, as Howard is so frustrated by the entire situation involving losing the Kettlemans as clients that he refuses to elaborate on Jimmy on his punishment towards Kim. Also due to Howard's frustration, when Jimmy comments on how he's not exactly happy to have stolen the Kettlemans back from HHM, Howard shows pettiness towards Jimmy, requesting help to move all the case files by refusing to help him, along with refusing to get anyone else to help him as well. By episode 108, through some help from Mike, Jimmy managed to convince the Kettlemans to go back to HHM, resulting in Howard lifting Kim's punishment. As Kim gets situated back in her office, Howard approaches her to come bask in the glow of their victory, happily stating that she deserves it. Howard is of course talking about being present during a press conference for the Kettleman case, as we then see Howard speaking on television stating how they were able to come to a plea agreement. As we can see, Howard deeply cares about his public appearance along with the firm's reputation in general. Since Kim was able to get the Kettlemans back as clients, secretly with the help of Jimmy, making Howard look good, he was pleased to reward Kim by giving her back her own office, along with allowing her to be present for the press conference, even though Kim is hilariously only half on screen behind him, as he of course is soaking up all the true attention for HHM. Meanwhile, Jimmy's been building a huge class action case against the Sandpiper retirement homes with the help of Chuck, but when the case becomes too big for just two people, Chuck convinces Jimmy to reluctantly take the case to HHM in order to get the help that they need for a case so big. When Jimmy says to Chuck that he'll get an office right beside Chuck's because of it, Chuck takes matters into his own hand to prevent it. That night before Chuck and Jimmy are meant to go in to have a meeting with HHM to hand over the case, Chuck sneaks out to his mailbox to call Howard on Jimmy's phone in order to explain the situation to him. Just like in 1998, Chuck is once again wanting to deny Jimmy the opportunity to work at HHM, along with using Howard as a scapegoat. So when Jimmy and Chuck finally go into HHM the next day, they're first greeted with open arms, as this is the first time Chuck has stepped foot in the building in almost an entire year. During the meeting, Howard appears incredibly impressed at how solid of a case they've managed to discover and pull together, and gets a little ahead of himself by already delegating his attorneys to various sections of the case before he's even discussed terms with Jimmy. Howard offers Jimmy 20% of the common fund share, along with an of-counsel fee for the time that Jimmy's already put into the case, being $20,000. Everything seems to be going swimmingly, that is until Jimmy requests an office beside Chuck's to work on the case. This causes Howard to request the room, making everyone leave but Jimmy, Chuck, and himself, paralleling the flashback in episode 108 to 1999 when Howard first denied Jimmy the job. Once the room is clear, Howard admits to Jimmy that he's not working at HHM, and implies in a professional way that they don't want Jimmy, stating how they only want the case. Jimmy makes some pretty solid points through his understandable confusion, stating how not only is he proud of creating the case himself, but that he's astounded that even though he's brought Howard a multi-million class action case on on a platinum platter, Howard still won't hire him. Jimmy even states how he understands why Howard wouldn't hire him back in '98 as an up-and-comer, but that not hiring him now after offering Howard the Sandpiper case is completely absurd. Jimmy calls out the fact that even though they both hate each other, Jimmy is willing to set that aside to work with him, implying that Jimmy's willing to be the bigger person while Howard isn't. This is incredibly ironic in hindsight, now knowing the truth, as Howard has never truly hated Jimmy at all, with their feud only ever being started due to Howard supporting Chuck and taking one for the team, so to speak, in regard to Chuck using Howard to take all the blame for Chuck's secret vendetta against Jimmy. As Jimmy questions Howard's reasoning for not partnering with him, you can see some mild frustration and disappointment in Howard's expressions as he hides the clear answer that Jimmy's unaware of but looking for. Howard isn't happy to be taking the fall for Chuck's wishes again, but still does so out of respect for Chuck due to seeing him not only as one of his best friends, but also a father figure of sorts, as well as his business partner. Howard gives Jimmy the excuse that a majority decision has been made by both himself and the partners of the firm that they're not accepting any new associates, which is pretty much the same excuse that he gave Jimmy back in '98. Now, since Howard still wants the case, which may also be due to Chuck wanting the case to go to HHM so badly, he pleads with Jimmy to still go through with handing the case over as it's easy money, even suggesting the fact that he could increase the counsel fee as well. However, Jimmy refuses to give Howard and HHM the case over the principle of the matter, telling Howard off in a very profane way, to put it lightly.
What a lying, miserable pig you are.
Although this was always a possible outcome, I assumed that Chuck and Howard were hoping that Jimmy still would have handed the case over regardless, as it would have been the perfect solution to Jimmy currently struggling so much financially, along with obviously being profitable to HHM as well. As Chuck saw it, everyone could have won, especially himself. Jimmy would have gotten a fat check, HHM would have gotten a fat case, and Chuck would have gotten a fat W by once again stopping Jimmy from working at HHM. From Jimmy's point of view, he sees Howard as not only a hypocrite, but also a stubborn one at that, putting personal feelings above business. Now again, since just like Jimmy, we weren't yet aware that Chuck was the true antagonist, by this point in the show, Howard's antagonistic tendencies are at an all-time high. It's even almost to the point that he started feeling like a cartoonish, mustache-twirling villain. For example, we see a perfect instance of this in the very next scene, as Kim goes to privately approach Howard in his office about not accepting Jimmy. Kim politely defends Jimmy for deserving a seat at the table, wondering why Howard wouldn't give it to him. Howard tries brushing off Kim's input, even when Kim insists on wanting an actual answer. Howard initially just gives Kim the same repeated corporate answer that he gave to Jimmy in regard to the partners making a majority decision, along with implying to Kim that the reason why is none of her business. This causes Kim to truly stand up for Jimmy by finally acknowledging him as her good friend, something that Kim's been trying to downplay to Howard the entire season. From where Kim sees it, Howard is treating Jimmy unfairly, and so she won't leave without an actual answer as to why. Howard tells Kim that she's way out of her depth on this matter, which is somewhat true, but only because Kim doesn't know the truth. To punctuate Howard's fake mustache-twirling act here, Howard follows that statement up by stating how Kim can keep her opinions about what he's doing wrong to herself because he doesn't care. It's not necessarily what he says that makes him seem like he's pretending to be a cliche villain in this situation, but rather the cadence of how he says it. The way he says,
"You are welcome to keep it to yourself, because I don't care,"
in such a stern, abrasive, and cold manner is truly Howard purposely trying to play up being the bad guy for Chuck. Howard is already unhappy with being pressed on the matter, being insulted and hated by Jimmy while not being able to tell him the truth, and then when Kim comes in and essentially presses him on the matter again, Howard becomes fed up. Howard initially thinks that if he's rude and cold enough, she'll back off and give up while just thinking that he's a D-bag, and at first that does work. Kim goes to leave, accepting that she's not going to get a real answer out of him, but as she approaches the door to leave, Howard tells her to wait and to close the door for them to speak privately. Initially, this may make you worry that Howard is about to fire Kim for speaking out, when in reality, Howard is wanting to speak to Kim behind closed doors in order to tell her the truth. You can tell that when Howard tells Kim to close the door, he does feel bad at lashing out at her in this way, as he does greatly respect her. Seems that Howard's reached a breaking point here, as Kim doesn't deserve to be treated in this manner when she's just genuinely looking out for her friend. So off-screen, Howard tells Kim the truth about why he's never accepted Jimmy, but with the potential caveat that Kim can't tell Jimmy the truth herself. Kim then goes to visit Jimmy at the nail salon that night, where she does all but tell him, essentially leading Jimmy to figure out the truth on his own. After Kim leaves, Jimmy ponders why she's randomly telling him to take the deal. That, plus Jimmy wondering why his cell phone was dead the morning of going into HHM, causes him to do some digging. After Jimmy finds out that there was a deleted call made to Howard the night before they went into HHM, he finally puts two and two together, realizing that it's Chuck who didn't want Jimmy to work at HHM, not Howard. After confronting Chuck about this at the end of episode 109, we then see Jimmy in the HHM lobby at the beginning of episode 110 to speak to Howard. Kim approaches Jimmy on why he's there, to which Jimmy states that he's figured out that Chuck doesn't want him at HHM, and he's taking her advice to give the case to HHM after all. When Jimmy asks Kim why she didn't just tell him, Kim admits how he didn't want Jimmy to hate his own brother, so it's possible that Howard didn't force Kim to promise him not to tell Jimmy the truth, but rather after learning the truth, Kim came to the same conclusion as Howard. Although Howard was just doing what he was told, it's possible that Howard also went through with it all in order to prevent Jimmy from hating Chuck as well. So when Jimmy goes into Howard's office to speak with him, Howard wonders how Jimmy figured out the truth, asking if Kim told him. Jimmy admits how he figured it out on his own, even stating how it's about time, as it took him about half a decade to finally come to this conclusion. Howard confides in Jimmy, admitting how he never wanted things to go this way and how things would have gone differently if it was solely up to him. Jimmy cuts him off there, implying that he understands, as it seems that they've reconciled at least a little bit without even needing to state the obvious out loud. Howard gives Jimmy the counsel fee of 20 grand, and Jimmy gives Howard something too, a huge shopping list of all the tasks that Jimmy would do for Chuck every single day while taking care of him. After looking at the list, Howard is incredibly surprised that Jimmy went through all this effort to look after Chuck all by himself, proving to Howard just how great of a brother Jimmy truly is, even though Howard has known the truth about how Chuck's felt towards Jimmy all this time. The fact that even after everything Jimmy's done for Chuck to still not want to hire Jimmy at HHM speaks volumes to Howard, even though he keeps it to himself. As Jimmy goes to leave, Howard continues to try to diffuse any tension between them by admitting how he always liked Jimmy, even reminding Jimmy how he used to call him Charlie Hustle as a nickname back when he worked in the mailroom due to how hard of a worker Jimmy was. And then near the end of the episode, by the end of Jimmy's trip to Cicero as he stands outside of Marco's funeral, he gets a call from Kim with some good news. Kim explains to Jimmy that the Sandpiper case has gotten too big for even just HHM to handle, so Howard is partnered with another firm at Davis & Maine. Due to how much the Sandpiper clients love Jimmy, plus Kim vouching for him, Howard has managed to get Jimmy an opportunity to work on the Sandpiper case after all, but at Davis & Maine, as Howard is good friends with Cliff Maine himself, so Kim gives Jimmy a time that the Davis & Maine people will be available at the courthouse for him to meet them, so by the end of the episode, Jimmy goes to do just that. Now before we jump into season 2, I wanted to briefly recap Howard's story arc throughout the first season. When it comes down to it, it seems that Howard is the only one who truly knows what's going on, as he's the only person whom Chuck has told the truth. Howard is the straight man trope and is usually the rational person in any given situation. To be frank, Howard constantly gets between the McGill brothers even though he doesn't want to. Howard wants to help both of them, but since he's constantly pinned between them while being unable to tell Jimmy the truth about Chuck's motives, he constantly came across as the bad guy. As a matter of fact, Howard was originally meant to be the main antagonist to Jimmy while the show was first being created, but after the creators saw the type of presence that Chuck's actor Michael McKean brought to the screen, they instead made Chuck the true antagonist, with Howard instead just being a misdirect. Absolutely love how the creators changed the story in this way, as it adds more depth to dissect between the characters as opposed to Howard just being a flat-out villain cliche. The main revelation for Howard's character by the end of season 1 is the fact that he's not such a bad guy after all, and certainly not the Lord Vader that Jimmy makes him out to be. The first season utilized this to the fullest, as we got plenty of Jimmy wrongfully hating Howard because that's what he's led to believe due to not knowing any better scenes, leading up to the climax of Howard's fake antagonistic tendencies through Howard denying Jimmy once more near the end of the season with a Sandpiper case, followed by yelling at Kim, along with the revelation in the penultimate episode, allowing Jimmy and Howard to somewhat reconcile in the finale. Also, as it turns out, Howard was able to help give Jimmy the opportunity to work on his own case through Davis & Maine, showing how when Chuck doesn't have a say in controlling Howard, he can actually be pretty great.
And believe it or not, Howard's been pushing this too.
Good old Howard.
So on to Better Call Saul Season 2, which is from July 18th to September 21st, 2002. Season 2 starts off where Season 1 ended, with Jimmy finally going to meet Cliff Maine. As Howard introduces them to each other, he gives Jimmy full credit for discovering the Sandpiper case, along with even talking him up, stating how once Cliff sees him in action, Cliff will quickly understand why he calls him Charlie Hustle. This further shows how Howard has no ill will towards Jimmy, and honestly quite the opposite. Even though Howard hindered Jimmy from getting a job at HHM for so many years, this shows how helpful Howard can be when he's not held back by Chuck. However, both Howard and Kim learn a quick lesson on why it's risky to vouch for Jimmy, as he abruptly turns down the job due to not getting a solid answer on whether or not Kim wants to be in a relationship with him. Regardless, Jimmy does eventually end up taking the job after all, resulting in Howard going over to Chuck's place in episode 202 to inform him of the good news, or rather, not so good news in Chuck's eyes. Since Howard is well aware of Chuck's detest help Jimmy in his career, he knows that Chuck won't like hearing how he helped Jimmy get a job to work at Davis and Maine. Howard essentially negated Chuck's wishes by finding this loophole to get Jimmy to still work on the Sandpiper case without technically working at HHM, as he'll instead be handling the case through their partner Davis and Maine, where Chuck has no say. This conversation first has the surface level exchange of Howard informing Chuck of Jimmy's job at Davis and Maine, which normally would be good news. Since Chuck is self-aware enough to realize this, he holds back any resentment he has towards the idea. Even though he's not happy to hear this, he knows that from an outside perspective, he ethically should be. It's implied that Howard is nervous to tell Chuck the news about Jimmy since he knows Chuck will clearly disapprove of it, especially with Howard also admitting how not only did he not stand in the way to prevent Jimmy from getting this opportunity, but that he actively supported it. Howard is implying that since he doesn't hate Jimmy like Chuck might, Howard instead paints Cliff an unbiased and honest picture of who Jimmy is and what he brings to the table. Although Howard knows more than anybody the shame that comes with nepotism, Howard also realizes that there's a fine line between giving someone a free pass to success who may not deserve it and giving someone an opportunity who's clearly earned it. Howard figures Jimmy is the latter and doesn't agree with Chuck's vendetta against him, as initially Chuck just wanted to stop Jimmy from taking any shortcuts, but it went so far as to actively prevent Jimmy from getting opportunities that he otherwise should have. Unlike Chuck, Howard doesn't judge Jimmy for his past from before he even knew him, but rather looks past that to instead make his own judgment on Jimmy based on his work ethic ever since he joined the mailroom at HHM. Something that Howard might eventually regret, actually. Howard explains to Chuck how even though Cliff Main had his doubts, he's giving Jimmy a chance, which may be Howard implying how Chuck should have done what Cliff is in regarding to taking a chance on Jimmy, even with the list of doubts that he has for him. Howard does downplay his involvement in getting Jimmy the job, instead stating how it was Kim who was pushing the idea. However, since Howard is Kim's boss, the head of HHM, and Cliff's friend, even though Kim did have to convince Howard to support it, Howard ultimately had the final say in whether to push the idea to Cliff or not. As we heard in the season 1 finale, when Kim first called Jimmy to inform him of the opportunity, she did say that Howard was supportive of it as well, which as a side note is kind of ironic how both Kim and Howard don't want to take responsibility for supporting Jimmy, instead blaming each other for being the driving force behind it. Anyways, even though Chuck and Howard have their disagreements, they constantly decide to simply ignore them or at least downplay them and brush them under the rug as to not jeopardize their friendship and business relationship. As we'll come to see by the end of season 3 and even after, Howard will come to regret this. Also, speaking of their friendship, Howard still shows sincerity in how he misses working alongside Chuck at the office, so he's excited to learn how Chuck wants to start coming in for brief intervals starting the following week. Even though Chuck wanting to return to the office started out sincere, after he learned of Jimmy's new opportunity, he took it upon himself to use his return to the office to antagonize Jimmy in his new position. We see this later in the same episode when Chuck arrives at a business meeting since HHM and Davis and Maine hold their group meetings at the HHM building in their conference room. In this scene, Howard completely negates any underlying strain between Chuck and Jimmy, instead having them come to terms with the situation themselves. Even though Howard is well aware of the unspoken tension between them, he expects them to be able to keep a professional public appearance. In the next episode, 203, we get essentially a replica of the previous scene, except with the concept being elaborated on, as Chuck calls out Jimmy for soliciting the elder clients that he gained as client outreach. First, when Cliff compliments Jimmy on the amount of elder clients he's gotten, Howard shows a sense of pride for being the one to get Jimmy into this position where he's able to utilize his full potential. However, Chuck butts in as the bearer of bad news, calling out Jimmy over the fact that the opposing counsel at Schweikart and Coakley will suspect solicitation. Howard tries defending Jimmy, but Chuck stops him, causing Howard to ask Jimmy to clear this up, but in such a way where he's rooting for Jimmy to have a proper explanation to save himself. Jimmy does end up giving a valid defense, even if it is just an excuse to cover up the fact that he did indeed solicit. Both Cliff and Howard buy Jimmy's explanation, but that just may be due to them hearing what they want to hear. Reading the room, Cliff looks at Howard, but Howard looks at Chuck, once again showing the true power that Chuck has in the room. Moving on to when Jimmy inevitably messes up at Davis and Maine when he runs a commercial without permission. Since Kim convinced Howard to vouch for Jimmy to get the job at Davis and Maine, him acting out and getting in trouble in turn makes HHM look bad too, mainly Howard for introducing Cliff to Jimmy. In episode 204, we see Jimmy try to warn Kim about the commercial, but it's too little too late, as she's already in a private meeting with both Chuck and Howard. Up to now, Howard has been on Jimmy's side, but now that Jimmy has put a dent in his reputation, he's just as unhappy with Jimmy as Chuck has always been. Since they can't punish Jimmy directly, they instead blame Kim punishing her. Howard confronts her over the fact that Jimmy had shown her the commercial before airing it, but that Kim never gave Howard a heads up about it. This is because Jimmy had lied to Kim about having already gotten it approved, so she was completely unaware that Jimmy was going behind Cliff's back. However, instead of admitting this, she covers for Jimmy by hiding the fact that she didn't know, instead just telling Howard that she didn't think it was necessary to warn him. This makes her look like she knew that Jimmy hadn't gotten it approved when she in fact didn't. During the meeting, Chuck gives Kim an incredibly intimidating expression of disapproval, and when Kim leaves, Chuck asks Howard what he's going to do about this. The way Chuck asks this, along with his body language, implies that he expects Howard to punish Kim heavily for this, which may have resulted in Howard punishing Kim worse than he otherwise would have if Chuck were not an influential factor. Inferring how Howard feels as the scene ends with him giving off a heavy sigh, he appears to be put in a tough position where he's upset at Kim and disappointed in her. Kim taking the fall here by acting complacent in what Jimmy did instead of admitting how she didn't know puts her in such a spot where both Howard and Chuck are to fully blame her for Jimmy's actions. If Howard knew the truth, it may have gone easier on Kim in the long run, but that's not the situation he's in. Even if he suspects that Kim is lying to protect Jimmy, Howard can't work off of hunches and instead has to act upon the facts presented to him, which is that Kim apparently knew about Jimmy's scheme and didn't warn him. So Howard punishes Kim by sending her to doc review again. When Jimmy finds out, he tells Kim that he wants to confront Howard about it, but she demands that he leaves it alone. So instead of Howard, Jimmy goes to confront Chuck about it, accusing Chuck of putting Howard up to this to get to him. Now, for me personally, due to constantly wanting to see Howard as the misunderstood good guy of the story, I'm maybe a tad biased in that way, as I'm always looking for reasons to clear Howard's quote good name. Although I still love Howard's character to bits and will die on that hill defending him, he's not perfect. No one is, and these two shows highlight that gray area perfectly, as every character in each show has their own faults, even though some are more good than bad, or at least better than initially perceived. Even though Howard is widely misunderstood, there are still legitimate reasons why many characters in the show consider him a prick, and this is one of them. I'd say maybe 80 to 90% of the situations that result in the characters or even the viewers hating on Howard are unjust, or at the very least misunderstood. However, that obviously means that there is still a small 10 to 20% window where Howard is actually just being a prick. All this to say, I actually believe Chuck in the scene with Jimmy where they talk about Howard punishing Kim when I previously did not. Chuck is just one small factor of many that resulted in Howard's decision to punish Kim the way that he does. And speaking of Kim, she goes out of her way to make as many calls as she can to try and get HHM a big new client, as she seems to think that she'll be able to earn a way out of her punishment. This may be because if you remember back in season 1, the last time Howard sent Kim to the mailroom for losing the Kettlemans, Howard lifted this punishment on her once they returned. So after multiple montages of blood, sweat, tears, and sticky notes, in episode 205, Kim manages to secure the client Mesa Verde for HHM. Immediately after, we get the introduction of Kevin and Paige, who Kim introduces to Howard. They instantly hit it off, with Howard making pleasant small talk with Kevin, and they walk up to the conference room. We then skip the meeting and jump to Kim and Howard waving goodbye to Kevin and Paige, with everything seeming to have gone well as Kim thinks that she's dug herself out of the mailroom. Then when she suggests to Howard what moves to make next for Mesa Verde, Howard politely but coldly denies her suggestions, telling her that she has enough work with her name on it in doc review. This clearly implies that although Howard is happy that Kim was able to secure this new fruitful client for them, that it wasn't enough for him to lift her punishment. There's multiple angles to look at this from. Even though this is one of his biggest prick moments, he's never a prick for no reason. Is it possible that Howard saw this as Kim taking a shortcut to avoid punishment time? Howard could see this as Kim trying to buy her way out of doc review, so to speak. Maybe Howard isn't lifting her punishment because he's concerned that if he lets her off the hook, she'll never learn her lesson by never taking accountability for the consequences of her actions. Remember that Howard already lifted her punishment early once before back in season 1, yet here they are again with him having to punish her once more. Plus, even though Jimmy did end up telling Chuck that he lied to Kim about the commercial being approved, I don't believe that Jimmy, Chuck, nor Kim ever told Howard the truth. So as far as Howard is concerned, Kim is still technically guilty and deserves to be punished for it, and apparently this time without the possibility of parole for good behavior. Now, regardless of Howard's reasoning for not lifting Kim's punishment, it impacted Kim more than he ever thought. Howard may think that he's just giving Kim the tough love treatment and may not think much about keeping Kim in doc review, but for Kim, this is actually the straw to break the camel's back in regard to her actually deciding to leave HHM due to feeling neglected. Seems like what Jimmy always told her about Howard never appreciating her expertise back in season 1 is finally sinking in, even if what Jimmy said isn't entirely true. Anyways, later that night, Howard goes to visit Chuck once more to bring him some more good news that he'll actually like this time, which is how they've secured their new client Mesa Verde. This is also the first instance we see where Howard and Chuck celebrate with a bottle of Macallan, something that Howard and Chuck have always done as somewhat of a tradition after a successful case or business accomplishment in general. Side note, it's interesting how every time we see Howard honor this celebratory tradition, it always comes with some sort of negative undertones to what they're quote celebrating. This is actually the first of 3 times we see Howard pull out the Macallan, with this first time being an actual genuine celebration, while the other 2 not so much. Now, even though this first instance has more of an actual celebration than the next 2 times, this first instance still has some negative undertones as well, even if it's less severe than the following. Howard's celebration is instantly cut short due to him admitting to Chuck that it was Kim who brought Mesa Verde in, not himself. Since it was Kim, the duality of whether or not to continue to punish her after this big win with Mesa Verde causes Howard's celebration to ring hollow. Chuck assumes that Kim's no longer in doc review due to this, but Howard implies how she still is, and he's still pondering over it, but in a resentful manner. Scoring Mesa Verde for HHM is a big deal, especially for a fourth-year associate such as Kim, so Howard knows how the right thing to do is to lift her punishment, but when he responds to Chuck here saying, "we'll see," he almost says it with some sort of resentment, as if he doesn't want to when he knows that he should. Howard seemed to not want to punish her when he had to, but now he seems like he wants to keep punishing her even when he shouldn't anymore. Why is that? This could be due to Howard wanting his decisions, and by relation his punishments, to carry some weight. It's possible that he's being stubborn with not lifting his punishment again because he doesn't want them to feel meaningless, or like they can be easily won over. I've never really perceived Howard as a character with a huge ego, and even though he cares greatly about his public image, that's always been more of a business thing. Another possibility is that since he still thinks that Kim is guilty, he's just genuinely disappointed in her for not warning him about Jimmy's commercial. It's possible that Howard was just upset about punishing Kim in the first place because he was genuinely upset that someone he holds in such high regard could let him down like the way he thinks she did. It did seem to be somewhat crushing for Howard to have to punish her, but that he did so and is sticking with it because he was truly hurt by her, as she's someone he always thought that he could count on. Moving on though, the next morning, Chuck arrives at HHM before the sun's even come up and notices how Kim has been there working on doc review since the night before. In a moment of potential sympathy, Chuck sits down with her to speak to her about the entire situation right now involving Jimmy, Howard, and HHM as a whole. And Chuck sympathizes with her by implying how he knows that Kim only got punished because Jimmy left her holding the bag by not telling her that he was going behind Cliff's back. Chuck relates to her by stating how he used to make the same mistake going out on a limb for Jimmy many times in the past as well, and now that Howard's done the same, it explains why Howard is so upset and in turn punishing Kim for it. Chuck knew that Jimmy would do something like this to both Kim and Howard, but that Kim and Howard needed to both experience this for themselves in order to understand Jimmy the way that Chuck does due to, well, having been through it many times before as his brother. As Chuck leaves, he says that he'll speak to Howard and convince him to take Kim out of doc review and give her back her old office so that she can get back to proper work. So in the next episode, 206, Howard approaches Kim as she's putting things back in her office to inform her that Kevin and Paige have arrived. Even though Kim is back at her original office and now working on Mesa Verde like she wanted, Howard isn't happy about it, and Kim can tell during their awkwardly long and silent walk. She breaks the silence by stating how she doesn't know what Chuck said, but that she didn't ask him to step in on her behalf, as she doesn't want Howard thinking that she went behind his back to get Chuck to get her out of doc review. Even so, Howard doesn't respond and continues their long walk in silence until he gets to the conference room. As they arrive, notice how quickly Howard changes his demeanor to appear friendly to Kevin and Paige, almost like he flicked on his charisma switch right as he walked into the door. Not only is Howard capable of putting on a fake smile when he needs to, but this false face bursting with charisma is a key component of Howard's character, which is partly what makes him feel like such a corporate prick to everyone around him that he's not necessarily trying to please. Later that episode, Howard leaves Kim hanging at a court appearance as she was faced with an unwinnable case against Schweikart. This shows yet another instance of Howard neglecting Kim by not considering it worth his time to back her up since it was a lost cause. Plus, he's probably still upset that Chuck forced his hand to lift Kim's punishment sooner than he wanted to. Rich Schweikart takes an interest in Kim's professional abilities, which is relevant to Howard's next scene. 2 episodes later, in episode 208, Kim requests to meet with Howard in his office to give him her resignation from HHM. When Kim first arrives, Howard tells her just to make it quick, and once inside his office, essentially tells her just get it over with, as he's already heard that Kim was quitting due to Schweikart giving her a job offer. However, Kim surprises Howard when she admits that she's not going with Schweikart, but rather starting her own firm. Throughout this scene, Howard goes on a mini emotional roller coaster. At first, he's jaded to Kim quitting, as he may potentially be feeling betrayed, thinking that she's supposedly leaving him for Schweikart. Not only does it feel like Schweikart is snatching Kim away from HHM, one of Howard's best, but it's also insult to injury considering Schweikart is the opposing counsel to HHM and Davison, Maine in regard to the Sandpiper case. Then when Kim tells Howard that she's going to open up a solo practice, Howard's potential disdain for Kim in this moment almost fades away completely, as he respects this decision, especially since it's something that he once wanted to do but was never able to, even making him feel envious of Kim having this freedom to get a fresh start, something that Howard will never have. Also, Howard does point out how Kim leaving HHM at the same time Jimmy left Davison, Maine can't just be a coincidence, which Kim admits is true. Jimmy's been trying to convince Kim to leave HHM since the beginning of the show, but even more so during season 2 as he constantly insisted to Kim that they should open an office together. And this seems random, but put a pin in that until the season 5 finale. Before Kim leaves, Howard lets her know that if he was ever too hard hard on her, it was essentially just tough love. Howard never meant to push her away, but rather push her so much the way he did because he knew the great potential that she had. By the end of the scene, as an act of professional courtesy, Howard offers to let Kim off the hook for the rest of her student loans that she still owes HHM, calling it a parting gift. This, plus the pleasant goodbye as Kim leaves the office, implies that Howard is able to take the high road and part ways on good terms. But as soon as the door closes, we quickly realize how that's all an act. As soon as Kim leaves and Howard's door closes behind her, she overhears Howard immediately requesting to get Kevin from Mesa Verde on the line, implying that Howard wants to secure his connection with Mesa Verde as clients so that Kim won't be able to take them as clients for herself. This begins the mini story arc of Kim versus Howard and Chuck at HHM fighting over who will keep Mesa Verde as clients, as Kim was the one who first found Mesa Verde and brought them to HHM. Even though it's smart for Howard to want to call Kevin before Kim has a chance, it also seems fairly petty for Howard to do so, especially with Kim still in earshot of it. Now, whether Howard purposely wanted Kim to hear to shove it in her face, or if he was just so confident he'd be keeping Mesa Verde as clients that he didn't care what she heard, it still feels kind of spiteful. On several occasions, when looking at instances where Howard can be considered a prick, Howard is known to make subtle yet obvious microaggressions in a fairly petty way. Whenever Howard is a prick, it's usually him taking small but still noticeable jabs at someone who's either wronged him in the past, caused him trouble, or even simply just annoyed him. Howard's microaggressions are usually exactly that, either an underhanded remark at someone else's expense, or something that throws a wrench in their plans, acting as almost a speed bump. Howard would never go as far as to ruin someone's career or even life, with his petty actions mainly being nothing more than a slight inconvenience to the victim, if you can even call them that. Now, in the same episode as Kim quitting, she manages to sway Mesa Verde in her favor, causing Howard to visit Chuck to inform him of the news. Quite a recurring theme in season 2, huh? Even though Kim hasn't officially secured them as her client yet, Howard knows that it's very likely. So Howard rips off the band-aid and informs Chuck that they're probably going to lose Mesa Verde, which is of course due to Kim having left HHM as well, as Chuck wasn't even aware of that yet. Side note, one thing that I've always noticed about Howard, due to his mostly stiff and straightforward demeanor, he always gets right to the point when sharing bad news. Howard is the type of guy to get things over with rather than dance around the subject. This leads us to the main reason why Howard is even visiting Chuck so abruptly about all of this. Howard explains how he's managed to secure one final meeting with Kevin from Mesa Verde that afternoon, so he needs help from Chuck to coach him to give him pointers on what to say. Now, potentially due to Chuck's vendetta against Jimmy, along with wanting to be petty and spiteful to Kim, he suggests to come to the meeting with Kevin himself. Howard shows concern with Chuck joining him to the meeting, as he would rather Chuck just give him pointers instead. With Chuck still recovering from his condition, even though he's still sparsely coming into the office, it still takes a lot out of him. Due to this, Chuck is somewhat of a wild card to Howard, as Chuck accompanying him could either turn out to be extremely beneficial or potentially devastating if he can't keep things together. This starts a trend throughout the rest of this season and even the entirety of the next season between Howard and Chuck, where Chuck constantly insists on going to various meetings and hearings himself, when Howard would rather Chuck stay home in fear of Chuck's condition, him messing things up, making a fool of himself, or all the above. A constant in this recurring trend involves Chuck going out even though Howard advises against it, and as we'll come to see in almost every instance, Howard is proven right. However, that only comes after this first instance where Chuck insisting that he meets Kevin and Paige with Mesa Verde turns out working in their favor, with Chuck brilliantly using reverse psychology on them to get them to stay with HHM. Chuck appearing with Howard this first time being such a success is in no doubt what influences Chuck to want to do so again, but every subsequent time this trend happens, the outcome gets worse and worse as Chuck becomes more and more unhinged. For example, in our very next scene with Howard and Chuck in the following episode, 209, Chuck insists on going to a hearing to represent Mesa Verde with Howard. Howard again suggests that he should go to the hearing without Chuck, as he's concerned with Chuck's condition getting the best of him after he saw how hard it hit Chuck in the last episode after their meeting with Kevin and Paige. Now, instead of reassuring Howard that he'll be fine or that he can handle himself, he instead informs Howard that he finds, quote, victory laps very comforting. The fact that both Howard and Chuck know that Chuck doesn't even need to be there, but he goes anyways, shows how much of an arrogant sore winner he can be. Karma then bites Chuck for this as he makes a complete fool of himself during the hearing due to his outburst about the Mesa Verde street address on his papers, which Jimmy secretly sabotaged. This causes Mesa Verde to go back with Kim, resulting in HHM losing Mesa Verde for good, along with Chuck becoming more obsessed with the numbers than Call of Duty Black Ops. If Howard would have went to this hearing alone, he probably would have handled the numbers mix-up in a much more calm and professional manner than Chuck did. By the few moments of Howard trying to defuse the situation that we saw, we can assume that unlike Chuck, Howard would have kept a level head throughout the entire situation. Even with the number swapping being a minor setback, Howard would have been able to pick up the pieces and save the situation, or at least cut their losses without making things worse. Now back at Chuck's house, Howard starts to truly see Chuck become unhinged, as the image of Chuck wrapped up in a space blanket while frantically crazed over the numbers numbers doesn't bode well for him, as it makes him seem like someone who should be in a loony bin, not a prestigious lawyer who can't admit that they may have made a minor mistake. Howard suggests that he and Chuck just cut their losses and move on, but Chuck clearly won't listen as he's so fixated on how he couldn't possibly be wrong. Moving on to the season 2 finale, we see Jimmy accepting a phone call from him about Chuck. Apparently, Howard called Jimmy extremely concerned over Chuck, as Chuck had informed Howard that he's retiring from HHM and quitting the law because he believes that his brain isn't working properly anymore, essentially submitting to his illness and admitting defeat to it. As we'll come to realize by the final moments of the season 2 finale, this was all a trap by Chuck to set up Jimmy into admitting that he sabotaged the Mesa Verde numbers, but it came at the cost of tricking Howard as well, which we'll discuss momentarily going into the next season. As far as season 2 goes, I think it did a great job elaborating on Howard's character and the fine line that he walks in regard to being the misunderstood good guy versus just being a stiff prick. Unlike in the first season, where Howard was antagonized for 99% of it, season 2 has to deal with the aftermath of us and the characters learning of the plot twist that Howard was not in fact the bad guy, with that role instead going to Chuck. So season 2 shows Howard's character from multiple angles, both in a good and bad light. We see how Howard can be truly supportive of those he believes in, and how when no one else is influencing his decision making, he can prove to be very kind, genuine, and helpful. So in what was potentially an effort to figure out where to take the character in season 2, the creators continue to give him a particular on-screen presence, which, although may not be as intimidating, is still an interesting and influential piece of the puzzle. In this season, we see how no one's perfect, and this includes Howard, as we've seen a handful of examples of him straight up being petty and or a spiteful prick at times. This creates a very complex character that is both layered and humanized, as he has his good and bad moments just like anyone else. So even though Howard can initially come across as a spineless corporate D-bag, there's a lot more to him than that. Better Call Saul Season 3, which is from September 21st, 2002 to March 22nd, 2003. At the end of the season 3 premiere, Chuck explains to Howard how his retirement scare was all a ruse in order to record Jimmy's confession. As Howard listens to the tape, you can tell that he's not impressed and seemingly on both fronts. Howard is clearly upset to learn that Jimmy did in fact sabotage Chuck, but Howard is also upset that Chuck would trick him just like Jimmy. When Howard states that he doesn't even know what to say, I consider it a double meaning, as Howard is equally as baffled at Jimmy as he is over Chuck's trickery. Chuck explains how it was necessary in order to fully convince Jimmy of Chuck's ruse, but I can understand how Howard would still be offended at Chuck essentially using him as a pawn in his plan without a heads up. Howard mainly focuses on the usefulness of the tape, or rather lack thereof. Howard brainstorms a handful of angles that they could use the tape, but explains how all of them would come up fruitless in the court of law and public opinion due to the nature of the tape and how it was recorded secretly. Instead of arguing the possibilities, Chuck completely agrees that any method to use the tape against Jimmy would result in a dead end, except for one. This episode ends before Chuck reveals his true master plan to Howard, but as we see in the following episode, 302, Chuck is going to use it to trick Jimmy into committing a crime, which he'll be caught red-handed. Howard has some opinions about this tactic, which he confronts Chuck about. However, in order to hide the fact that Howard is visiting Chuck, he parks a block away from Chuck's house, instead jumping through backyards of Chuck's neighbors in order to reach Chuck's house discreetly. Side note, I find the juxtaposition of a professional lawyer such as Howard jumping through backyards like some sort of teen delinquent pretty hilarious. Just in the way that he awkwardly adjusts his suit to regain his composure after doing so makes me smirk. It's a great show of Howard's character in the form of his stiff appearance even when no one's seemingly looking. By the time Howard makes it to Chuck's backyard, you can tell he's becoming quickly impatient with this whole ridiculous procedure, as he becomes short with Chuck insisting that he leaves his possessions outside and hide them on top of it. As we can see, Chuck has hired a PI to stay at his house 24/7 for the past week or so. His plan consists of leaking information about the secret confession tape to Jimmy in the hopes that Jimmy will break into his house to destroy it. Howard comes to Chuck to tell him that he's spending way too much money on the PI, and all for a plan that's dodgy at best. Chuck acts all high and mighty about catching Jimmy for his criminal activity, but Howard practically begs Chuck to listen to reason and compromise with him, as Howard is seemingly walking on eggshells here in order to get through to Chuck. In order to avoid argument and strain on their friendship, Howard is still entertaining the idea of Chuck's fixation, but figures that there must be some better way to handle the situation than this outlandish plan. Ironically, right as Chuck states how they'll limit the PI to nighttime hours, Jimmy starts banging on Chuck's door in broad daylight, forcing himself in. Everything goes down exactly how Chuck predicted, with Howard and the PI hiding around a corner waiting till the last possible moment to intervene. Since Jimmy just so happened to arrive at Chuck's house while Howard was there, now Howard's an acting witness in the whole ordeal as well, once again planting him right in the middle of the McGill brothers and their feud. By episode 304, we see Howard representing Chuck as they meet with Kim representing Jimmy at a pre-prosecution diversion agreement with the DDA. Tensions are at an all-time high between the four as they awkwardly wait for the DDA to arrive, and once she does, although Howard keeps things professional, he does aid in Chuck's pettiness in regard to some particular wording within the statements that Kim thought she could get away with. After the meeting, as Howard goes to take Chuck home, Kim stops them to confront them over the fact that the tape Jimmy destroyed was only a replica. Howard tries to keep the truth a secret, but Chuck overconfidently waives his advantage by admitting to Kim that there is in fact a copy of the tape that will be submitted into evidence. So as we jump to the iconic chicanery episode 305, we first see Howard with Chuck in the courtroom that the hearing will take place in as they prepare accommodations for Chuck's condition. Howard takes a moment to speak to Chuck where he tries to dissuade Chuck from testifying out of concern. This is yet again another example of the trend of Howard trying to talk Chuck out of going to a public situation of importance. Just like with Howard not wanting Chuck to meet with Mesa Verde multiple times previously, Howard's equally as nervous about Chuck's health as he is Chuck making a fool of himself once again. Howard is fairly confident that their case is strong enough to disbar Jimmy without Chuck's appearance at all. He's worried Chuck will jeopardize their victory through letting his emotions get the best of him. Howard is clearly worried about Chuck jeopardizing their public reputation, which Chuck acknowledges but dismisses as he props himself up on a high horse in regard to getting justice for what's right and wrong, when in reality he just wants to finally see Jimmy punished. We then see Howard on the stand during the hearing as he gives his testimonial as a witness to Jimmy breaking and entering Chuck's house. Kim then cross-examines Howard with her goal to paint a larger picture of the relationship between the McGill brothers. Kim does this by asking Howard about how well he knows Jimmy, along with why HHM never hired him as a lawyer. Howard states how he's known Jimmy for about a decade ever since Chuck had them hire Jimmy to work in HHM's mailroom. Howard admits how he always saw Jimmy as a hard worker with a lot of quote get up and go, with Kim even leading him to admit his old nickname for Jimmy, Charlie Hustle. Kim then goes on to question Howard about the hypocrisy of not hiring Jimmy due to fear of nepotism through Chuck when Howard was hired through nepotism by his father. Howard takes long pauses while answering these questions in particular, which may be due to multiple reasons. The first may be partly due to knowing that Kim has him in checkmate with this one, but also due to the potential shame Howard may feel through being self-aware about how he only has his current position through nepotism. Howard admits how it wasn't him who was worried about hiring Jimmy, but instead Chuck. Kim also has Howard admit that Jimmy was never aware that it was Chuck who prevented Howard from hiring him, at which point Howard becomes slightly agitated with the line of questioning, causing him to become short with Kim as he tries to divert the topic to Jimmy getting fired at Davis and Maine instead. Howard may be trying to change the subject to get himself out of this hole that Kim is digging for him with her line of questioning, but there are other reasons of Howard wanting to bring up Jimmy's time at Davis and Maine as well. First off, discussing how Jimmy got hired at Davis and Maine would make Howard look good, as he's the one who got him the job there. Also, the sequence of events of Jimmy working at Davis and Maine is essentially a parallel what-if scenario showing what would have potentially happened if Jimmy was originally hired at HHM. So Howard's point could have potentially been, we didn't hire him at HHM, but when I did help him get a similar job at Davis and Maine, look at how he screwed it all up, which is exactly why Chuck never wanted to hire him in the first place. Kim then gets into discussing Chuck's condition and how Jimmy cared for him. Even though Howard wasn't really involved in Jimmy taking care of Chuck, Kim uses Howard as her own witness to agree on the facts that she presents as true. After Howard is dismissed as a witness, he goes to pick up Chuck from his house as Chuck's tape is played in court. Howard doesn't do much else for the rest of the episode, but he is present for Chuck's eventual downfall while testifying, so let's briefly discuss that, as it is a major turning point for all characters involved, along with the trajectory of the show in general. Honestly, for having no dialogue throughout the entire scene of Chuck on the stand, Patrick Fabian does an impressive job giving Howard very expressive reactions to the events unfolding. The first of which is when Chuck admits how his demeanor during the recording of the tape was all theater or play acting, and the show cuts to Howard intently staring at Chuck with potential distaste. This is because it may still be a sore spot for Howard due to his disapproval of it in general, along with the fact that Chuck tricked him right alongside Jimmy. After Rebecca arrives, Kim hands cross-examination over to Jimmy for him to question Chuck directly. When Jimmy has Chuck explain the condition of his home when the tape was recorded, we see both Rebecca and Howard show multiple layers of concern. When Jimmy brings up Chuck's ex-wife Rebecca, both Rebecca and Howard give a surprised expression at Chuck condescendingly explaining the relevance of why Jimmy even tricked Rebecca to show up in the first place. In Howard's case, he may be growing concern of his greatest fear, which is that Chuck's emotions are starting to get the better of him. Nearing the end of the scene, Howard again shows great concern when Jimmy takes his cell phone out of his pocket, as he fears that Jimmy's about to out Chuck for his condition all being in his head, or at least harm him through making his symptoms act up. When Chuck opens the cell phone to reveal there's no battery in it, Howard quickly regains composure with a smirk on his face and a sigh of relief, as the cell phone now appears to be a false alarm. This of course leads to the climax of the episode where Jimmy reveals that Huell planted the fully charged cell phone battery in Chuck's pocket, resulting in an uproar in the courtroom while both Rebecca and Howard sit there completely shocked for multiple reasons. For Howard, this has been a slow burn over the past year and a half now, while coming to a head at once. This comes as a total shock to him, as he truly believed in Chuck's illness throughout wanting to support both his friend and business partner. To jump back to season 1 for a moment, Dr. Cruz warned Jimmy that supporting Chuck with his illness by believing it's real may be enabling him for things to get worse, and it's at this point that Howard may be having that same revelation. Speaking of things getting worse though, as we jump to the iconic chicanery moment, we see Howard hold his breath when Chuck yells out, "I'm not crazy," in the courtroom. Then after Chuck's meltdown, during the shocked silence, we briefly cut to both Rebecca and Howard's reactions. Howard's facial expression speaks volumes, as he has a combination of dread, upset disappointment, and a slight hint of a smug but regretful "I told you so." Howard's true fear of Chuck ruining their chances at winning the case has been realized. With that in mind, the reason why I say there's a hint of "I told you so" is because this is exactly what Howard predicted when he was trying to warn Chuck right before the hearing started. So with that iconic episode out of the way, let's move on to the aftermath of it, which takes place throughout the rest of season 3. First off, in the following episode 306, Howard arrives at Chuck's house late at night to inform him of the news that even though Jimmy will not be disbarred like Chuck had hoped, Jimmy will still have his law license suspended for a year. This also consists of the second time we've now seen Howard bring over a bottle of Macallan to celebrate a victory. Just like with the last time, this is also a hollow victory, and even more so. Even though Chuck isn't satisfied with the outcome, Howard is still trying to spin it as a win for them in the hopes that Chuck will finally be able to let go of his vendetta and move on with his life. In a way, the celebratory drink isn't to just congratulate Jimmy getting suspended, but rather have a toast to cut their losses and move on in order to focus on the future instead. Chuck does realize that Howard's correct. Even though he's unhappy with the outcome, he reluctantly agrees with Howard and toasts to moving on from Jimmy and focusing on bettering himself instead. Moving on though, a few episodes later and a few weeks later in 308, we see Howard out for lunch with clients where he notices Kim with Kevin and Paige from Mesa Verde. Howard walks over to their table to greet them, but in such a way where he's passive-aggressively undermining Kim. It's up for debate if Howard was purposely condescending Kim or if it was just a subconscious action simply due to the way he carries himself. If the latter, it's another perfect example as to why people consider Howard a stiff prick, as he's constantly passive-aggressive and condescending to those he sees beneath him even without realizing it. Although Howard could still feel a tad sour about Kim quitting and taking Mesa Verde, I'll let you judge for yourself in the comments whether Howard was purposely belittling Kim as a result. On the surface, Howard appears to be just trying to leave things on good terms between them as he makes small talk catching up with Kevin and Paige. Now regardless if Howard meant it or not, Kim doesn't appreciate the belittlement. First off, when Kim stands up to greet him when he walks over, he tells her to stay seated. Howard may mean nothing by it, but it rubs Kim the wrong way. Then Howard implies how Kim is quote, one of the best because he helped teach her everything she knows, which Chuck and Howard have stated about Kim to Kevin and Paige previously. Although calling Kim one of the best may seem like a positive, Kim may portray this compliment as backhanded, as it's somewhat pretentious to attribute all of her success to how HHM coached her, implying that she's only as good as she is because of it and would be nothing without it, opposed to her actually having a natural skill to be a talented lawyer on her own. This idea is furthered when Howard compares Kim to a baby bird growing its wings and leaving the nest for the first time. Again, an originally positive connotation to imply someone simply growing up and making a name for themselves, but it can also come across as patronizing to Kim. Kim becomes petty towards Howard's microaggressions, so she returns the courtesy by acting extremely passive-aggressive right back to him in order to give him a taste of his own medicine, so to speak. She does this by walking up to his table the same way he did to her and telling him to stay seated in the same way as well. She then gives him a check and walks off. The check turns out to be the sum of the remainder of Kim's debt that she had previously owed HHM for putting her through law school. Although Howard dropped the debt as a parting gift for Kim giving Howard a check for the rest of the money anyways is meant to imply how she doesn't need his help anymore, as she finds it insulting that he only thinks that she's as successful as she is right now because of him. After Kim gives Howard the check and walks back to her table, I love how you can once again see Howard staring at her in the background, just like how when he first noticed her, as he's a bit shaken up at the message that the check is supposed to imply. After lunch, Howard confronts her about the check outside the front doors. Howard seems off-put by Kim now wanting to pay him back for the student loans when she was perfectly fine accepting his gift to not have to pay back the rest of it when she first left HHM. Howard then admits how he's been stressfully doing damage control the past few weeks by taking different clients out to eat 3 times a day every single day for each of his meals in order to attempt to heal HHM's wounded reputation after Chuck's meltdown. Howard blames Kim and Jimmy for quote dragging HHM's reputation through the mud after what they did to Chuck. Not only does Kim deflect the blame, but she also accuses Howard of ignoring Chuck's condition when it best suited him, similar to Jimmy's mindset back in season 1. Although I personally think Howard did genuinely believe in Chuck's condition and wanted to see him recover, I'd be remiss to not acknowledge how I could see things from Kim and Jimmy's perspective as well. Howard feels as though he's done nothing but help Kim throughout her career by mentoring her and putting her through law school, just for her to betray him by helping Jimmy and make Chuck look like a fool, with her check to him feeling like one final F you. Howard then angrily rips up the check, stating how her debt is forgiven but anything else is on her, implying how she should take accountability responsibility for helping aid in the detriment of HHM's reputation. Kim retorts by stating how all she did was reveal Chuck's condition for what it truly was, and that if Howard was actively hiding that truth from his clients, then he's equally to blame as well. Later that episode, Howard once again visits Chuck to update him on some news, this time being some bad news about his malpractice insurance, which as we know is due to Jimmy secretly outing Chuck to his insurance company about his meltdown. As the scene starts, Howard is greeted by Chuck outside his house as Chuck just finished walking home from going to the grocery store himself, showing how well Chuck's recovery has skyrocketed the past few weeks. It's ironic how the scene starts out with Howard seeing such good news about Chuck's path to recovery, when the bad news that he's about to give Chuck will be the final nail in the coffin to completely ruin that path to recovery. The next episode, 309, elaborates on this issue as we get a meeting with Howard, Chuck, and the representatives of their insurance company. Due to Chuck's meltdown, he now poses such a high risk to insure that their insurance company is doubling their insurance rates on every single practicing attorney that HHM has, along with giving Chuck a babysitter so he won't cause any more harm. Chuck puts his foot down and straight up threatens to sue the insurance company, so after they leave, Chuck instantly starts planning out their plan of attack, but Howard has other intentions. Howard thinks that going after their insurance company is ridiculous and has instead realized that their insurance company isn't the problem, but rather Chuck is. So Howard decides to politely and subtly confront Chuck on this by starting to imply that maybe he should retire, painting it in a positive light as it would open up a ton of different opportunities for him. As Howard compares him to a retired litigator that became a professor at a university and wrote a book, he implies that Chuck could do something similar. This is a classic tactic of trying to convince someone to do something you know they won't like by painting it in a positive to make it seem enticing. I like how Howard also poured them both a drink before bringing this up as to prepare Chuck for what he's about to say, along with prepare himself for Chuck's reaction. Chuck can see right through this though and doesn't bite, instead becoming extremely offended. Although Howard states that there's more to life than being a lawyer, something that he'll come to repeat in his final episode, Chuck has always had the mindset of retirement not being until the distant future, as his career is his life. After hearing Chuck's stubborn reluctance, Howard begins requesting him to retire more firmly, stating how wanting him to retire is more than just a suggestion. Howard is now at a crossroad where he's starting to believe that Chuck's condition is a detriment to the firm, and maybe Chuck should give up the idea of recovering and returning to his job. Howard was one of, if not the very last person holding out hope that Chuck would recover, but from the damage control due to his meltdown and what Kim said and now the insurance, everything is stacking up to the point that it's all starting to come crashing down around them. As Howard says, it's not just the insurance, but that's the straw that broke the camel's back, with things piling up even before Jimmy's hearings, such as Chuck's outlash with Mesa Verde. Chuck starts freaking out at Howard, trying to convince him that he's fine, but as he holds up a desk light to his face, it just further validates Howard's point. As Howard says, this is not what fine looks like, and the way that Howard looks at Chuck with such sadness just speaks volumes. The look of pity and sympathy that Howard gives Chuck also reminds me a lot of the way that Howard looked at him at his house after his outlash over the Mesa Verde numbers, when Chuck was frantically looking through all of his paperwork with a space blanket wrapped around him. This scene ends with Howard stating how although Chuck is one of the greatest legal minds he's ever known, due to recent events, his actions have become unpredictable, with Howard feeling like he can't be partners with someone he doesn't trust. Howard may now feel like he was too soft on Chuck previously by spinelessly supporting his decisions and allowing him to make judgment calls that weren't in the firm's best interest. Heck, maybe Howard is even having regrets about supporting the idea of Chuck's condition being real instead of in his head, essentially enabling his condition to manifest. Howard was willing to let Chuck's previous mistakes go in hopes that they could just move on with their lives, but now that all the consequences of Chuck's actions keep piling up, Howard realizes that this isn't something he can just brush under the rug and move on from. It's gone to the point where Howard feels like Chuck has forced his hand, which is a common theme for him. Howard never actively goes out to ruin someone's day, and by this I mean he's never the initial aggressor. However, when push comes to shove, people force Howard's hand and give him no other option than to respond with unpleasantries. Later in that same episode, we see Jimmy borderline harassing Howard to settle the Sandpiper case right as Howard pulls into the underground parking lot at HHM. This is yet another moment where Howard comes across as a bit of a prick, but when you consider everything going on from his perspective, you can start to understand why he's acting this way. Howard has always looked up to Chuck, not only as his best friend and business partner, but both as a mentor and somewhat of a father figure. So with that in mind, after over a year and a half of supporting Chuck through his condition, it was a huge deal for Howard to put his foot down and try to convince Chuck to retire. Howard's really going through it right now, so with all this on his plate, settling the Sandpiper case is the last thing on his mind. Jimmy walks up to Howard to berate him, accusing him of screwing over the elder clients in the Sandpiper case by holding out longer than they need to just so they can make more money. Jimmy puts on the act of taking the high road here, as the elder clients may only get like $1,000 more each, while HHM will gain millions. Since the elders are growing of old age, it'd be preferable to settle now and give them all their payment while they're still alive and capable to enjoy it. Howard sees right through Jimmy's act though, as he knows that Jimmy pretending to care about what's best for the clients is just an angle. Howard's incredibly short with Jimmy on this matter, comparing him to Gollum in regard to being completely transparent and pathetic. Side note, it would be factually correct for Howard to reference the Lord of the Rings movies, as this scene takes place in March of 2003, meaning that the first two movies would have been released by now, with the third one on the way later that year. Howard continues to call Jimmy out for wanting a handout by offering him money out of his wallet, stating that the next time he wants a handout, be straightforward instead of hiding behind the facade with a high horse of superiority. Jimmy doesn't quit there though, instead still following Howard to the elevator to further convince him. Howard's fed up by this point, stating how Jimmy's only looking out for his own best interest under the ruse of looking out for everyone else's. Howard also berates Jimmy with hypotheticals of cons that Jimmy might do to force HHM to settle, showing how well Howard knows Jimmy and his ways. Howard implies how Jimmy would have already done these things if it weren't for the fact that it could jeopardize his payout, which he's too greedy to do. Funnily enough, even though Jimmy ends up giving up trying to force Sandpiper to settle this season, he will return to the idea by the final season due to Kim, causing Howard's prediction of Jimmy's sabotage here to come full circle, especially considering Howard's fate as a result. Later on, as Howard finishes up with a meeting, his secretary brings him a letter from Chuck. Howard immediately assumes that this is a retirement letter, so he gets a smirk on his face as he thinks that Chuck has finally come around, even instinctively telling his secretary to start making retirement party preparations. However, as he opens the letter, he realizes that this is no form of resignation, but rather retaliation. Instead of resigning and retiring, Chuck is threatening to sue the firm, implying how he'd rather burn HHM to the ground if he doesn't get his way than to just give up and retire, since Chuck's career is all he has left. Howard immediately goes over to Chuck's house to confront him on this, and it seems as though Chuck was expecting this, as he's putting on a play of sorts to exaggerate how well he's recovered from his condition. Remember, Howard wants Chuck to retire due to his condition becoming too much of a detriment, so Chuck figures if he can show Howard how well he's recovering, his condition would no longer be a concern. Chuck does this in the form of turning on all the lights in his house, using his kitchen appliances once again, even the plugged-in mixer. Since Chuck sees HHM as his own success, he won't have Howard push him out, especially when he's on the path to recovery more than he's ever been before. When Howard implied that Chuck should retire, he suggested Chuck keep ownership of the firm under his name as part of his legacy, when in reality, this was just so Howard wouldn't have to pay out Chuck's share of $8 million when he retired. Chuck states how he's calling Howard's bluff, explaining how since he won't willingly retire, if Howard wants him out, he'll have to pay him out of his entire share, which will completely cripple HHM. Chuck's response of antagonizing Howard and HHM in his own best interest further validates Howard's decision to not want Chuck to work at HHM anymore. Even though Chuck thinks that he's making a big brain move here, he's proving Howard's point about his concerns as being completely correct. Howard tries to get Chuck to listen to reason, but Chuck won't discuss the matter any further unless it's in court, so Howard leaves. Oh, and side note, with Chuck left alone, we see him instantly start reacting to the mixer he's using, proving that yes, Chuck was only putting on an act. This brings us to the season 3 finale, where Howard only gets one scene, but it's a big one. Not only is this scene Chuck's final time in HHM, but it also consists of the final time Howard will ever see or speak to Chuck as well. Considering all the repercussions this causes in the season 4 aftermath, let's jump right into it, as there's a lot to discuss. This all starts with Howard and Chuck in HHM's conference room alongside all the other head partners of the firm. Chuck monologues about how these circumstances are embarrassing, sympathizing how none of them wants this situation. Chuck lays out only two options that he sees them having, neither of them being preferable. The first is going to trial, and the second is to buy out Chuck's share. Chuck has essentially backed Howard into a corner where he sees Howard's only two options as undesirable, which will force Howard to give Chuck what he wants by agreeing to keep working alongside him at HHM. However, instead of shaking Chuck's hand to put all this behind him, Howard has a different plan. Howard requests for them to have the room, which as we know, can never mean good news. Howard listened to Chuck and let him put on a show, but now it's Howard's turn to tell Chuck how he truly feels. Howard calling out Chuck here is one of my favorite moments of this season and the first 3 seasons in general. Here's why. Although Chuck is pretending to stand on a high horse with his oh-so-mighty moral high ground, Howard explains the situation for what it is, calling Chuck out for all his BS on how Chuck's totally betrayed him. This is where we find out that for almost 18 years, Howard and Chuck have run HHM together. Howard admits how during the entire time he always looked up to Chuck and supported him because he used to always have the firm's best interest in mind, which is now no longer the case. This relates back to the previous scene, as Chuck is willing to risk the firm's well-being in order to get what he wants, something he'd never do previously. Howard calls Chuck out for letting personal vendettas get in the way of what's best for HHM, implying that Chuck's chase after Jimmy has given him tunnel vision, causing him to become completely oblivious to the damage he's actually causing HHM in the process. Howard explains how all he did was mildly suggest retirement with empathy and concern, which resulted in Chuck turning around and threatening to sue the firm, which is an act of betrayal of both their professional partnership and friendship as a whole. In an effort to try and stay at HHM, Chuck has ruined his own friendship with Howard, with their business relationship being right alongside that too. Howard has tried time and time again to support Chuck and go with his plans, even if Howard knew it was a bad idea. For too long, Howard hasn't had a spine when it came to standing up to Chuck when he believed Chuck was making bad decisions. As we can clearly see, there's good reason why Howard always supported Chuck. He wasn't always following along with his plans due to their friendship or even the the great amount of respect that Howard has for him, but also in fear of what Chuck would do if they ever got in a disagreement. As soon as Howard finally grew a backbone and put his foot down, Chuck turned around and threatened to sue the firm, an incredibly drastic measure of complete betrayal of everything they've built together. I personally agree with everything Howard says here, as it's incredibly satisfying to see him finally put Chuck in his place by calling him out for his BS after everything Chuck put him through while Howard constantly supported him. I bet Howard hoped that he could sit down and have a rational conversation with Chuck, even if that was wishful thinking. Howard probably assumed that Chuck wouldn't be able to drop the act and genuinely open up to Howard and work things out, but he still wanted to at least make an effort to do so. So when Howard realizes that this won't go anywhere, he gives up and simply gives Chuck an envelope which contains a surprise fourth option that Chuck never thought of. This fourth option is where Howard will be buying out Chuck's share out of his own pocket. This way Howard is able to buy Chuck out and get him to leave the firm without jeopardizing HHM financially. Since this is Howard's only remaining option, Chuck has ironically and unintentionally hurt Howard more than he could have ever imagined. Chuck thought he was calling Howard's bluff, but instead of caving, Howard doubled down, personally paying Chuck out of pocket for him to leave. So instead of crippling HHM, all Chuck has accomplished is crippling his best friend instead. Whereas Chuck put his own best interests in front of the firm's, Howard paying Chuck out of his pocket is the perfect contrast to that, showing how Howard will protect the firm at all costs, even if it means jeopardizing himself in order to do so. This play by Howard is a huge Uno reverse card, as the situation has gone from Chuck backing Howard into a corner to Howard now having Chuck in a checkmate. I love how Howard tells Chuck that he's won, as he's forced Howard's hand to play this card. In a sense, even though Chuck won the battle, he lost the war, as he'll still be leaving HHM. When Chuck and Howard both leave the conference room as they walk out to the main lobby, they see how every employee is gathered in order to wish Chuck a farewell. This shows that Howard had this all planned out from the start, even potentially to the point that he warned his colleagues that if he requested the room alone with Chuck, he'd use this last resort of paying Chuck out of pocket, resulting in Chuck leaving for good. Or maybe he had it all planned out from the start. Let me know what you think in the comments. Howard addresses the entirety of HHM, explaining how Chuck will be leaving effective immediately. In order to preserve Chuck's pride and ego, Howard gives a big speech talking up everything he's done for HHM, along with how much Howard respects Chuck and is proud of everything he's accomplished. When Howard asks Chuck if there's anything he wants to say, the look of disdain and huddled up frustration that Chuck gives Howard is priceless, as he's already upset in what's happened, but also doesn't appreciate being put on the spot in this position. So without Chuck saying another word, Howard starts giving him a long round of applause alongside everyone else there, as Chuck walks down the stairs and out the door of HHM for the final time. Although Howard gives the public appearance of everything being fine, after Chuck leaves, Howard's facade drops as his smile turns into a frown right before he walks away. Howard isn't proud of what he had to do, just like with many times previously, Howard's hand was forced. He wouldn't have done this if he didn't have to in order to save HHM from total financial ruin. Even so, he could have never foreseen what was about to happen next. After Chuck just ruined his friendship with Howard along with his career, he then went to completely cut ties with Jimmy before relapsing on his condition, resulting in him taking his own life as he had nothing left. Throughout all of season 3, specifically the finale, and going into season 4 with the downfall of Chuck, we begin to see how much it negatively affects Howard. To randomly fast forward to Howard's final scene halfway through season 6, he lists off all the hardships that he's had to deal with to Jimmy and Kim.
I've worked my way through worse. Debt, depression, my marriage falling apart. Oh, yeah. Been sleeping in the guest house for the better part of a year. Just one more thing good old Howard has to work through.
Throughout seasons 4 to 6, we will be discussing each complication that Howard experiences along the way. The first of which is Howard's debt, which started with having to pay Chuck out of pocket. The check that he gave Chuck was for $3 million, the first of 3 payments which Howard even needed to take out loans to get together. Since Chuck died before Howard was able to pay him the rest, I'm unsure if Howard still had to do the 2 final payments, with that money then going to whoever Chuck left in his will, Rebecca. Regardless, even just doing the first payment of $3 million was enough to cripple Howard financially. Also, in regard to the complication of Howard's marriage falling apart, we've already started to see multiple causes. Even though we don't see or even learn about Howard's wife Cheryl until the final season, the cause of all the strain on their marriage starts as far back as the first few seasons, even before Chuck's death. I imagine that Howard having to worry about Chuck and his condition has no doubt resulted in tension building between himself and his wife, and I can only wonder how Cheryl felt about it. Did she ever support Howard's desire to continue to support Chuck, or did she have opposing opinions? After Chuck's meltdown on the stand at Jimmy's hearing, Howard having to do damage control as a result most definitely stressed him out, which in turn put even more strain on his marriage. Then having to buy out Chuck's share, resulting in Howard going into debt, no doubt put a strain on his marriage as well, as the person Howard must have vouched for time and time again is now the cause of his financial stability completely collapsing from under him, which of course affects his wife as well, since they obviously share a life together. The final complication is Howard's depression, which we'll be exploring in depth throughout season 4 as Howard deals with the loss of Chuck, so let's jump right into it. Better Better Call Saul Season 4, which is from March 23, 2003 to April 1st, 2004. Going into Season 4, Howard is one of the first people at the scene of Chuck's death. He tries calling Jimmy to inform him, but Jimmy purposely ignores the call. Howard then calls Kim's apartment immediately after, and they realize it's important after all through hearing the live voicemail. Even though Howard and Jimmy have had their petty differences, it's a great show of character that Howard puts all that aside to inform Jimmy of what happened to Chuck, along with stopping Jimmy from running up to the vehicle that's transporting Chuck's body away in order to prevent him from potentially seeing what remains of Chuck's body. Howard is most likely in just as much shock as Jimmy, especially since both of their final confrontations with Chuck are now made particularly tragic in their own ways. That said, as we'll come to see throughout the season, they both handle Chuck's death in completely polar opposite ways. After Jimmy walks away, Kim briefly talks to Howard and a paramedic where they're told that Chuck didn't suffer, but neither Kim nor Jimmy truly believe that. Later in the episode, we see Jimmy struggling to deal with what just happened as Howard calls him to run Chuck's obituary by him for approval. As Howard describes Chuck's death, he mentions how it was a tragic and terrible accident, as the official story as to how he died is that he passed away in his sleep during an unintentional house fire. Although Chuck unalived himself, the idea of that being the case hasn't been brought up yet. One of the main focuses of this episode is the characters realizing and coming to terms with the fact that Chuck's death wasn't an accident, but rather intentional. For Jimmy, he suspected faulty play of some sort ever since he saw all of Chuck's electronics thrown out in the backyard. So while Jimmy listens to Howard talk about Chuck's death as if it were an accident, you can tell that Jimmy's having a hard time listening to it because I believe that deep down, Jimmy may already realize the truth. Likewise, although Chuck's death being a tragic accident is the narrative that Howard is running with, he may just be trying to save face in regard to the public reputation for both Chuck's legacy along with himself and HHM as a whole. As Jimmy hears Howard list off all of Chuck's greatest achievements, Jimmy puts the phone down without saying a word to Howard as he just can't listen to it anymore, resulting in Kim having to pick up the phone and tell Howard that it all sounds great. So while Howard is facing the tragedy of Chuck's death head on, Jimmy is actively avoiding it and repressing it in order to not have to deal with it. As we'll come to see throughout the entire season, Howard essentially deals with Chuck's death in the normal and healthy way that Jimmy should, but doesn't. We'll see Howard properly go through all the stages of grief and eventually come out the other side, whereas Jimmy is emotionally stuck and bottling up and repressing all of his grief as a coping mechanism. With that in mind, even though Howard has a surprisingly small amount of screen time this season compared to the first three, every time we check in on Howard in Season 4, it's meant to update us on how Howard is handling Chuck's death to compare and contrast Howard's normal grieving process with Jimmy's lack of one. Near the end of the episode, we see many of the characters at Chuck's funeral, of course including Howard, which is expected. What isn't expected though is the fact that Jimmy and Kim find Howard sitting on the curb to Kim's apartment once they arrive back from the funeral. The scene that follows is probably one of my favorite Howard scenes out of the entire show, even though it's also one of the most difficult to watch. Here's why. Howard visits them on the premise that he wants to come forward with his realization that Chuck unalived himself, completely unaware that Jimmy has already come to the same conclusion. Howard starts opening up about why he believes that Chuck's death wasn't an accident, first by stating how Chuck was using those lanterns daily for the better part of 2 years, so he'd know better than to accidentally cause a house fire with them. With the topic being brought up of Chuck's death not being an accident, the main theme of this scene consists of all three characters thinking of reasons as to why they may be guilty for Chuck's death and how they respond to that notion. As Howard admits that he doesn't feel like what happened to Chuck was an accident, he brings up how news got out that Chuck was retiring from HHM. Howard elaborates by admitting how Chuck wasn't just retiring, but that Howard forced him out as a result of Chuck forcing his hand. Kim realizes that Howard is about to admit how he thinks that Chuck's death was his fault, so in order to preemptively downplay this idea, Kim instead tries rationalizing other reasons why Chuck would take his own life. Howard responds to Kim by dismissing her point, stating how the bar hearing meltdown had nothing to do with his death, which is somewhat true. As we know, and as Howard says, after Chuck's humiliation at the hearing, he took Howard's advice to turn his life around and move on. With him then going on the fastest road to recovery that he's ever been on, Howard instead implies that it was his fault over a disagreement that they had. But when he blows past the seemingly insignificant origin of the disagreement, being that of their malpractice insurance, Jimmy asks Howard to elaborate. To Howard, the malpractice insurance wasn't the genesis of not wanting to be partners with Chuck anymore, but rather one of the many problems that acted as the straw to break the camel's back in the long laundry list of falling dominoes throughout the entire past year and a half.
You want me to retire over this? The insurance?
It's not just the insurance. That's the straw that broke the camel's back.
In Howard's hour of grief-strucken guilt, he starts second-guessing himself and starts thinking about what Chuck said in regard to wanting him to retire all because of the insurance, as if it were the only single isolated problem. Howard calls the malpractice insurance issue ridiculous, and that he should have just let it go, with his train of thought being that if he had, none of this would have ever happened. I do believe that Howard was right about the insurance being the last straw, so it's understandable how Howard would fixate on how he could have prevented Chuck's death in hindsight by making a single decision different. Howard continues to guilt himself about how he should have simply let it go, especially after everything Chuck's done for him. To Jimmy, the malpractice insurance being the final straw to break the camel's back is a huge deal to him. Jimmy originally thought it'd be an insignificant pain in Chuck's back, but as Howard brings it up as the catalyst for everything falling apart, Jimmy starts to realize that Chuck's death was truly his fault. Howard also states how Chuck was recovering fine up until the malpractice insurance problem, implying how Jimmy sabotaging Chuck's insurance is what caused him to relapse, with his condition worsening until he couldn't take it anymore. All episode long, Jimmy's been struggling to figure out why Chuck would have done such a thing, but now that Howard has given Jimmy the missing piece of the puzzle, it all makes sense. So while Howard and Kim are spitballing reasons why they think they should be responsible for Chuck's death, Jimmy secretly realizes that he's truly the one to blame. While Howard and Kim are forthcoming about admitting how or why they may be guilty, Jimmy keeps his guilt a secret. Howard admits how it never occurred to him how he could hurt Chuck, as he was so caught up in the situation. Although Howard did care a great deal for Chuck, he always put the wellness of HHM first, even before himself, so when Chuck became a threat to the firm, Howard protected it at all costs, even at the risk of his friendship with Chuck and Chuck's well-being. Howard tried getting through to Chuck, but when he couldn't, he had no other option but to force Chuck out. Howard had so much on his mind that he never took the time to stop and consider how terrible Chuck may feel giving up his career at HHM, which is why Chuck even went to such great lengths to stay there in the first place. Howard never thought that Chuck would be in such agony as a result of leaving HHM, as Howard always thought Chuck was so strong. We then get another contrast between Kim and Jimmy's reactions to Howard openly admitting that he thinks that Chuck took his own life because of him. Howard feels at fault and openly takes the blame, so Kim, reacting how a normal person would, feels bad for Howard for being mentally put through this realization and regret. Jimmy, on the other hand, is left with an ultimatum: to agree with Howard as the sole reason to blame Chuck's death on, or to come forth like Howard has and admit that he too could be considered guilty for Chuck's death, and even more so than Howard. Jimmy decides the former and to keep his culpability to himself, which results in him pushing all the blame onto Howard, which completely destroys him in one of the most heartbreaking moments of the entire show.
I think he did what he did because of me.
Well, Howard, I guess that's your cross to bear.
Not only does Jimmy completely crush Howard, but he does so in such a nonchalant way, completely undermining the gravity of the situation. With Howard purposely coming to them with the intention of admitting how he feels ultimately guilty for Chuck's death, Howard has essentially showed up on Jimmy's doorstep as the perfect scapegoat. Jimmy makes his response sound as if he's completely unaffected by what Howard just said, while acting like it doesn't involve or concern him whatsoever. Jimmy disassociates from the situation as if they're both crying over spilled milk. Jimmy's decision to hide his culpableness and instead push all the blame onto Howard greatly affects Howard's character going forward throughout the rest of the season, the rest of the show, and the rest of his life. In the following episode, episode 402, Kim goes to Howard's office in Jimmy's place to pick up the check and letter that Chuck left for Jimmy in his will. As Kim arrives, Howard is in the middle of a meeting with Rebecca, as Chuck has given almost everything he has to her. Howard knows how tough it is for everyone to handle the paperwork for Chuck's will so soon after his funeral, but as Rebecca leaves, she states that Howard's being polite and that it's truly her fault, as she wanted to get all the paperwork done while she was still in town. As Howard and Kim go through what Chuck left for Jimmy, or rather what he didn't leave, Kim becomes increasingly irritated at every step, as each parting gesture is an empty one. Although Chuck left his property, or rather what's left of it, to Rebecca, that they both agree how Jimmy should be able to go through all that's left and take anything you'd like. This act of courtesy sounds considerate on paper, but as we'll see in just a moment, it's actually quite offensive. Kim firmly states how Jimmy doesn't want any of it, and with that, Howard hands over an agreement for Jimmy to sign in order to get a share of what Chuck left for him. Kim coldly asks if Chuck left Jimmy $4,000, to which Howard reluctantly reluctantly corrects her by admitting that it's $5,000. Kim gives exposition for the audience in regard to about $4,000 to $5,000 being the minimal amount to give to someone if you want to cut them out of your will, but don't want it contested, with the agreement being so that Jimmy agrees to the terms and won't fight it. Howard then mentions how Chuck left Jimmy a spot on a scholarship board at HHM for aspiring youth. Again, although this sounds great on paper, realistically, it too is a hollow gesture that falls flat. Finally, Howard gives Kim a personal letter that Chuck had left for Jimmy, something that Chuck had written a while back, presumably before the events of the show. Rebecca reads the room and bids them farewell so Kim and Howard can hash out their differences in private. With Howard and Kim now alone, this is where Kim starts completely losing it at Howard, as she yells at him for both what Howard told Jimmy at the end of the last episode, along with what Chuck left for Jimmy. She has no idea that Jimmy's secretly guilty for Chuck's death, along with the fact that he pushed all the blame onto Howard, allowing him to take it instead. She forms an opinion based off of what she does know, which is that Howard was being selfish, apparently, as she thinks that he only wanted to offload his guilt to make himself feel better, being completely inconsiderate about how Jimmy would feel about learning that his brother actually took his own life the day of his funeral. Kim believes that Howard should have kept his correct theory to himself, or at least waited for the dust to settle before coming to them with the revelation. While Kim believed that Howard shouldn't have came to them so soon to discuss the fact that Chuck actually took his own life, I believe that Howard considered this time-sensitive information and wanted to tell Jimmy as soon as he could, again because Jimmy deserved to know the truth if he hadn't figured it out already. This is yet another moment of Howard being completely misunderstood. Kim thinks that Howard was so focused on offloading his guilt that he didn't even stop to think about how it would make Jimmy feel, when in reality that's only half true. Howard wasn't trying to offload his guilt, but rather simply wanted to inform Jimmy of the truth as he believed it was the right thing to do. I doubt that telling Jimmy and Kim that he feels guilty for causing Chuck to unalive himself lifted any weight off of Howard's chest. Telling Jimmy and Kim didn't make him feel better, and I'd go as far to say as I believe it made him feel worse, as he was essentially volunteering to have them fully blame him and make him their punching bag. Howard doesn't take the guilt that he feels over Chuck's death lightly, and especially after Jimmy allowed him to fully take the blame. Howard really beats himself up throughout the rest of the show while trying to deal with the guilt-stricken grief in a healthy way. So although I believe Kim was wrong about Howard selfishly wanting to offload his guilt, she is correct about him not thinking about what telling Jimmy this information on the day of his brother's funeral would do to him. In my opinion, I see a clear parallel with Howard forcing Chuck out of HHM to Howard telling Jimmy the truth about Chuck taking his own life. In both instances, Howard was so focused on the matter at hand that he didn't consider how it would affect each McGill brother respectively. Howard was so focused on saving the firm that he didn't think about how forcing Chuck out would cause him such depression. Likewise, Howard was so focused on the truth surrounding Chuck's death that he didn't consider what telling Jimmy the truth would do to him. Not only did Howard technically make the same mistake twice, but he ironically made the same mistake a second time while admitting to the first mistake, as Howard admitted that he never considered how forcing Chuck out of HHM would affect him, while currently telling Jimmy about the truth of how Chuck took his own life. Now, it's not like Howard didn't care about the McGill brothers, quite the opposite actually. Throughout the first 3 seasons, Howard was constantly forced between Chuck and Jimmy while trying to appease both sides, sadly resulting in him usually appeasing to neither. While Kim does have a point for calling out Howard for not telling Rebecca the truth about how Chuck took his own life, only Jimmy, I don't think Howard did so for nefarious reasons. So why did Howard feel like he owed it to Jimmy to tell him the truth, but not Rebecca? Well, Jimmy was much closer to Chuck than Rebecca was in the final few years of Chuck's life, and since Jimmy was there to help care for Chuck throughout his entire condition, Howard knew how much Jimmy truly cared for Chuck, even though Chuck not so secretly hated him. Howard not telling Rebecca or the public that Chuck unalived himself may be in order to save face. Now, I'm not talking about HHM's reputation, but rather Chuck's personal reputation specifically. Since Chuck tried so hard to keep his condition a secret from Rebecca due to shame, I don't doubt that he wouldn't have wanted Howard to tell Rebecca that he unalived himself for the very same reason. Now, I'd be remiss to not admit that Kim calling out Howard for telling Jimmy the truth but not Rebecca or the general public is a great point. So do you think that Howard considered what Chuck would have wanted in regard to Jimmy already knew all the intricacies about Chuck's condition and was there every step along the way, so I think he deserves to know? Or, oh, he never wanted to tell Rebecca about his condition, so maybe I shouldn't tell her. And that even though Howard was trying to make the correct decision on who to tell and who not to tell, does he really have any right to put himself in that position in the first place? Or was Howard just selfish, feeling like he just needed to tell somebody, so that's why he went to Kim and Jimmy? Now, just like most things in this show, it's not just one side or the other that's correct, but a combination of both. So even though I prefer to side with Howard, Kim does make a good point, and I feel like the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Again, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Now, Howard did unintentionally hurt Jimmy by bringing the information to him, but not in the way that that Kim thinks, as it's not the unaliving that hurt Jimmy, but rather the realization that the malpractice insurance that Jimmy sabotaged was the catalyst. Moving on to our next points. Finally, from Jimmy practically being cut out of Chuck's will, being asked to rummage around the wreckage where Chuck died, being offered something that Chuck would have never given him, along with a final letter that is in all likelihood negative, every seemingly positive gesture is actually terribly rude and offensive. Again, this may prove how Howard was completely oblivious to how all these things could have been taken the wrong way, as he was only trying to help by being courteous towards Jimmy, along with acting on Chuck's final wishes from his will. So half of it Howard was completely oblivious to, while the other half Howard was just trying to do right by Chuck's final wishes. Now, I may seem like a huge Howard defender in this moment, which is fine, you can label me that because I think it is the truth. I mean, this should have been expected after I did a 45-minute video last year solely defending Howard throughout the entire series. All this to say that Howard means well, but he's misunderstood. He tries helping, but his positive gestures are always misunderstood as negative ones. Whether Howard is oblivious to how his gestures could be taken the wrong way, or if Kim and Jimmy are just putting words in his mouth and only hearing what they want to hear, I'm not sure, but to be honest, it's probably a solid combination of both. All Howard has done so far this season is try to help and make things better, but in doing so, he's only made things worse, as he's been misunderstood every step along the way. This theme is essentially the crux of Howard's character throughout seasons 4 to 6, as he constantly tries to reach out to both Jimmy and Kim, only to have his hand wrongfully bitten in return. Now, the scene ends with Howard asking Kim what he can do to make things better in the most sincere way, to which Kim tells him to simply stay away and that the best thing he can do is to do nothing. This might seem random, but to paraphrase Mike from El Camino, sometimes setting things right is sadly something you can never do, as Howard tries time and time again to accomplish exactly that, but only makes things worse as a result. So for most of season 4, Howard takes Kim's advice to not reach out to her or Jimmy anymore, as we barely see him interacting with them for the rest of the season. Howard only sees Jimmy a few more times in season 4 when Jimmy approaches him. Instead, Howard takes his time to focus on himself and his own grief and to try to come out the other side a better man. So we don't end up seeing him again until a few episodes later, episode 405, and yet another extremely underrated Howard scene when he crossed paths with Jimmy in the courthouse bathroom. I love the premise of this scene, with this scene serving as the purpose of catching us up with how Howard's been dealing with his grief opposed to Jimmy. While Howard is working through and dealing with each stage of his grief and depression, Jimmy has completely moved on from Chuck's death without processing it whatsoever. So when Howard and Jimmy talk in this scene, there's a total disconnect between them as Howard's entire life is crumbling down around him while he struggles to stay afloat, when meanwhile Jimmy is so far removed from it that he's completely oblivious about what Howard's even upset about. This is the most washed up we've ever seen Howard look, as we're bumping into him while he's currently at rock bottom of his depression. From the second he turns around, it's almost a shock to see how messy and tired he looks after 3.5 seasons of him looking so professional. Howard is at his worst here, as he struggles to keep everything together in his life, especially since he has to continue on with the business even though he's in no mental state to do so. He's trying to keep himself together, but is blatantly failing at doing so, as he looks like a complete mess that hasn't slept in a week, which is unfortunately true. The reason why Howard looks so distraught is due to developing insomnia as a side effect to all the stress, guilt, and depression that he's been dealing with. Juxtapose this to Jimmy, who's seemingly completely fine, as if the final close family member of his didn't just take his own life indirectly because of him. Since Howard processing his grief in a natural way as the golden example of how Jimmy should be processing Chuck's death but isn't, it creates a great dynamic between the two. When Howard asks Jimmy if he's ever dealt with insomnia, not only is Jimmy unable to sympathize with that, when Jimmy suggests that Howard tries taking pills for his insomnia, Howard just gives a slightly unhinged laugh as if he's already tried that along with everything else that might help, but to no avail. When Jimmy genuinely asks Howard what's wrong, Howard doesn't even know where to begin. The sincerity in Jimmy's voice implies that he honestly doesn't realize that it's Chuck that Howard is so upset over, with Howard realizing that Chuck's death must have been so hard on Jimmy that he's acting like it never even happened or something. The thing that I love so much about this scene is the restraint that Howard has to discuss what's truly going on, combined with Jimmy's inability to do so anyways due to how he's compartmentalized Chuck's death. There's just this underlying tension with the idea that there's so much more that could be said between the two characters in this moment, but isn't. Howard wants to approach Jimmy and confide in him and help talk them both through this, but he stops himself due to remembering what Kim said to him a few episodes ago in regard to leaving them alone. Howard pauses for a moment considering this and then bites his lip, instead only saying that he's said enough, as he's now learned that anytime he wants to reach out and help, it'll only end end up biting him in the ass. Jimmy offers Howard a number to a therapist, and Jimmy is then surprised to learn that Howard has already been going to one of the best therapists in town multiple times a week, yet he still looks the way he does. This is obviously a complex issue, as the reality of it is that even though Howard may be getting the best help he can, therapy isn't gonna magically fix all of his problems like Jimmy thinks, only help him find a way through his problems. Now, just as Jimmy was finally starting to consider going, he sees Howard here, who completely dissuades him from doing so, as Howard is still so distraught after already going to therapy, which gives Jimmy the impression that therapy truly is useless and a waste of time that won't help after all. Not only is Howard dealing with the depression of Chuck's death along with the guilt that he feels due to completely being responsible for it in his eyes, but he's also overworked as he's playing catch up in order to deal with the aftermath of Chuck's death on a professional level. He's overworked, overtired, and completely drained emotionally. That plus running on next to no sleep has caused his professional and confident demeanor to completely collapse. Howard going through depression and being in such a vulnerable position is incredibly relatable. Plus, I can only imagine how this is affecting Howard's home life with Cheryl. We don't know how long Howard and Cheryl have been married, but we can assume that they've either been together since before Chuck started suffering from his condition or even before Howard's father died. Assuming Cheryl has been there alongside Howard the entire time, we can presume that just like with most marriages, they most likely started out happy and supportive of each other, but that in time drifted apart. One theory as to why this happened is Howard's grief eventually became too much for even Cheryl to handle. I'm guessing that she's been there for Howard throughout his grief and depression, even though it must have put a strain on their relationship, especially due to Howard's insomnia most likely causing both of them to get restless sleep, but put a pin in that for now. Let's move on to the next episode, 406, when Jimmy goes to Howard's office to pick up a check of $5,000 from Chuck's will. As it turns out, Jimmy signed the agreement and accepted Chuck's money after all and comes to pick it up. Due to Jimmy not wanting to wait a few days for the money, it gives us the perfect excuse to have Jimmy and Howard interact once more. Now, Howard is totally content with just giving Jimmy the check and having him leave without another word, but it's Jimmy that turns back to Howard and strikes up conversation. On his way in, Jimmy noticed a lot of empty cubicles around and naively asked Howard, "What's going on?" Jimmy continues his completely oblivious demeanor from the previous bathroom scene, where he's entirely unaware that Howard's bad mood and HHM's downsizing is all due to Chuck's death. If you remember back to the pilot episode of the show, one of Chuck's main concerns about leaving HHM and cashing out was the fact that he'd have to liquidate the firm and sell off a third of their assets, along with firing a third of their employees. Jump forward to the season 3 finale, and that's exactly what Chuck was weaponizing by threatening Howard with that outcome if Howard didn't let him stay at HHM. Now jump forward to season 4, now that Chuck is dead, it's happening anyways. This makes Howard forcing Chuck out through fear of it happening seem fruitless, as it only pushed Chuck to take his own life with HHM's downsizing happening anyways. Howard states how his consultants call it right-sizing as if they're trying to pretend it isn't something negative when it obviously is. Jimmy wonders what Howard is going to do to get HHM back on its feet, but Howard's been so busy dealing with the aftermath of Chuck's death that he's barely been staying afloat at this point, let alone trying to figure out a strategy to get HHM back on top like it used to be in its glory days. When Jimmy turns around and tells Howard to get his shit together, Howard is understandably shocked. Jimmy even goes as far to call Chuck's death one little setback, completely undermining it while projecting how little he cares about it. Howard is totally caught off guard by Jimmy's abrasiveness here, as it's completely disrespectful to everything Howard is going through. And really, Jimmy just may be upset over the state of disarray that HHM is in after Chuck died, and even though he's in denial about feeling bad over Chuck's death, he may be upset with Howard here because Howard isn't trying to do anything to instantly fix everything. There's realistically no reason for Jimmy to be so mean to Howard here, which is what leaves Howard so shocked. But Jimmy seems to be sickened at the sight that Howard's wallowing about due to depression of Chuck's death and the stress of the aftermath that it's caused, since Jimmy has never cared enough about Chuck's death to even become stressed or depressed in the first place. In Jimmy's eyes, since he's not torn up over Chuck's death, no one else should be either. Jimmy completely skipped grieving over Chuck whatsoever, instead instantly focusing on moving forward into the future. So with Jimmy so far ahead of everyone else's grieving process, it baffles him why Howard isn't already thinking about the future like he is. Howard is just completely bewildered at what Jimmy just said to him, as there's so much to unpack from Jimmy's attitude towards Chuck's death that Howard doesn't even know where to begin. I feel like Howard can see right through Jimmy's defense mechanisms, deflection, and denial over Chuck's death, and see why he's truly acting the way he is. Howard knows not to waste his breath trying to speak to Jimmy, because even if he did try to get through to him, it's not like Jimmy would ever listen to him anyways. Jimmy then calls Howard a shitty lawyer but a great salesman, so he should go out there and sell. Quick tangent, although Howard is a great lawyer, we are ironically never see him practice law on the show. Honestly, should have brought that up earlier. I suppose now is as good a time as ever, since although Howard is widely acclaimed as a successful lawyer, we never truly get to see him practice law. To actually trust what Jimmy's saying here, he's practically telling Howard that although he's trash at his job, he's great at putting on a fake face in order to manipulate the public with his charismatic persona into liking him. So with Jimmy now antagonizing him and being a real a-hole to him here, it just simply leaves Howard speechless. Well, not totally speechless actually, because after Jimmy continues to egg him on by insulting him and belittling him, Howard gives out a great
Fuck you, Jimmy.
as there's a million words that Howard could use to respond to Jimmy in this moment, but he's so baffled at Jimmy in this moment that all his thoughts consolidate into two very simple words. Anyways, to move on from these Howard and Jimmy scenes, we don't actually see Howard until the season 4 finale. But before we get there, I must acknowledge the fact that the back half of season 4 has the largest time skip in the first 5 seasons of the show and the main Better Call Saul timeline in general. In episode 407, we jump from April of 2003 to January of 2004, a full 9 months. Not only that, but episode 409 jumps ahead another 3 months from January 2004 to March of 2004. During this time, Howard has managed to deal with his grief and come out the other side for the most part. With the end of March approaching, it's now been 1 full year since Chuck's death. For the 1-year anniversary of Chuck's passing, Howard hosts the opening of the University of New Mexico's new law library, which has been named in honor of Chuck. Howard is interviewed by Joey the cameraman, where he admits that although it's been a tough year, HHM is back. This shows that Howard was always inevitably going to work on rebuilding the firm. It's just that Jimmy berating him about it in the previous scene so soon after Chuck's death was so untimely. Howard just needed some time to grieve and deal with the aftermath as a normal person would before then focusing on how to move forward into the future. Howard goes on about how much of an honor it is to have Chuck's name memorialized, but admits how it wasn't him who made the generous donation to do so, but rather an anonymous benefactor, Jimmy, who did so for nefarious and selfish reasons, but that's a story for another video. Later in the episode, Howard is present as a member of the board of HHM's scholarship committee that Jimmy was offered a spot on. As part of Jimmy's ulterior motives, he takes the spot as they vet through various applicants. We get a jarring montage of Howard introducing each candidate to the board with his charismatic smile and energy as he questions each and every one of them. This is of course the moment when Jimmy takes an interest in Christy Esposito due to relating to her about not getting a fair chance due to getting judged for their past. When Howard reads out the list of votes for each applicant, everyone gets multiple votes except for Christy, who only gets 1. Howard can tell that Jimmy has something on his mind, so he offers Jimmy an opportunity to speak, showing how he's willing to listen to Jimmy's opinion as an equal member of the board, even though Jimmy is out of place being there. I feel like Howard can see Jimmy is projecting himself onto Christy as he defends her, so he agrees with Jimmy's argument and even offers for the entire board to take another vote, even if it proves to be fruitless. So that, anticlimactically, is Howard's final 2 scenes in season 4. During them, we don't really hear about how he recovered from his grief, only that he seems better and that HHM seems to be recovering as well. So while season 4 didn't elaborate much on how Howard's doing post-time skip now a year after Chuck's death, season 5 will fill in some of these details. But first, I wanted to digress for a moment and talk about Howard's lack of screen time during season 4 and even season 5 coming up. Although Howard is technically a main character / series regular, he was created to be a strong supporting character on the lawyer side of the show. Although Howard is considered a supporting character for Jimmy and Kim, he mainly supported Chuck's character as his best friend and business partner at HHM. So it makes sense that Howard would get less screen time now that Chuck is dead, and also why Howard's scenes post-time skip aren't focused on his own mental recovery, with the show instead using him to complement Jimmy's scheme to get his law license reinstated. Throughout the final 3 seasons of the show, Patrick Fabian has implied multiple times that he was simply gracious for the opportunities to keep coming back to the show, as the creators continuously found new things for his character to do. Lesser shows would have had him fizzle out or even completely disappear now that the Chuck arc is over, but the creators of Better Call Saul recognized how great of an actor Patrick Fabian is, along with how well his portrayal of Howard fits into the show. So most likely due to the combination of the creators both loving Patrick and Howard alike, they kept bringing him back, but in such a way that still aids the story and pushes it forward in order for it to feel like it has a purpose instead of just feeling like they kept him around because they like him. Even though Howard gets less screen time in season 4, there's still just as much, if not more, to unpack from what little time we do see him, if you can tell by how long I've been talking about season 4. Since a lot of Howard's grieving process process happens off screen with us just getting sporadic updates, it feels like there's a lot more going on behind the curtains. The juxtaposition between the way that Howard and Jimmy handled Chuck's death is vastly underrated in my opinion, especially considering everything that we can infer from what we do see of Howard. Likewise, going into season 5, we'll mainly be focusing on how Howard has changed now that he's properly processed his grief over Chuck and is now mentally healed and moved on, as well as much as he can, in his own special namaste kind of way. Better Call Saul season 5, which is from April 1st to May 14th, 2004. Going into season 5, we don't see Howard until the end of the second episode, where he approaches Jimmy in the courthouse hallway, who's now been reinstated as a lawyer and is practicing under the new name Saul Goodman. Howard comes across as incredibly positive as he congratulates Jimmy for getting reinstated and is respectful of Jimmy's professional name change. Howard attempts to make small talk and mentions in passing how he thinks that this might be HHM's best year yet, which, side note, is incredibly ironic and tragic to hear him say in hindsight since neither HHM nor Howard survived the year, but more on that later. Howard asks Jimmy if he's available for lunch sometime, but with Jimmy's attention elsewhere as the person he's been waiting to speak to just walked out of court, he brushes off Howard's lunch invitation, instead telling Howard to have his secretary make an appointment for him. I assume Howard did just that because by episode 504, we finally see Jimmy take Howard up on this offer, but in such a way where Jimmy is just wanting to see what Howard wants to get him off his back. Ironically, going to see Howard for lunch will prove to accomplish the exact opposite. Jimmy arrives fashionably late to lunch with Howard, who's passing the time waiting for him by speaking to a judge. Even though we've just started this scene to already digress for a moment, the judge himself isn't notable, but what is notable is the fact that Howard implies that they golf.
You built that place single-handedly while he was out at Four Hills working on his bunker shot.
So as Jimmy and Howard sit down, Howard shows a positive yet curious interest in Jimmy's new professional name, Saul Goodman. When he asks if he can still call him Jimmy, Jimmy states how Saul is his professional name while his friends still call him Jimmy. Jimmy then adds that Howard can call him Jimmy too, potentially implying that although Howard isn't one of his friends, he'll allow it anyways due to their long history as acquaintances. Howard takes no offense to this, instead asking Jimmy to elaborate about Saul Goodman. As Jimmy gives Howard a pitch about Saul, Howard gets a big smirk on his face as he's almost proud to see what Jimmy has become and is proud of the pride that Jimmy has as Saul Goodman, being the lawyer who defends the little guy when no one else will. Howard's asking so much about Jimmy's new Saul Goodman persona due to becoming curious as to why Jimmy willingly decided to stop practicing under the name McGill, whereas back in season 1 he was adamant about wanting to be able to use his own last name. Jimmy wants to distance himself from his family name, and I don't think Howard blames him as he understands the tragic history of Jimmy's immediate family. Howard elaborates by stating how HHM did him wrong, as his name is part of HHM, which has now become tainted. Howard even goes so far as to say that they've ruined Jimmy's legacy as a McGill, which is what makes Howard believe that Jimmy is trying to create a new legacy for himself with Saul Goodman. Jimmy belittles Howard's point, but Howard insists that he's been thinking about all of his past interactions with Jimmy and how he regrets them. As a part of Howard going through and dealing with his grief and depression, it wasn't just time that healed his wounds, but also the determination to become a better man than he used to be. It seems like Howard took a good hard look at his life and past actions and totally reevaluated himself, becoming incredibly self-aware about all of his mistakes. Now, Howard is determined to move forward by never making those same mistakes again, along with righting any wrongs that he may have done in the past. Going into season 5, since Howard has a totally new outlook on life now, he's approaching Jimmy from a completely different angle. This makes Howard think that he'll be able to get through to Jimmy and actually help him, when in reality, this method of approach will go just as badly for Howard as his previous attempts. Howard then takes accountability for his actions by stating that they should have hired Jimmy at HHM in the past. As Howard gets into the details, he openly acknowledges his faults as he is finally self-aware enough to realize them in retrospect and also accept accountability for it. Howard states that Jimmy had potential, which he could have acted upon, but didn't due to not having a backbone when facing Chuck in his vendetta. Howard admits that both in 98 and at the end of season 1, he was too spineless to give Jimmy a fair shot like he should have, as it would have been the right thing to do. Even though Chuck had Howard's hands tied, Howard did go along with it, so even though Chuck controlling him like a puppet helps us not be so hard on Howard, it's not a complete excuse that absolves any guilt Howard might have. Jimmy is so far gone by this point that everything Howard's trying to apologize for feels too little too late. Maybe if Howard would have went to Jimmy in season 1 or even season 2 and apologized, it would have meant more than it means now. The first time that Howard didn't hire Jimmy was in 98, so it's been over 5 years since that happened. Plus, Howard made the same mistake again by not hiring Jimmy in 2002 near the end of season 1, showing that even after all this time, Howard never changed or became a better person. Now that Chuck has died and Jimmy has totally moved on from that, he couldn't care less about the petty squabbles that he used to have with Howard and Chuck. Jimmy continues to belittle Howard's sincere apology, implying that although he understands that Howard has realized his wrongs and now finally feels bad about them, his apology apology doesn't affect Jimmy at all, with him instead only sarcastically stating how he's glad that Howard has had this moment of clarity in hindsight. Now sadly, it's only Chuck's death that caused Howard to realize his past transgressions, but likewise, Chuck's death is what caused Jimmy to distance himself from Chuck, HHM, and the McGill name as a whole, causing him to not care about any apology that Howard may have developed for him. Howard states how he's not focused on the past, but only mentioned it in order to set up his true goal, which is to correct his missed opportunity with Jimmy's potential. Howard puts all of his cards on the table at this point, openly offering Jimmy a job to come work at HHM. Jimmy's understandably taken aback by Howard's offer, as he's surprised that Howard would want him working with him after everything that's happened between them. Howard wants to clear the air between them and bury the hatchet, stating how all their previous disputes are between Jimmy and Chuck, nothing more. Jimmy sees Chuck in Howard, as Howard is a reminder of Chuck and all the time in Jimmy's life between the early 90s and early 2000s where he was fighting so hard for Chuck's brotherly love and approval as a lawyer, which he never got. And it's also possible that Howard just still feels guilty over Chuck's death, so he may be partially trying to redeem himself by hiring Jimmy at HHM. Jimmy tries to deter Howard from hiring him by alluding how much Cliff Main hated him by the end of working at Davis and Main, but Howard comes forth about how this isn't a spur-of-the-moment decision and that he's been considering it for a while, which implies that he's well aware of Jimmy's antics at Davis and Main, but is willing to look past it. Since Howard is able to read Jimmy so well, he probably understands that Jimmy only purposely quit Davis and Main because of how unhappy he was there. So Howard must figure that if he can give Jimmy the proper environment that he needs, along with giving him the freedom to do things his own way, that Jimmy could actually thrive at HHM alongside him. I believe that Howard is willing to look past all of Jimmy's actions that Chuck could not. Even though Howard may not take it as far as being okay with Jimmy constantly breaking the law, Howard may be more willing to accept that the ends justify the means when it comes to Jimmy's actions, something that Chuck could never agree with. Howard brings up the Christy Esposito girl that Jimmy was defending during the season 4 finale, since as it turns out, Howard didn't just let Jimmy speak his mind in order to be polite, but Jimmy standing up for Christy actually changed Howard's perspective of judgment and honesty in general. So in a way, even though by the season 4 finale, Howard had already mostly recovered from his depression over Chuck, it wasn't really until after he saw Jimmy stand up for Christy that he had the epiphany to truly change his outlook on life and how he perceives people. Howard then brings up how Jimmy wasn't wrong when he kicked his ass the previous year, which I believe is the scene in 406. Thing is, what Jimmy said to Howard was correct, Howard just wasn't at the stage in his grieving and recovery process yet to hear it. So when he eventually was, he realized that what Jimmy was trying to tell him was right all along, even if it was some tough love. Howard uses this as an example to compliment Jimmy for having the ability to accomplish what he sets out to, no matter the means, as Howard respects Jimmy's resourcefulness and hustle mentality, calling him a go-getter. This brings Howard to his true point, which is that both HHM as a whole and Howard himself could really use someone like Jimmy, finally appreciating and acknowledging his usefulness where in the past, people such as Chuck didn't. As icing on the cake, Howard pridefully calls Jimmy Charlie Hustle, calling back to that old nickname. This is also meant to imply how Howard had always seen potential in Jimmy's work ethic, even if he's just now trying to capitalize on it so many years later. In order to avoid instant rejection, Howard does the classic tactic of telling Jimmy that he doesn't want an answer immediately, but instead wants to give Jimmy some time to truly think it over before responding. I personally believe that Howard is being genuine here and means well, but Jimmy may think that he can see right through Howard, as he possibly believes that Howard just wants to use him for his name's sake to help with HHM's reputation. Howard didn't want Jimmy to practice with his name McGill in season 1, yet now he wants Jimmy to join HHM as a McGill? Has Howard truly gotten over his bitterness for Jimmy, or is Jimmy correct that Howard just wants to use him for his namesake? Even if that's not true, Jimmy may force himself to believe it's true in order to forcibly antagonize Howard in any way possible due to him being personally offended by Howard's job offer to work at HHM, as it's something that Chuck would have never been okay with. Even though Howard claims to realize why Jimmy distanced himself from the McGill name, he's still oblivious and or inconsiderate about how trying to reel Jimmy back into HHM could reopen old wounds. Again, Howard is so focused on accomplishing the matter at hand, he doesn't think or realize how it may make the other person feel. Offering Jimmy a job he doesn't care about anymore but once worked so hard to get feels like a slap in the face. Howard deciding to bury the hatchet and right his wrongs with Jimmy begins a huge domino effect throughout the rest of the show, eventually resulting in both the downfall of HHM and his own demise. In retrospect, if only he could have moved on from the McGills and left well enough alone, he would have lived a much longer life with a far less tragic ending. Sadly, as much as Howard is able to process his grief and try to move on, the truth is that Howard would never be able to escape the McGill name since it's so closely associated with HHM and his own legacy. Hypothetically, it's possible that Howard could have downsized and changed the firm's name, like what happens to HHM after his death in season 6, except how that may have felt like starting all over, something Howard may not have been confident enough to do. So as much as Howard likes to think that he's trying to move on by still working at HHM and trying to rebuild it to its former glory, he's still tied to the past of the McGill brothers' feud along with his father. Speaking of which, his father's legacy may have also been a large factor as to why Howard wanted to try to rebuild HHM instead of rebranding or pivoting in another direction. Anyways, as Howard's lunch with Jimmy ends, he gives Jimmy a big hug, which Jimmy doesn't reciprocate. When Howard drives away, Jimmy takes a moment to stare at his license plate, which Howard has changed to the vanity plate that spells out Namaste in reflection of his new outlook on life. This increases Jimmy's envy of Howard's ability to successfully grieve and accept Chuck's death in a healthy manner, since Howard's license plate feels like he's bragging about it to the world and essentially rubbing it in Jimmy's face. So instead of accepting or denying Howard's job offer, Jimmy takes it one step further and decides to destroy Howard's property by childishly throwing bowling balls over his gate and onto his car. Although it's brief, when Jimmy does throw the bowling balls, we can see Howard walk out onto a balcony overlooking it. Taking what we eventually learn in season 6 and looking back on season 5, we can see that Howard is already living in his guest house by this point. The scene in season 6 where Howard admits he's been living in the guest house for the better part of a year happens in June of 2004, which means he's been living in the guest house since roughly summer 2003, which was during that major time skip in season 4. With Chuck dying of March 2003, Howard moving into his guest house in the summer of 2003 is most likely connected. The last time we saw Howard before the season 4 time skip was during the episode 406, which was in April of 2003. Howard was clearly still beating himself up over Chuck's death and wallowing in his depression, still unable to move on from the past and focus on the future. By this time, Howard had been suffering from insomnia for a while, so it's possible that Cheryl was simply so sick of dealing with Howard's insomnia that she kicked him into the guest house so she wouldn't have to be bothered by it. Although possible, I doubt that's the only reason, just one of many. Now, I'd like to believe that Cheryl used to be somewhat caring and sympathetic towards Howard, and that she may have supported him through his grieving process, including his insomnia and overall depression. So even though it may have put a strain on their marriage, it may not have been Howard's wallowing in depression or grief that caused her to start distancing herself from him, but rather the person he became once he crawled out of that depression. Howard's Namaste lifestyle is the amalgamation of all of his desires to move on with his life while trying to be the best person he can be, but Howard takes it to such an extent that he makes it his whole personality. Although positivity is great to share and spread around, as you may know, it's possible to be so positive and happy all the time that it can become increasingly annoying and irritating, which is what Cheryl must have eventually started feeling towards Howard's new persona. I assume Cheryl loved Howard for who he was before, and although she's happy that Howard was able to properly process his grief and move on from it, she doesn't like the type of zen personality he's acquired because of it. So it's the type of situation where she should be happy he's recovered, but is instead upset at who he's become as a result of his recovery. Now, since Howard has been sleeping in his guest house since the summer of 2003, we can assume that Howard was able to process his grief and recover from his depression and insomnia within the first few months of the time skip leading into the summer, but that the strain on his marriage from that, along with Cheryl not being a fan of his new perspective of peace and tranquility, continuously pushed her further and further away from him until it got to the point that they were literally sleeping in different beds. Now, put a pin in Howard's marriage for now, as we gotta jump back to Jimmy continuously putting off Howard's job offer while essentially harassing him for the rest of the season for no good reason. In the next episode, 505, we get our first instance of Howard asking Jimmy about the job offer. Side note, it appears that Howard is shown to be in a room of his house that we've never seen before, nor will we ever see again. When Howard calls Jimmy, to most, it'd be pretty obvious what it's about. For Jimmy, however, he put Howard's offer so far back in his mind that he's completely forgotten about it by the time Howard calls him, as he's completely oblivious as to what Howard wants. When Jimmy finally realizes, he tries playing it off, pretending that he's still interested, but really anyone could tell by the way he's talking that he totally forgot and hasn't thought about it since. Howard actually takes him at his word though, and I'm not sure if that's naivete, politeness, or if Howard actually believes him due to hearing what he wants to hear. Jimmy lies, saying how it's all he's been thinking about, but needs some more time to think it over, so Howard respectfully obliges, saying that he's ready to talk details whenever Jimmy is. Howard goes to tell Jimmy something else, but Jimmy completely hangs up on him mid-sentence, clearly just leading him on and not actually caring about the job offer, but for some reason unable to properly turn him down either. In the next episode, 506, the thought of Howard actually crosses Jimmy's mind, but for nefarious reasons. When finishing up with a few clients who were in trouble for prostitution, Jimmy takes them up on their offer to pay them for their time, but not in the typical way you might think. This is of course when Jimmy hires the prostitutes to go accost Howard during one of his lunch meetings with Cliff Main, pretending to know him and getting mad at him for apparently not paying them in full for their services. The scene starts with Howard arriving at the restaurant, where he walks past yet another judge friend and makes small talk about golf. At first glance, I thought it might have been the same judge from before, but no, Nope, completely different one entirely. As Howard approaches his table where Cliff is waiting for him, Cliff starts gossiping about the judge that Howard just spoke to. Now, these small talk convos aren't important in the grand scheme of things, with this instance only being to show viewers that this is a lunch spot that Howard regulars at and that most of the people there, including the staff, know him at least somewhat personally. This is when the prostitutes walk in to cause a scene, and as horrible as it is to see this happen to Howard, I do gotta admit it's kinda comedic. Calling him Howie, joking about how their pimp isn't happy, and of course overreacting the second Howard barely touches one of them, trying to politely direct them to leave.
I don't know you and owe no money to you. That's it.
Don't touch her!
Speaking of which, this is yet another example of Howard doing everything within his power to make the situation better when in reality he only makes it worse. The fact that the prostitutes actually know him by name is already a red flag for Cliff, but then the way that Howard says, "I don't know them, I don't know you," really sounds like Howard is trying to pretend he doesn't when he actually does, along with trying to imply to the prostitutes that they should pretend like they don't know him either in public, as if he's trying to keep them a secret. Now, of course Howard doesn't actually know them, but again, the way he says this just sounds bad. Cliff then suggests that he could leave if Howard needs a moment alone with them to sort things out, as Howard clearly appears to have unfinished business with them, but Howard tells Cliff to stay as he just finds all of this incredibly ridiculous. At this point of the show, we knew nothing about Cheryl or Howard's love life, but fun fact, Howard has worn a wedding ring ever since season 1, even though it's barely noticeable as there's never really any close-ups focusing on it, along with the fact that we've never heard anyone comment on Howard's marriage or wife. What I'm getting at here is the fact that back when this first aired, Howard potentially being outed for having hired prostitutes is already embarrassing and damaging enough for his reputation, but when you consider the fact that Howard's actually married and add adultery on top of it, it starts to sound like a huge scandal. Now, as Howard starts getting screamed at for trying to direct them away, the scene cuts to Jimmy spying on the whole situation, where we can see Howard adamantly arguing with the prostitutes, who have no doubt alerted the entire restaurant of their purposely obnoxious screams and gasps, making sure that everyone who is present that knows Howard, and even some that don't, are well aware of the scene that they're causing. Moving on to the next episode though, 507, where Howard confronts Jimmy in the courthouse hallways right after Jimmy finished defending Lalo and is currently feeling awful about it. So right off the bat, unbeknownst to Howard, he's already starting off on the wrong foot due to catching Jimmy at a bad time. Although Howard has already figured out by this point that it was Jimmy who's been harassing him with bowling balls and prostitutes, he still gives Jimmy one more chance to take the job. After Jimmy avoids answering yet again, Howard finally retracts the job offer. This scene clearly acts as a parallel to the first scene of Howard reminding Jimmy about the job, except this time Howard isn't naively optimistic about holding out hope that Jimmy will accept. And to think, all it took was bowling balls through the roof of his car and 2 prostitutes publicly harassing him. Howard states how it seems like he's upset Jimmy with his job offer, so he's taking it off the table. As Jimmy continues to pretend that he doesn't know what Howard's talking about, he stands there blankly due to not being able to come up with anything off the top of his head, so he simply says that it's getting a little weird. Howard elaborates by stating how it's weird that Jimmy would throw bowling balls onto his car and said prostitutes to his lunch all because he offended Jimmy with a great job opportunity, with Howard now clearly offended that Jimmy has essentially taken his generosity and slapped him across the face with it, all while leading him on the entire time. Side note, it was always hilarious how Howard popping up out of nowhere, constantly asking Jimmy about the job throughout season 5 became such a meme within the fandom.
Just touching base to see if you've had any thoughts on what we talked about.
Oh, the job. Oh.
So, have you thought any more about the job?
However, looking back, Howard only ever asked Jimmy about it twice, with this second time not even being genuine considering how he suspects that it was Jimmy who was messing with him. I suppose it's also the fact that literally every Howard scene this season has to do with him wanting to offer Jimmy the job, with his reminders only being a part of it. Also, in a way, it's not just Howard's innocent annoyingness all season long that turned into a meme, but rather Jimmy's outburst towards him in this scene being such a satisfyingly jaw-dropping conclusion to it, so let's jump right into it. Jimmy still pretends to not have a clue what Howard's going on about, instead calling him unhinged, which is incredibly hypocritical all things considered. Howard has confronted Jimmy on his childish acts, and instead of owning up to it or confronting Howard about how he truly feels, he deflects by pointing his finger back at Howard, continuously antagonizing him and trying to flip the conversation to make Howard seem like he's the person who's in the wrong. All this really starts to go downhill when Howard tries sympathizing with Jimmy, saying how he's sorry Jimmy's in so much pain. This is half true. The whole point of Jimmy's compartmentalization of Chuck's death is to simply not feel any pain and to completely avoid any any emotion towards it altogether. Although Howard doesn't completely understand how Jimmy feels or knows exactly what's going through his head, he gets the gist, as Jimmy has always been fairly transparent even when he thinks he's being clever or sly. Howard can tell that Jimmy was never able to process his grief about Chuck the way that he has, so he feels sorry that Jimmy is still struggling with Chuck's death, even if it's in his own way. Jimmy doesn't want Howard's pity, however, instead turning the tables by flat out accusing Howard of being the one who killed Chuck, once again rubbing salt in the wounds that is Howard's guilt over the matter. Just like in episode 406, Jimmy is solidifying how he pushed all the blame of Chuck's death onto Howard by doubling down and declaring Howard's guilt as a fact. It seems as though by pushing all the blame onto Howard, he wanted Howard to feel all of his guilt-stricken grief and depression for him, so when he sees Howard completely healed and happy, it truly bothers him. Jimmy hates him for it because even though Howard unknowingly took all the blame, he was still able to recover for it, whereas Jimmy hasn't even started. Jimmy continues his defense mechanism by lying about the job offer upsetting him instead of mocking it as if it was nothing more than a joke to him. Jimmy also calls out Howard for living in a bubble, as Jimmy's own life has extended far beyond HHM drama or anything to do with Chuck. Jimmy then goes on a complete ego trip, ranting and raving about how he's on such a higher level than Howard and so much better than him, all while belittling Howard's position. Howard responds in the best way that you could in a situation like this, which is to just walk away, not say another word, and ignore the madman following you while screaming at you in public. Jimmy says one thing, but his actions prove another, with Howard not needing to say another word since Jimmy's actions are proving exactly what he's trying to argue against. Clearly, if Howard's job never upset Jimmy, he wouldn't be screaming at Howard all the way down the hall about it. Howard tried time and time again to open up to Jimmy, to reach out with a helping hand, and to even sympathize with him. But once Jimmy started yelling at Howard for pitying his inability to deal with his grief, Howard had heard enough. Yet again, Howard meant well, but he gets yelled at as a result, just like with Kim in the last season. With Howard and Jimmy clearly not on speaking terms anymore, we don't see him reach out to or approach Jimmy for the rest of the season and practically the rest of the show. That said, we don't see Howard again until the season 5 finale, where Howard bumps into Kim in the elevator at the courthouse. It's kind of tragic how although Howard tries to not reach out to Jimmy and Kim after being yelled at by both of them, due to them all having the same profession, he still bumps into them. Howard politely introduces Kim to his associates, but when Kim drops the bomb that she left Schweikart, gave up Mesa Verde as clients, and quit banking law altogether, Howard follows her out of the elevator to speak to her, as that's quite the mic drop to just say and then walk away from. Howard reaches out to Kim out of concern, as he greatly respects her as a lawyer and can't understand why she'd throw away such a great career. So they go to an empty courtroom to discuss, where Howard first prefaces their conversation by stating how he originally wasn't going to say anything, as he acknowledges that the last time he tried to get something off his chest, it didn't go well. Of course, referencing how Kim screamed at him for telling Jimmy that Chuck took his own life the day of his funeral. Howard incorrectly assumes that Jimmy had something to do with Kim quitting her job, but to be fair, her quitting her successful career so suddenly does scream Jimmy to me, especially after the way Jimmy was purposely tanking his job at Davis and Maine back in season 2. Plus, it also feels like another callback to a moment in season 2 when Kim quit HHM, as Howard also assumed way back then that Kim quitting had something to do with Jimmy, which it did. So in a way, Howard has every reason to assume this is the case again, even though it isn't. So Howard decides to open up about how Jimmy's been harassing him ever since he offered Jimmy that job at HHM. He goes into detail about the job offer, the bowling balls, being accosted by prostitutes, along with how after confronting Jimmy, he all but admitted it, implying how Howard could infer that Jimmy was guilty after his freakout in the hallway. I don't think Howard is ratting out Jimmy's actions to Kim in order to break them up or make Kim hate Jimmy in an effort to turn them against each other. Howard is trying to confide in Kim because he's worried about her and doesn't want her to see Jimmy's potentially negative and dangerous influence cause her to throw away her career. Howard thinks that Kim is completely unaware of the way that Jimmy's acting, and that by telling her the truth, she'll take a step back and reconsider who she affiliates with and second guess doing anything that Jimmy may be influencing her to do. The only reason why he's even reaching out to Kim here is because unlike Jimmy, who's acting like a complete lunatic, Howard still sees Kim as a rational person who will listen to reason. So Howard was expecting to speak to season 1 to 2 Kim, completely unaware of how much she's changed over the past year or so. Howard expects her to take the situation seriously, as that's what any sane person would do if they were informed that their significant other was vindictively harassing some innocent person who was just trying to help them by destroying their car with bowling balls and trying to sabotage their reputation by sending prostitutes to accost them. He thinks that she'll finally realize how unhinged Jimmy truly is and have a moment of clarity, as if she's gonna have some epiphany about Jimmy and sympathize with Howard for Jimmy putting him through what he has. Little does Howard know, she's already well aware of what Jimmy's truly like, and she accepts it, even loves it, especially since it reminds her of her con artist of a mother while growing up. So with Kim now acting just as irrational as Jimmy, Howard is truly the only person who knows what's going on. To paraphrase a behind the scenes clip of this episode I've included in many past videos discussing season 5 and even 6 over the past few years.
The scene between Howard and Kim is really a tough one because Howard's right.
I'm really the only other one who knows what the reality is.
Howard is thrown, and he's surprised, and he's concerned. He thinks he's doing the right thing. He's trying to warn her.
It's one last act of goodness that he can do with this whole sordid episode.
So instead of taking things seriously like Howard expects, she literally just laughs in his face. Instead of sympathizing with Howard, she completely takes Jimmy's side and defends him by pretending to not believe a word that Howard says, as she doesn't want to give weight to what he's saying in order to prevent Jimmy from becoming culpable for his actions when Howard technically doesn't have any proof to press charges or anything like that. In order to deflect Howard's correct accusations about Jimmy, she instead focuses on becoming offended that Howard would suggest that she quit her job because of Jimmy, as if she's incapable of making her own decisions. So even though Howard is correct about Jimmy, he's incorrect about assuming that Kim is making her big career choices because of him. Not only that, but Howard is so caught up in feeling concerned for Kim that he's once again completely oblivious about how his good intentions can be perceived as offensive. Regardless, Howard states how Jimmy needs help, but Kim puts her foot down stating how she knows Jimmy. The scene then ends with the mic drop of a moment of Howard saying,
You know who really knew Jimmy? Chuck.
There's a lot to unpack here, but the gist of it is that even though Howard didn't agree with the extent that Chuck was obsessed over his vendetta against Jimmy, Chuck was still right about Jimmy in general. Now, unlike Chuck, Howard isn't seeking for vengeance by having Jimmy punished or arrested, but is rather just trying to look out for both Jimmy and Kim and help them. Now that both Jimmy and Kim have screamed at him while being unable to listen to reason, Howard is finally done with them. As we'll come to see throughout the final season, Howard doesn't reach out to them anymore or even try to interact with them in any way. It's only when Jimmy and Kim continuously mess with him that they force his hand in the matter, which is what we'll be getting into next. But although Howard's scene with Kim here is his final scene in season 5, there's still a little bit more that I wanted to discuss between Kim and Jimmy in order to set up Howard's entire story during season 6. Later that night, Kim brings up what Howard told her to Jimmy. In my opinion, this scene with Jimmy has a clear parallel to the previous scene with Howard in regard to how both Howard and Jimmy expect Kim to react. Just like Howard, Jimmy expects Kim to respond like how any normal person in their right mind would, which would be to include getting mad at Jimmy for being childish, but instead, Kim approves of it. Kim calls Howard a white knight as she's offended that he thinks that by her associating with Jimmy, she's in a spot where she needs to be saved by him, as if she's incapable of taking care of herself. She also goes on to accuse Howard of being full of himself and that everything has to be about him when she couldn't be more wrong. Sure, Howard is a stiff business prick who on the surface totally seems like the type of guy who would be self-centered and pretentious, but in reality, Howard truly means well with good intentions as he's only tried to help them. Now this could be chalked up to Howard being misunderstood, but I think it's more than that. Kim is ignoring the obvious signs of Howard's genuine concern, instead twisting her interaction with him to villainize him in her eyes in order to make messing with him feel more okay. Anyways, Jimmy and her start getting frisky on the account of the idea of conning and scheming, turning them on, gross, until Kim takes things one step too far and actually becomes serious about messing with Howard. Although Jimmy failed to settle the Sandpiper case in season 3, Kim feels confident that she'll be able to accomplish this and admits to being okay with tearing Howard down in order to do so. Jimmy's surprised by this, as Kim implies that she's more devious than Jimmy ever thought her seemingly pure and innocent heart would be capable of. Since Jimmy and Kim are now married, they'd share Jimmy's payout of the settlement. Kim is starting to go down a dark path, and undermines how serious destroying Howard's life for that Sandpiper money would be, belittling the damage as just one man, as if he doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. So going into season 6, we'll see that Kim is actually the main driving force behind pushing the idea to ruin Howard's career, something that's surprising to Jimmy and completely unbelievable to Howard. Better Call Saul Season 6, which is from May 18th to July 24th, 2004, at least for Howard, as this segment will only be covering up to the end of episode 607, and I think you know why. Now before we jump into the scene-by-scene breakdown, I first wanted to discuss the plot for Season 6 as a whole. The main story in Season 6, during the 2004 timeline, in the first 9 episodes or so at least, consists of Jimmy and Kim setting up and executing various elaborate cons and schemes directed towards Howard in order to tear him down and ruin his reputation, with the goal of forcing HHM and Davis and Maine to settle the Sandpiper case for their own financial gain. As Jimmy and Kim plot out their devious plan, they rely on a secret sticky note board hidden on the back of one of Kim's paintings in her apartment. The reason why I bring this up is because I'd like to actually structure the way I analyze Howard in Season 6 around this con board, as it's essentially a full timeline of the events that transpire. To digress for a moment, I've always wanted to do a full breakdown video of the con board and what each sticky note meant ever since we first saw saw it as season 6 was airing. I figured I'd wait until the story arc was over, with plans to break down the con board in a video during the mid-season break for season 6 back when the show was still airing, but I never got around to it, and even after the show was concluded. So I figure what the heck, might as well combine that video idea into this one since we're about to break down and discuss every Howard scene in season 6 anyways. So with that out of the way, let's finally look at the con board itself, which is organized into columns. The sticky note at the top of each column is an overview of that specific con, while all the sticky notes below it provides details for each step of said con. Looking at the first column, we see a drug baggie, and under it is a golf hole with the word schedules, the time Tuesday 9 along with tour. This is of course referencing Jimmy and Kim's first scheme against Howard during the season 6 premiere, which consists of planting fake drugs in his locker at the country club where he regularly golfs at in order to frame him in front of Cliff. So they go to the clubhouse where Kim watches Howard golfing with Cliff through her binoculars while Jimmy infiltrates the clubhouse to plant the drugs in Howard's locker. The schedules sticky note is for reconnaissance in figuring out when Howard's usual tea times are with Cliff, while Tuesday 9 is the answer to that very question. The tour sticky note is for Jimmy's ruse that he's gonna go into the clubhouse for in order to gain access to the locker room. Meanwhile, Kim notices that Howard and Cliff are returning to the clubhouse early for some reason, as Howard appears to have gotten some sort of call concerning a client or business matter of some sort. Jimmy manages to figure out which locker is Howard's and gets into the locker room to plant the fake drugs, but unfortunately Howard and Cliff are already walking into the locker room before Jimmy can leave, forcing him to masquerade as a fellow club member drying off from a shower. This allows Jimmy to have front row seats for his con as he overhears Cliff and Howard when they discover the planted baggie. Side note, there's some missable dialogue that happens during the scene in the form of small talk banter between Cliff and Howard. During their conversation, Cliff gives Howard a hard time for having so many new hires, implying how Howard is expanding HHM by filling previously empty seats after the downsizing due to Chuck's death as part of his effort to rebuild the firm. After all, he told Jimmy back in season 5 this would be HHM's best year yet, and this small talk banter supports that. Anyways, the conversation comes to a halt when Cliff notices the fake drug baggie fall out of Howard's locker as he opens it. This doesn't instantly cause Cliff to come to the conclusion that Howard's a drug addict, but definitely plants the seed, which I believe is the intention. Howard is so naive when it comes to drugs that he hardly even recognizes it as a drug baggie. However, since Cliff's son has a drug problem, Cliff is more than familiar about what it is. From Cliff's point of view, on one hand, Howard's reaction to it could prove to Cliff that it truly isn't his, as he's not able to fully recognize what it is right off the bat, along with being unaware of where it came from. But on the other hand, it could potentially sound like Howard's just trying to plead ignorance and pretend it's not his, when in reality it could be. Howard questions if the drugs could have came from one of the other members in the clubhouse, with Cliff brushing it off, stating it's possible that it could have also come from one of the employees. The scene ends with Howard pondering where it could have came from, while in the background and out of focus, Cliff looks back up at Howard, most likely pondering the thought of the drugs actually being Howard's after all. Jimmy rushes back to the car with Kim to watch them as they leave. As they spy on Cliff saying goodbye to Howard, they seem completely fine, but as Howard leaves, Cliff does appear to have a certain level of uncertainty as he watches Howard drive off. This leads us to episode 602, along with our second column on the con board. The top sticky note says Kettles on it, as this is the scheme where they con the Kettlemans into going to speak to Cliff about Howard's supposed drug problem. The duped 1040 sticky note is in reference to how the Kettlemans have been committing fraud in their new business endeavors, which they must have had to do some digging in order to figure out. Throughout the episode, Jimmy and Kim debate on whether to deal with the Kettlemans with the carrot or stick approach, which is what the episode's named after. Likewise, the sticky notes also represent that, with the carrot sticky note being fairly straightforward by representing how Jimmy wants to bribe the Kettlemans. The angry face sticky note may imply how Betsy Kettleman may become enraged at being tricked to go besmirch Howard's good name. Finally, the J Stangle represents the stick, as Justin Stangle is the criminal investigator at the IRS who Kim calls in order to blackmail the Kettlemans into keeping their mouths shut. So that's all fine and dandy, but what about the actual impact of the con itself? Well, even though we don't see Howard at all in this episode, we see how the Kettlemans stage further plants the seed of Cliff thinking that Howard may truly have a drug problem. During his meeting with the Kettlemans, he strongly defends Howard, stating how doing drugs is highly unlike him. However, after the Kettlemans leave, Cliff struggles to go back to playing his guitar as he's likely pondering on the possibility of Howard having a drug problem being true. Moving on to the third column on the con board, which consists of episodes 603 and 604. The top sticky note of a high heel represents a prostitute, as this con will consist of them pushing the narrative that Howard is in fact cheating on his wife by sleeping with prostitutes, an elaboration of the childish joke that Jimmy pulled on Howard back in season 5. They're gonna accomplish this by framing Howard for kicking a prostitute out of his car, coincidentally right in front of Cliff and Kim meeting for lunch. The sticky notes with pictures of a car along with Howard's Namaste license plate implies their original plan of completely recreating Howard's vehicle, license plate and all. However, when they ponder on if they'll have enough time to accomplish that or not, they improvise by deciding to instead use Howard's car by briefly stealing it during the con and then returning it without Howard noticing. They accomplish this by having Heel pickpocket Howard's keys off of a valet worker at the same restaurant we've previously seen Howard regular at, then have a key cutter create them replica car keys and even a replica key fob too. The sticky note costume is of course in reference to how Jimmy will be dressing up exactly like Howard. Finally, the first sticky note in the column says weekly appointment 48 minutes, which is in reference to their window of opportunity to steal Howard's car and return it without him noticing, as that's when he goes to his weekly appointment with his therapist. So going into episode 604, let's first discuss what we actually witness of Howard's therapy appointment before jumping into the rest of the con. Howard first makes small talk by mentioning how he just secured a new high-profile client in Santa Fe, again hinting towards Howard rebuilding HHM. Howard then starts discussing his home life and more specifically his marriage with Cheryl. This is the first time in the show we actually hear any acknowledgement of Howard's wife, and from what he says here, it's not going well. He starts off by stating how things are more or less the same and that things haven't gotten any worse, which he feels he should be grateful for in a glass half full kind of way. Howard calls his marriage deadlocked, meaning it's impossible for them to make progress on mending their relationship due to a stalemate. Howard elaborates by admitting how Cheryl won't talk to him about anything important, and since he's unable to open a line of dialogue with her about their problems, he's unable to work through them with her. It's implied that Cheryl isn't trying to make an effort the same way he is, as when asked by his therapist if Howard tried what he recommended, Howard implies that he tried, but she didn't. Cheryl may consider Howard too far gone even to bother trying to mend their relationship, as if their marriage is past the point of no return, essentially just living in limbo, unable to fix the marriage but unwilling to end it. Even though Cheryl may still care about Howard, she's given him the cold shoulder one too many times, which we'll see more soon. Howard pivots the conversation into talking about a recent dream he had, including his father. This is the first time we've heard of Howard's father since season 3, and I believe also the last. Although never stated out loud, it's implied that Howard's father passed away about 18 years ago, so Howard finds importance in the fact that he dreamt about him. Now, as you'd expect from a dream, none of the details make sense, with Howard stating how he was at an airport with his father, but that all the signs are in a language he can't read. This is just supposed to be some cliche therapy filler dialogue meant to transition into Jimmy's scheme, so even though most just gloss over this and easily forget it, I do think it holds more importance than viewers give it credit for. Speaking of Jimmy's scheme though, meanwhile as Howard's speaking to his therapist, Jimmy walks down the alleyway to the parking lot where Howard's car is, dressed up exactly like Howard. Jimmy manages to steal Howard's car and go pick up Wendy in time to be ready for the show in front of Kim meeting Cliff at an outside table. Kim gives Jimmy the signal and he recklessly swerves onto the road, ruthlessly kicks Wendy out of Howard's Jaguar and speeds off. Cliff is in complete disbelief at what he just witnessed, struggling to come to the terms with the fact of how that's most likely Howard. This makes Cliff connect the dots and realize that Howard potentially did actually know those prostitutes from season 5 after all. Also, this goes much more deep than you realize because Howard has a wife, again meaning that he's also cheating on his wife by sleeping with these prostitutes. This makes me believe that it was fully intentional to have Howard discuss his failing marriage with his therapist in the scene directly beforehand in order to plant that seed for the audience to realize that extra layer of subtext. What's ironic to me is that Jimmy and Kim have no idea that Howard's marriage is failing, yet it highly aids the narrative that their schemes are trying to set into motion. Oh, and after some comedic shenanigans, Jimmy does manage to get Howard's Jaguar back in time before Howard notices. So let's move on to episode 605, where Cliff confronts Howard over everything he's been seeing and hearing. While Cliff, Howard, and Aaron attend a meeting with their elderly Sandpiper clients, Cliff can't help but notice how jittery Howard is. As it turns out, Howard is just nervous about Aaron flopping her speech in front of the clients, and sure enough, when that starts to go south, Howard jumps in to save the day and prevent any blowback from the clients for holding out on settling the case. Cliff is still concerned that Howard may be high or potentially suffering from withdrawal, so he takes Howard aside to speak to him back at their vehicles. We jump into their conversation halfway through, but Howard gives some exposition to imply that Cliff just accused Howard of dumping a prostitute out of his car right in front of him. Howard is so dumbfounded by this wildly ridiculous accusation that he doesn't even know how to respond, but when he says that, Cliff takes it a different way, as if he's caught Howard so off guard and completely red-handed that he thinks Howard simply can't come up with a logical excuse on the spot. Since Cliff is well aware of drug addict activity through his son, he most likely associates Howard's fidgety leg as a symptom, along with the drugs potentially explaining why Howard feels so energetic all the time, just like the Kettleman said. Howard is Cliff's close friend, so even though Cliff is being stern with him, he still cares about him and wants to extend a helping hand. Cliff is convinced that it was Howard due to the vehicle being the same Jaguar, even with the same vanity plate. And Cliff is right that it's the same car, but it wasn't Howard. Cliff wants Howard to admit that he has a problem, but he's dealt with his son in a similar fashion so many times that he doesn't expect Howard to admit it, so he just wants Howard to know that he knows the truth. Cliff goes on to state that there's no shame in asking for help, and that Howard has a lot of people in his corner that he could use as a support group if he needs, such as Cliff himself. Since Howard is actually innocent, he has no reason to act guilty. Howard starts summarizing every piece of the puzzle that he's been accused of. It's only when Howard gets to Cliff admitting that it was coincidentally Kim that he was meeting with when he saw Howard supposedly dump a prostitute out of his car that Howard starts connecting the dots, as it causes him to think back to the first time Jimmy hired real prostitutes to accost him. It's in this moment that Howard realizes how everything Cliff has witnessed and heard has all been a part of an elaborate scheme that Jimmy and Kim have set up in order to trick Cliff into thinking that Howard has a problem. Although Howard isn't surprised that Jimmy would be behind something like this, he might have been surprised that Kim is involved too. Upon having the revelation that Jimmy and Kim are behind all of this, Howard scoffs at how obvious it was and instantly goes into retaliation mode. Howard thanks Cliff for coming to him with this information, stating how it must have been hard for him to confront him like this, as Howard understands how Cliff was tricked into believing this false narrative when he otherwise truly means well. Howard is so determined to nip this in the bud that he does the "I don't have time to fully explain things right now, I have to leave quickly to solve this" cliche. Howard does vaguely state how he does have a problem, but not the problem Cliff thinks, explaining how he doesn't have a drug problem, he has a Jimmy McGill problem, leaving Cliff completely confused as Howard cancels all his plans for the rest of the week and drives off in a huff. This leads us to the infamous McGill v. Hamlin boxing match, as Howard has tricked Jimmy into confronting him at a boxing ring that he rented out. Jimmy's so caught up in his work that he doesn't realize how the name of the client that he's going to see is H.O. Ward, aka Howard himself.
Mr. Ward, I presume. As in H.O. Ward. That is really cute, Howard.
Howard starts off by being incredibly straightforward, admitting how he's tired of the petty squabbles between the two of them, so Howard suggests that they should fight it out in the ring. Although Howard is aware that Jimmy is still messing with him, he thinks that they're just pointless yet harmful pranks, just like last season with the bowling balls and prostitutes. When Jimmy messed around with Howard in season 5, there was no end goal, Jimmy was just doing it for his own malicious reasons. Howard figures that this is still just that, completely unaware that Jimmy's scheming with Kim to settle Sandpiper. So when Howard says he's giving Jimmy what he wants, Howard believes that to be true, as he thinks that all Jimmy wants is to hurt him. Howard figures that instead of Jimmy pulling all these elaborate pranks on him to mess with him, he can just get Jimmy to take his hatred out on him in the ring instead, in the hopes that he'll get it out of Jimmy's system so that Jimmy won't feel like messing with him anymore afterwards. Howard admits that he doesn't know if this'll work, but he figures it's worth a shot, calling it a Hail Mary. When Jimmy continues to pretend that he doesn't know what Howard's talking about, Howard puts all cards on the table by calling Jimmy out for every single scheme he's done so far in season 6. Howard then cuts off Jimmy playing naive once again, stating how it's Psych 101 and that Jimmy seemingly wanted to get caught, as all roads lead back to him. This is most likely true, but more on that after the fight. After some reluctance, Jimmy lets his ego get the best of him and he accepts. Howard's definitely more practiced than Jimmy is, and Jimmy's too busy not even taking the fight seriously by showboating to a pretend audience. Jimmy takes 1 or 2 good hits and still gets back up, but after one final Hamlin uppercut, Jimmy goes down for the count. As Howard stands over Jimmy laying there in pain, he states how Jimmy has mistaken his kindness for weakness, and that he hopes that their fight set things straight. I do love Howard's straightforward yet honest approach to confronting Jimmy here. He wants to drop the act and be straightforward with how Jimmy's been harassing him. Before Howard leaves, he tells Jimmy that he hopes that this will end everything, but honestly admits that it probably won't. After Howard leaves, he goes to speak to an unknown man waiting in a car outside, who's revealed to be a private investigator that Howard is hiring to follow Jimmy around. Howard's hope to settle things in the ring was just a front the whole time, as Howard was scheming a tad himself. Howard's true goal wasn't to fight Jimmy in the hopes that he'd get it all out of his system, but it was to cause Jimmy to admit that he's behind the harassment in the first place. By getting Jimmy to fight him, he technically got Jimmy to admit through the implication of accepting the fight that he's behind everything, even though Jimmy never came right out and said it. Jimmy knew what Howard was talking about and acknowledged it, which was enough for Howard to know for a fact that Jimmy is the culprit. Howard was already intending on hiring a PI to follow around Jimmy, but he wanted to make sure Jimmy was at fault before doing so. Howard thinks that he's going to be 1 step ahead of Jimmy from now on thanks to the PI, but in reality, the exact opposite is going to be the case. In order to explain what I mean by this, we must now focus on the next column of sticky notes on the con board, which is represented with a magnifying glass, of course being the PI. Now real quick, I must first briefly mention part of the scene of Jimmy going back home to Kim after the fight, as it heavily implies why Jimmy even accepted Howard's boxing match in the first place. As Jimmy and Kim lie in bed, Jimmy wonders why he even outed himself to Howard by accepting the boxing match, and Kim tells him because he knows what's next. To explain what Kim means here, we must also circle back to how Howard told Jimmy that it seemed like Jimmy wanted to get caught, as all roads led back to him. Jimmy and Kim must have figured that Howard would have caught on to them eventually, and that he would want to confront Jimmy about it. Therefore, Jimmy is okay with taking Howard's bait and implying that he was behind the harassment, because they already predicted that Howard would hire a PI to follow them. Due to this, they hired a con man to pretend to be Howard's PI, so while Howard thinks that he's 1 step ahead of them by hiring a PI to follow Jimmy, Jimmy and Kim are actually 1 step ahead of Howard, as the PI is secretly a con man working for them, acting as a double agent of sorts, which is where the casting sticky note comes into play, as Jimmy and Kim most likely likely held casting interviews for different various con men in order to figure out the perfect one that they wanted to hire for the job. This allows Jimmy and Kim to not only learn of anything that Howard is planning, but also feed Howard false information and fake evidence in order to manipulate and trick him even further. HHM has a specific detective agency on speed dial, so they knew Howard was just gonna hire a PI through them. So they called Howard's secretary pretending to be the detective agency, informing the secretary that they changed their number, when in reality, they were just giving her their con man's number. So when Howard calls what he thought was the detective agency to hire a PI, he was actually calling Jimmy and Kim's con man to hire him instead. I believe this is where the phone call sticky note comes into play, being when they called Howard's secretary to give them the con man's phone number. The last sticky note in this column is kind of difficult to read because it looks like they wrote with pink marker on a pink sticky note, but it says report. Now this is most likely just Jimmy and Kim wanting their fake PI to report back to them with any info about what Howard might be doing. This moves us on to the next column of the con board, which is represented by the scales of justice, as this begins their planning for the ultimate finale that is the mediation con during D-Day. As an aside, while the first half of the con board has had distinct and separate schemes for each column, the entire second half of the con board is all leading up to the mediation meeting that happens in episode 607. Jimmy and Kim hope to manipulate Howard into making such a fool of himself during this meeting that HHM and Davis and Maine will have no choice but to settle the case, resulting in Jimmy and Kim getting paid Jimmy's share of the common fund and becoming millionaires. So in episode 605, while Jimmy's confronting Howard, Kim's already working on the next stage of their scheme, which is outlined in the next sticky note column. Under the scales of justice, we see a sticky note with a drawing of a violin on it, which is code for Kim speaking to her former co-worker Viola from Schweikart in order to get information about who the mediator will be. Kim learns that the mediator is an old retired judge by the name Rand Casimiro, and so during the same scene back at her apartment with Jimmy after his fight with Howard, she shows Jimmy a photo of the mediator as they plan to create a body double of him. But first, there's one more sticky note of this column being SF or ABQ, obviously standing for Santa Fe or Albuquerque. I'm not completely sure what this sticky note stands for, but I have two guesses. The first is that they may be trying to figure out which city the mediation meeting will take place in, but also may stand for the fact that Kim has a huge ultimatum to make in regard to whether she's going to be in Albuquerque for D-Day, or if she's going to go to Santa Fe to try and get funding for her dream job pro bono office that she wants to open up. That said, moving on to episode 606, before we move on to the next column involving the Rand Casimiro body double, we must first discuss Cheryl's very first scene. She was mentioned in 604 during Howard's therapy appointment, but this is the first time we actually get to see her on screen. The episode starts out with a montage of Howard's morning routine, which starts out looking rather extravagant. That is until you realize that he's actually waking up in his guest house, the same guest house that we saw him look out over the balcony on during the season 5 bowling ball incident. As he walks into his actual house, we see him using his espresso machine to make a cappuccino with foam art in the shape of a peace sign, which lines up perfectly with his namaste lifestyle. However, as Cheryl enters the scene, it's revealed that Howard actually made the cappuccino for her, whereas he's just making himself tea. They make small talk about how they slept, again implying how they're sleeping in different beds, as Cheryl brings up how Howard was apparently going to get a new mattress for the guest house, but he tells Cheryl that it's fine after all, not wanting to cause a bother. As Howard gives Cheryl her morning cappuccino, he pauses to notice that instead of taking a sip out of it, she walks away past him to grab a coffee mug, where she then proceeds to dump the cappuccino into, completely ruining the foam art that Howard put the time into making for her. This shows us what was implied episodes earlier during Howard's therapy session in regard to them being deadlocked, along with the fact that even though Howard is making an effort to communicate and show kindness, Cheryl is not. Howard's marriage is the perfect cliche example of a slowly failing marriage where each person is naturally just drifting apart, but since we're introduced to Howard's marriage in such a state of disarray, I find it extremely interesting to analyze exactly what resulted in their marriage ending up this way and how all the previous events of the show may have played a role in it without us even being aware of it. This seemingly little and insignificant cappuccino is actually the origin of the theory that Cheryl has grown apart from Howard due to being sick of his new namaste lifestyle, as she totally disregards it entirely. Plus, the way that the cappuccino has the peace sign on it implies that Howard may be trying to push his new lifestyle onto her, something that she clearly isn't reciprocating considering how she ignores it and moves on with her day. She's seemingly become jaded towards Howard and his new lifestyle, which as I said earlier, she doesn't care for, but knows that it's wrong to hate on, as it's what got Howard to recover from his depression and shed a new light of positivity into his life. She doesn't want to stomp on his parade, but she doesn't seem to appreciate the parade either, something which Howard seems completely oblivious to, as he's just naively trying to make an effort without realizing what's even the problem. Throughout creating this video, that seems to be the trend for Howard's character in the final 3 seasons of the show, huh? He means well, all while being completely oblivious about how his good intended gestures end up being unintentionally offensive, or at least annoying and unwanted. They then bring up plans about an upcoming yearly fundraiser that they're a part of, and when Cheryl asks how Howard wants to handle it, he gives her 3 options. She could go, he could go, or they could both go. The way he says it makes it seem like Cheryl would rather have one of them go alone, whereas he seems to be holding out hope that she'll choose the 3rd option and have them both go as a couple. This is clearly yet another way to show that they've drifted apart, as Cheryl responds by stating that she'll just go by herself. As Howard turns around, he says how it's probably for the best, but with his back turned to her, he lets out an upset facial expression, as her not wanting to go with him is yet another hit to the emotional bank account. Howard's facial expression may also be due to nervousness over what he's about to bring up next, which is Jimmy. Apparently, Howard's already told Cheryl about how Jimmy was messing with him during the events of season 5, but that after confronting him and getting screamed at, Howard must have told Cheryl that it was all over. Well, surprise, surprise, it's not over, so Howard is bringing it up again in order to warn Cheryl and give her a heads up in case she sees or hears anything strange happening in the near future. The way Howard says this, it's as if he's trying to reassure her that he'll prevent Jimmy's harassment from getting worse in fear of what will happen if it doesn't. Considering the way they're discussing it, makes it seem like Jimmy's harassment has also damaged their marriage, which makes me wonder how much she truly even trusts Howard. Now, don't get me wrong, their marriage isn't just falling apart from this single issue, but rather an amalgamation of many issues all coming to a head. As Cheryl goes to leave Howard in their big empty house alone, she mentions how she's having dinner with a different married couple alone later, to which Howard says to have her tell them that he says hello as he won't be attending himself. Again, multiple examples in this scene showing how Cheryl would rather go socialize with her friends and acquaintances alone instead of bringing Howard along with her as a couple. Let's now jump to the next sticky note column on the con board, which is labeled with a camera, as it consists of Jimmy and Kim taking fake photos of evidence for the PI to give Howard in order to manipulate him. The PI shows Howard about a week's worth of images from following around Jimmy, as all these photos are either set up with Jimmy giving the fake PI a narrative to tell Howard, or maybe even he told the con man to do usual PI work by following him around in order to make it all appear real to Howard. I'd like to highlight the $sign sticky note, as it represents the staged photos taken of Jimmy seemingly withdrawing a package of cash up to $20,000. The rest of the sticky notes under the column have to do with the Rand Casimiro body double that they plan to create in order to provide more staged photos as false evidence to trick Howard, this time involving Jimmy bribing the mediator with the supposed $20,000 of cash. The first sticky note is about the double itself, while the others focus on the facial features in order to make it more believable, such as a note stating makeup or face putty in order to reconstruct the actor to look more like the original. However, as shown by the scene when Kim showed Jimmy a photo of the mediator, his huge mustache allows them to not have to worry as much about facial features as long as they get the mustache down. So as the sticky note with the drawing of a mustache would imply, Jimmy goes all out with a huge board of mustaches to choose from in order to pick out the one with the most likeness to the original. Put a pin in the body double for now though, as we're currently moving on to the next column of sticky notes, this time focusing around drugging Howard without his knowledge in order to make it seem like he's high on drugs during the mediation meeting, which is represented by a drawing of an eye. This column and the previous column actually take place at the same time because they're feeding Howard's fake photos through their fake PI, along with preparing the body double while they're also taking a trip to Caldera in order to get drugs off of him that they plan to slip to Howard. All the sticky notes in this column actually consist of information about the drug that they get from Caldera, such as how fast it'll make Howard's heart beat, how it'll make him feel like he's hopped up on caffeine as if he just had 2 Red Bulls on an empty stomach, along with how long the drug effects will last before they wear off, being 25 minutes, which they discovered by having Jimmy act as their guinea pig during a test run at Caldera's. So moving on to the second to last sticky note column, which also occurs in the same episode as the previous 2, which shows their final preparations before the big day of the mediation meeting, represented by the top sticky note saying T1 as it's the day before D-Day. The first sticky note is a drawing of his cell phone, which represents Jimmy coercing Francesca to call HHM, pretending to be a family member of one of their Sandpiper Elder clients in order to get the information needed to listen in on the mediation meeting live as it's happening. So the next sticky note below the cell phone saying 7 plus PC 842159 is the dial instructions that Francesca got Jimmy. The next sticky note simply saying HHM is supposed to represent how the HHM conference room that we've seen time and time again throughout the show is actually where the mediation meeting will take place, with Jimmy and Kim having a romantic picnic on the lawn of HHM the night before in perfect view of the conference room. Then the final sticky note says delivery, as they're still trying to figure out exactly how to slip the drugs to Howard right before the meeting so his pupils will dilate during it. Since the drug can absorb through the skin, they plan on lacing some PI photos with the drug to have their fake PI con man give the laced photos to Howard right before the meeting. With all their planning ready to go, let's move on to episode 607, along with the final column, which is simply represented by the title D-Day, followed by a sticky note of an explosion, as it stands for the day of the mediation meeting taking place, where all their schemes and planning will come to a head. Jimmy coincidentally crossed paths with the real mediator the morning of as Jimmy goes to a liquor store. He notices the real Rand Casimiro at the front of the line, shockingly with his arm in a cast. This causes Jimmy to run back to his car car and call Kim freaking out over what he just saw, as it means that the body double photos that they had taken off screen won't work anymore, as the photos are staged to have been taken that very morning. So Kim completely cancels her original plan to go to Santa Fe, instead throwing that opportunity away so she can U-turn down a literal bad choice road and help Jimmy retake their body double photos. To make a long story short, Jimmy and Kim frantically get their body double and camera crew together to retake the staged photos of Jimmy handing their body double a bribe, and then they lace the photos with the drug as soon as they're developed in order to hand them off to Howard's PI, with this of course being the big reveal moment that Howard's PI was actually a con man working for them the whole time. Meanwhile, Howard is at HHM preparing for the meeting. Some assistant comes in and totally fumbles a bunch of soda. Howard shows this assistant a trick to settle the carbonation in the cans so they don't explode when someone opens it, ironically and unknowingly foreshadowing Jimmy and Kim's scheme by stating how they don't want to give their clients an unwelcome surprise. Howard then admits how he learned this trick from Chuck, who would always do so out of habit whenever he was about to open any can. Since the assistant is one of Howard's new hires that was referenced in episode 601, he's so new to HHM that he doesn't even know who Chuck McGill is, which is slightly depressing when considering Chuck's legacy, especially since it may foreshadow Howard's own legacy as well. Howard states how Chuck was the greatest legal mind he ever knew, but when the assistant says how he hopes that someone says the same about him one day, Howard begrudgingly states how maybe some things are more important, calling back to what he had once said to Chuck near the end of season 3. Howard's secretary then walks in to let Howard know that even though he has a meeting about to take place, his PI is there with some new information. So Howard meets with his PI in his office where he's given the secretly laced photos of Jimmy bribing someone just that morning. Howard notices that the photos are wet, but the PI just plays it off by stating they're quote, fresh out of the batch. So Howard is now convinced that Jimmy was bribing someone that morning, but doesn't recognize who the man with the mustache is, yet as the mediator is someone that Cliff picked out, so he doesn't know what he looks like. With Howard none the wiser, he then goes to meet Cliff with Irene to give exposition about what the mediation meeting even is, in an effort to reassure Irene by walking her through what's gonna happen, which now that I think about it is an ironic choice of wording considering what he's about to suggest. In order to seem more sympathetic, Howard insists that Irene should be wheeled into the meeting in a wheelchair even though she can walk. Putting an elder in a wheelchair who doesn't need it to garner sympathy sounds like something Jimmy would do. This little detail just goes to show that it's not beneath Howard to stoop to doing something like this if it sways public appearance in their favor. Also, during Howard's exposition explaining the mediation, he mitigates her expectations about the case being settled, as he admits that both he and Cliff plan on holding out for at least another year or two before settling in order to squeeze every drop that they can. Both of these moments are examples showing that although Howard and Cliff mean well and care about their clients, they're also working in their own best interests. Right as they go to leave the conference room, Howard starts to feel the effects of the drug as he starts rubbing his fingers together along with feeling warmer than he should. During his long walk to the mediation, he continues to try and shake this odd feeling that he's having, as he's completely unaware of the drugs his PI just slipped him moments ago. Once in the room, Howard, Cliff, and Irene greet Rich and his associates from Schweikart, the representatives from Sandpiper, along with Aaron Brill, who's all there waiting for him. With Aaron controlling the live call, all the clients of the Sandpiper case are able to listen in to the meeting about to unfold, including Jimmy and Kim. When the real Rand Casimiro walks in as the mediator, suddenly Howard connects the dots and realizes that it was the mediator that his PI photographed Jimmy bribing. Since Howard didn't know what the mediator looked like before the meeting, he wasn't able to prepare for the revelation that Jimmy may have bribed him. If he would have known beforehand, he could have postponed the whole meeting in advance, but since he's only now realizing as the meeting has started, he's caught incredibly off guard. Howard now has to sit there listening to the mediator go on and on about being impartial to the whole case while making equal compromises on both sides in order to execute an unbiased solution, while Howard believes for a fact that the mediator was actually bribed that very same morning to do the exact opposite. Due to the combination of being in total shock from being caught off guard along with the drugs kicking in, Howard interrupts the mediation before it's even begun, as he's so taken aback that he states that he doesn't think they can proceed. Howard could have just stood up and ended the meeting, as he would have saved himself a life's worth of embarrassment and tragedy, but hindsight's 20/20. Unfortunately, Howard is not in his current right state of mind, so when Rich insists on Howard be more specific as to why, Howard gets a little hot-headed due to his frustration over the mediator using words like compromise when he himself is apparently compromised. I'd like to believe that in his right state of mind, Howard would have had the restraint to bite his lip, take Cliff aside and handle things professionally and discreetly, but of course then there'd be no conflict and there'd be no show. So since Howard is unknowingly hopped up on drugs, combined with the heat of the moment and shocked revelation that he believes to have just uncovered, he openly accuses the mediator of being corrupt in front of all parties. Howard confirms his suspicions by asking the mediator what car he drives, as it's the same car that the PI told him about. When Howard accuses accuses the mediator of being in the park that morning, the mediator gives an honest account of his morning where he arrived at Albuquerque early and wasn't in any park, which we know to be true as his alibi includes him going to a liquor store, which is where Jimmy saw him with his arm in a cast. He continues explaining his accusation in regard to how around 7 a.m. that morning, the mediator was supposedly seen accepting a $20,000 cash bribe from Jimmy McGill at a park, which raises some red flags from everyone else in the room who knows Jimmy personally, yet are incredibly confused as Howard is suddenly bringing him up out of the blue. Since Howard thinks that the mediator is playing hardball, he orders his secretary to go to his office and grab the envelope with the photos that the PI gave him showing the mediator accepting Jimmy's bribe. Cliff tries taking Howard aside to consult him, but Howard ignores Cliff's request as the mediator starts questioning the supposed photos in Howard's possession. Howard explains how the photos show exactly what he's describing and that he has them because he hired a PI to follow Jimmy. Rich calls out the ridiculousness of Howard's claim, as it was Cliff and Howard's side who suggested to use Rand Casimiro as the mediator in the first place. So this sets up the classic situation where one character, Howard, is trying to convince everyone else of something that he believes to be true, but when he finally has the proof to convince everyone, suddenly it's not there anymore. This happens in the form of the PI photos being switched behind Howard's back so that when he opens the envelope to look at them in front of everyone, instead of the photo he saw earlier of Jimmy handing the mediator a package of cash, it's Jimmy handing a frisbee to some random guy. Now, as a side note, this is of course all a part of the plan, with Jimmy and Kim planning for their fake PI con man to swap the photos in Howard's office after he left to go to the mediation, so that when he fetched them to show everyone, he'd look crazy. With Howard in disbelief of what he's seeing, he snaps at his secretary to go check his office again for the correct photos, along sounding like a madman by rambling on about how Jimmy somehow switched the photos, which is a clear parallel to Chuck fixating on Jimmy switching the numbers. The Chuck parallels only begin here though, as when Howard looks around the room stating how those are not the pictures he saw, Aaron asks him if he's okay, as his pupils are extremely dilated as if he's currently under the influence of something. This causes Howard to yell out, "I am fine," in a similar manner to when Chuck yelled out, "I am not crazy," at Jimmy's bar hearing back in season 3. Cliff again suggests to take Howard aside, this time with Howard going along with it, if only so he can try and prove that he's not crazy, as he leaves stating that the evidence has been tampered with. Out in the hallway, Cliff becomes incredibly angry at Howard for blowing the whole thing, while Howard is fixated on Jimmy, similar to how Chuck used to act, instead insisting to Cliff that this is all related to what he mentioned episodes ago about Jimmy trying to ruin him. Cliff insists that Howard backpedals by going in and apologizing to everyone to try and mitigate the damages that he just caused, but Howard isn't even listening as he's instead focused on calling his PI in order to try and get the original negatives of the evidence, and when the call doesn't go through, he rushes up to his office to figure out what the heck is going on. Before Cliff can follow him, he turns around to see the mediator walking out as he's incredibly offended by Howard's accusations. With the mediator gone, the meeting is over, and after Howard's huge scene that he made, HHM and Davis and Maine are now at the mercy of Schweikart, as Rich now has all the leverage that he needs. He walks up to Cliff stating that they're going to go back to their previous offer, and that they're also docking $1 million every day HHM and Davis and Maine don't settle, really putting the pressure on them to do so before they have a chance to even collect themselves, let alone get back on their feet and fight back. So Cliff goes up to Howard's office to tell him the bad news, but Howard then opens the door and openly states that he's not crazy, again parallel to Chuck, and that he's not on drugs as his pupils are already returning to normal, meaning that the effects of whatever he was laced with is already wearing off, which makes sense as we know from the sticky note the drugs only last around 25 minutes. Cliff wonders how Jimmy could have drugged him, to which Howard explains how the photos that the PI gave him were covered in a mysterious substance, along with now realizing that his so-called PI must have been in on it, and that he swapped the photos after showing Howard the false evidence. Howard explains how he's realized how Jimmy and Kim got him to unknowingly hire a con man as his PI, so Howard has now realized exactly how he was tricked, along with how Jimmy was able to accomplish it, but it's too little too late. Jimmy and Kim's plan always intended on Howard eventually figuring out that he was being manipulated, but only after the damage has already been done. Howard is able to perfectly explain everything. While Cliff tries telling Howard how Rich is bringing down the hammer and forcing them to settle, Howard is still fixated on how he was tricked, thinking that if he can just prove he was correct, everything will be fixed. Even though Cliff may be starting to believe him, there's no way they'd ever be able to convince anyone of the truth, and Cliff knows that. So when Howard stubbornly denies settling due to not wanting Jimmy to win, Cliff puts his foot down, stating how he'll then be forced to go to their partners and explain everything he's seen from his point of view, which will look incredibly bad for Howard. Cliff is Howard's friend, but he's still on the fence about the whole Jimmy thing. Even if Cliff wants to believe Howard, he'll still be forced to throw Howard under the bus if he needs to in order to prevent losing out on even more money from the settlement, as there's no way Howard will be able to convince everyone that it was all Jimmy McGill. Ironically, Howard being fixated on not wanting Jimmy to win feels like a parallel to the very first episode back when Howard originally told Jimmy that he was too fixated on the idea of winning against him instead of thinking of what's right. So in other words, here in season 6, Howard really should have taken his own advice from years prior. Even if Howard is right, Rich is forcing their hand to the point that all they can do is cut their losses, and Howard has to accept that he's already lost. So the scene ends with Jimmy and Kim untastefully getting it on as Cliff gets on the call to tell all clients listening in that they will in fact be settling the case, as they've come to an agreement. Of course, meaning that Jimmy and Kim's season-long scheme has finally worked and is now paying off. But at what cost? Well, in order to figure that out, we must reluctantly move on to Howard's final scene, which takes place later that night when he goes over to Kim's apartment to confront both Jimmy and Kim over what they've done to him. When Jimmy and Kim hear a knock on their door, they already assume it's Howard, so Jimmy goes to answer to get it over with. As Howard enters, he's somewhat unhinged due to the fact that he's most likely already been drinking, even though he's trying to keep things together. Now, instead of coming over to their place to scream in their faces about what they've done, he offers them a passive-aggressive gift in celebration of tearing him to the ground. Which brings us to the third and final time Howard honors his old tradition with Chuck, where they would crack open a bottle of Macallan to celebrate a victory. As Howard offers them the bottle for their victory, stating that they've won, Jimmy and Kim continue to pretend that they don't know what Howard's talking about as to not implicate themselves. Howard even says how he understands how they have to play things this way, again passive-aggressively complimenting how good at it they are. When Kim pretends to naively ask Howard what this is all about, Howard returns the question right back at her, as he's curious why they'd go through so much trouble just to burn him to the ground. He then starts listing off every single reason why both Jimmy and Kim could individually hate him, such as not hiring Jimmy at HHM multiple times, taking Chuck's side too often, sticking Kim in doc review one too many times, etc. As a side note, I'd be remiss to not acknowledge how I've already done a handful of videos from back when season 6 was still airing, specifically discussing this scene. I also have that In Defense of Howard video from like a year ago, where I believe I broke down every single example that Howard lists off here as to why Jimmy and Kim may hate him, along with a handful of reasons that he doesn't mention as well. So instead of dwelling on the specifics, it can all be dumbed down to Howard being one of the most misunderstood characters of the entire Breaking Bad universe. Howard's stiff corporate personality sometimes puts him in a negative light that he doesn't deserve. Even if Howard isn't perfect, no one in the Breaking Bad universe is. Howard has his good days as well as his bad days, and it's very possible to get the wrong impression of him simply by catching him in a bad mood, just like most regular people. Howard also seems cursed in a way where every time he tries to help someone, he always comes across as unintentionally offensive and or annoying, causing the people that he's trying to help to become reluctant to accept it. Even though Jimmy and Kim dislike Howard, he's never done anything bad enough to them to deserve what they've put him through. Even on the occasion when Howard was being mean, they still gave him a way harder time than they ever should have over what he's done. Now, regardless of how much time I've spent dissecting exactly why Jimmy and Kim may hate Howard, truth be told, even though it's an interesting conversation, it doesn't really matter anymore. Jimmy and Kim didn't burn Howard to the ground due to having some sort of vendetta against him, quite the opposite actually. It's not even that they hate him, it's just that they dislike him enough to not care about the misfortune that they may bring him, as burning Howard to the ground was never their end goal, it was just a means to an end. They were only ruining Howard as a means to force Sandpiper to settle, which is even more insulting when you think about it, as it shows how little they care about him in any way, shape, or form, considering he was just a pawn for them to reach their true goal. Jimmy and Kim are just legitimately bad people, and they came to terms with that and made the conscious decision to do so during the season 5 finale, when Kim admitted that she'd be okay with ruining Howard and still being able to sleep at night without it bothering her. Howard states how this wasn't just some pointless harassment, but a calculated long con with a premeditated end goal which took weeks, even months, to set up and accomplish. So while Howard is trying to figure out what mental gymnastics they had to force themselves through in order to justify what they've done to him, when he brings up how they burnt him to the ground, Jimmy finally drops the act and acknowledges what Howard's saying, even if only to belittle Howard's situation by stating how he'll bounce back. Howard agrees with Jimmy, stating that he'll land on his feet, as looking at the situation from a glass half full perspective, HHM's settlement share will be substantial, and even though he made a total fool of himself, it wasn't career-ending. As Howard states that he's worked his way through worse, he then lists off all the prime examples, such as debt, depression, and his marriage falling apart, with this being the moment where he admits that he's been sleeping in his own guest house for the better part of a year. Jimmy indirectly caused Howard's debt, depression, and failing marriage. Really, Chuck's death is the catalyst for the three main dilemmas that Howard lists off that he had to bounce back from, so technically, Jimmy could be considered indirectly responsible for it all, as it's technically Jimmy's fault that Chuck wound up taking his own life. I get that I shouldn't just generalize the blame from everything in the aftermath of Chuck's death on Jimmy, but in my opinion, it's still a valid argument when you get into the specifics. Plus, Jimmy technically causing Chuck's death isn't the only reason why it's all his fault, since in each instance, Jimmy played a direct role as well, whether he knew it or not. For Howard's depression, it wasn't just Chuck's death, but also Jimmy pushing the blame onto Howard, which caused Howard's depression become a lot more severe than it otherwise would have been, which also put a strain on his marriage. Speaking of which, it wasn't just the depression from Chuck's death that put a strain on his marriage, or even the resulting namaste lifestyle, but also Jimmy constantly harassing Howard ever since season 5. This is also the first time that Jimmy and Kim even became aware that Howard's marriage was failing, something that they unintentionally had a part of, to the point that I'd even say that Jimmy was the driving force behind it too, even if it was an unintentional domino effect as well. So even though Howard believes he'll be okay, he can't say the same for Jimmy and Kim, as he sees them as soulless monsters. Howard elaborates by stating how Jimmy can't help himself, as if he has this pathological urge to con and take shortcuts that he simply can't control. Howard even mentions how Chuck already knew this. Howard always knew that even though Chuck's vendetta was a detriment to his own mental health along with HHM as a whole, Chuck was still correct about Jimmy at the end of the day. Howard is however completely surprised that Kim would choose to follow in Jimmy's footsteps. In Howard's eyes, Kim had so much potential that she chose to throw away to instead walk down this bad choice road. He had mentored Kim, paid her way through law school, and believed her to be one of the brightest and most promising lawyers that he had ever met. Now when Howard starts implying that he's disappointed at her for choosing this sort of life, Jimmy starts suggesting that Howard should leave. Howard stands his ground by stating that he's far from done, but even Kim chimes in stating that he should leave as well. Side note, if Howard would have taken their advice here and left in this very moment instead of staying longer, he may have lived to see another day, but of course hindsight is 20/20. As Howard analyzes the fact that Jimmy and Kim truly enjoy conning, he realizes that they didn't do all of this because they hate him or even because they want that precious settlement money, but they did it simply because they love the thrill of the con and even get off to it, with it being the core pillar of their relationship, well, marriage actually. It's always been this unspoken thing we've witnessed, so it's incredibly satisfying to have Howard finally call them out for it. Howard is so completely flabbergasted at how truly evil Jimmy and Kim have become as a duo that he vows to dedicate his life to make sure everyone knows the truth about them, which, sounds a lot like Chuck, along with what resulted in his eventual downfall. As Howard elaborates by stating how Jimmy and Kim can't hide who they truly are forever, he gets randomly interrupted by some stranger letting themselves into Kim's apartment. As Howard proves that he's completely oblivious to context clues, he innocently asks this man who he is, to which the man just politely states that he's there to speak to his lawyers. Howard, still not connecting the dots as to how potentially dangerous this stranger is, instead starts trash talking Jimmy and Kim to their supposed client by condescendingly telling him to find better lawyers. It's only after Kim's nervous stutter begging Howard to leave for the 100th time as if his life is in danger that he finally starts to clue in. So finally, Howard concerningly asks what this is all about and gets his question vaguely answered in the form of the stranger pulling out a pistol to attach a silencer to it. This totally catches Howard off guard, and I can only imagine how his mind must have been racing a million miles a second as he tries to grasp what kind of dark criminal activities Jimmy and Kim are involved with to have what appears to be a cartel member suddenly threatening them with a gun. Howard may be thinking glass half full and hopes that the pistol is just an intimidation tactic, so he figures that he might be able to talk his way out of this, but before he can even complete one more sentence to try and get the stranger to listen to reason, lights out.
What the hell just happened?
I mean, what else is there to say at this point? Let's just have a moment of silence for poor old Howie. This is it, by the way. This is what Howard sees now, thanks to Kim and Jimmy. Great work, guys. I know I just implied there isn't much else to say, but I lied. There's actually a lot more to discuss. Lucky us. So before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's rewind back to Howard's final thoughts. He was most likely in hopes that maybe the pistol was just a scare tactic and that he could use his words to talk himself out of it, but unbeknown to him, Lalo had already done exactly that during episode 509 last season, with this now being the return visit where everything comes to a head. No pun intended. In retrospect, wow, I probably could have worded that better. We as viewers, of course, know right alongside Jimmy and Kim in regard to how dangerous Lalo is, so even though we all could have guessed that having Lalo and Howard in the same room together would likely result in Howard's untimely demise, I still wanted to walk us through Howard's final moments from his perspective, as he had absolutely no clue who Lalo was, with Lalo, along with his own death, coming completely out of the blue before he could even realize what was going on. Honestly, Howard being completely unable to read the room, such as body language, context clues, etc., is completely realistic for his character, as it reminds me of him being completely oblivious about how his kind gestures can actually come across as annoying and offensive. For such a charismatic character, Howard sure is naive when it comes to nonverbal communication. Likewise, even though we've known Howard for years and care a great deal about him, in Lalo's eyes, he's nothing more than a bug that needs to be squashed. Since Howard saw him, he was a loose end that needed to be snuffed out. So Lalo technically killed two birds with one stone, as he got rid of a witness, which also traumatized Jimmy and Kim so much that it was essentially the most effective intimidation tactic that he could have asked for, and I thought Jimmy and Kim were awful for using Howard as a pawn. Howard's death at the hands of Lalo is widely considered to be the most tragic yet shocking main character death of not only the entire show, but the entire Breaking Bad universe as a whole. Howard is the epitome of the lawyer side of the show. While the cartel side of the show usually involved life and death stakes, the lawyer side of the show is the complete opposite, instead focusing on character dynamics, relationships, career, and professions. So in a way, Howard dying at the hands of Lalo is honestly the most perfect way for both sides of the show to collide in the most unlikely way possible. Granted, during my season 6 death prediction video before the final season aired, I did predict Howard would die, but I predicted he'd take his own life, so half points, I guess? So, huge question for you all, as this is something that gets debated time and time again within the fandom. Who truly killed Howard?
Although Lalo did kill Howard, it is popular opinion to believe that Jimmy and Kim are the ones that are truly at fault for Howard's death.
Jimmy and Kim are responsible for resulting in all pieces being put into place that resulted in Howard's death. If Jimmy and Kim would have never messed with Howard, he would have never been there when Lalo showed up. Likewise, if they never worked with Lalo, something that Jimmy accepted on his own but was later motivated to continue doing so by Kim, Lalo would have obviously never showed up to put a bullet in Howard's head. Now, the real nail in the coffin for this debate is that it was the show creators' intentions for Jimmy and Kim to be at fault for Howard's death. Writer and director for episode 607, Tom Schnoz, has went on record multiple times in the Insider podcast, episode commentary, along with various audio, video, and article interviews stating how this was his intention along with the intention of the entire writing team. Personally, I'm just going with what I believe to be true, and since the show creators back up this point of view, I'm gonna stick with it. With Howard's final scene out of the way, including his death, why it happened, and what the purpose of it was, let's go ahead and move on to the final true segment of the retrospective, which is of course Howard's legacy. I'll of course be discussing this chronologically as well, so what better place to start than to discuss what happens to his body. At first, nothing happens to it, with it just laying there until the following morning when Mike and his men finally take it away. There's two main factors in Mike's cleanup here: where to dump Howard's body and then make a believable cover-up story. Let's start with the former. In an ironic, sick twist of fate, since Lalo wound up dead in the same night that he killed Howard, Mike knocks two birds out with one stone by burying their bodies together. Kinda harsh to bury Howard with his murderer. Also, not only did Mike bury Lalo with Howard, but the location that he chose was under the floor of Gus's would-be super lab, meaning that throughout Breaking Bad, both Lalo and Howard were always closer to us than we thought. Now when Mike buries them, it does seem like Mike makes an effort to be more careful with Howard's body than Lalo's. The way Mike also looks at Howard before burying him seems like Mike felt bad for Howard's death, as Mike has a soft spot for people not in the game being hurt or killed due to affiliation with people who are. Mike also grabbed Howard's personal belongings off his body before burying him, which initially may have seemed like a sign of respect, but it's because he needed those items in order to execute his cover-up plan for Howard's murder. Mike decided to use the false narrative that Jimmy and Kim set up for Howard and made it seem like Howard got high on blow and took his own life. So Mike had Howard's vehicle driven several states over to a beach with the odometer of the car set to the exact mileage it would have been to get there, with Howard's wallet, wedding ring, and some planted druggies left inside. One of Howard's shoes was then left on the beach, along with another being thrown into the water to wash ashore to create a trail to imply where Howard went. This evidence would imply that Howard abandoned his life and made the conscious decision to get high and leave his ring and wallet in his car so he could walk into the water and purposely drown. This will cause the authorities to rule it as an unaliving, hoping that the body would wash ashore, but it never will. As part of the cover-up, since Howard's vehicle was parked at Kim's apartment all night long, it would become common knowledge that Jimmy and Kim were the last people to ever see Howard alive. So Mike tells them that once they catch word of Howard's death, they should call the police and tell them that Howard did indeed show up to the apartment, but that he seemed to be under the influence of some sort of substance as he wasn't making much sense, and then simply left. Mike then directed Jimmy and Kim to go into work that day and act as if nothing was wrong, and while they did so, he'd completely clean up Kim's apartment so that any evidence of the crime scene would be completely gone by the time they returned home that evening. This also includes any evidence of Jimmy and Kim's scheme towards Howard, as we even see Mike taking the sticky notes down off their con board and burning it alongside any other evidence. As Mike tells Gus the following night, both Jimmy and Kim played their part in the cover-up to a T. Mike Mike tells Gus that since the authorities never found Howard's body, they technically can't close the case, but by all purposes, it's over as they've successfully covered up Howard's murder and covered their tracks. So with that taken care of, the only thing left to do is for Jimmy and Kim to make an appearance at Howard's memorial service at HHM. As they enter the lobby, we can see tons of photos of Howard at his happiest, which, fun fact, are actually mostly all photos from Patrick Fabian's actual Instagram account. The first person they really speak to is Rich Schweikart, who admits that this is probably the last time any of them will even be in the building, as HHM is downsizing and changing its name to Bruckner Partner, as all three people that HHM was named after are now dead. So Howard's death also marks the downfall of HHM as well, which is even more tragic considering Howard was on the upswing for the past 2 seasons. Rich calls it the end of an era, which couldn't be more true. He then directs them towards Cheryl, who they haven't spoken to yet, but begrudgingly know that they have to. After Jimmy introduces himself, Kim gives her a hollow gesture that if there's anything she ever wants them to do, they'd be happy to help. Cheryl actually takes her up on that immediately, as she brings up how they were the last ones to see Howard alive, along with mentioning Jimmy's harassment towards Howard. Jimmy's put in a tough spot. He wants to avoid any culpability, but struggles to outright lie to her face. He states that he knows what Howard thought he was doing and how Howard truly believed it, but in such a way where Jimmy is trying to imply it's not true and just one big delusion. Since Jimmy's harassments included framing Howard for doing drugs and seeing prostitutes, when Cheryl accuses Jimmy of denying everything, Jimmy tries instead painting a different picture in order to make sense of why Howard would think that Jimmy hates him, as Jimmy admits that he didn't leave HHM on the best terms, and that in hindsight he should have been more kind to Howard instead of giving him a hard time every chance he got. Jimmy then tries explaining his distaste towards Howard by trying to garner sympathy from Cheryl by admitting that he was always jealous of Howard for having Chuck's respect, which is something he tried so hard to get but never had. Instead of sympathizing with Jimmy's point of view, Cheryl asks them to repeat what they told the police and accuses them of trying to imply that Howard was on drugs, as she's heard all the rumors but doesn't believe it. Cheryl clearly isn't buying anything that Jimmy's saying, so she turns to Cliff, who's been standing there with her the whole time, I probably should have mentioned that, and tells him that none of this makes sense. Cliff starts trying to imply that this isn't the place nor time, but Cheryl's fed up with all the lies and rumors, stating how she doesn't care what people say or think, but that Howard was not on drugs, as that's totally unlike him. So Kim, who's just been standing there the whole time while Cheryl and Jimmy spoke, realizes that Jimmy's method of approach isn't working and that Cheryl's not buying anything, so she steps up to manipulate Cheryl into believing their false narrative herself. Kim starts making up a fake story about an experience she supposedly had while working at HHM about 1.5 years ago, where she was there late one night and saw that a light was still on in Howard's office. To her surprise, she states how she saw Howard face down at his desk snorting something. Cheryl instantly scoffs at the absurdity of this. Kim continues by saying how she was so surprised of what she saw that they didn't say anything to each other and that she just simply walked away. Then when they saw themselves the next day, neither of them acknowledged it and just pretended like it never happened. It's not just Kim's story in particular that starts to cause Cheryl to believe this false narrative, but it's the way that Kim tells her story in such a sympathetic and caring manner. She tells Cheryl that she regrets not telling anyone and that she wishes she did, as the classic "I could have prevented this if I had done something differently" in hindsight cliche. Although Cheryl's still holding out, she turns to Cliff for affirmation, who at this point doesn't know what to think. Even though everything Cliff saw looked incredibly bad for Howard, he always wanted to give Howard the benefit of the doubt in regard to his accusation of Jimmy setting him up. However, after hearing what both Jimmy and Kim have said, he's unsure who to believe, especially when Cheryl puts him on the spot. So when Cheryl asks him if he's ever seen any sort of hint to Howard having drug addict behavior, Cliff's response implies that he may have, but he doesn't want to hurt Cheryl by saying so, instead telling her again that this isn't the time nor place to be discussing this, as he doesn't intend on dogpiling on Cheryl during Howard's memorial with accusations of Howard actually being a drug addict. Since Cliff is such an overall good person and friend, Cheryl believes him, and so she starts to break down when she realizes that she may have seen instances that would have implied Howard had a drug problem too. Then to hit the nail in the coffin, Kim continues to gaslight Cheryl in the most devious way imaginable. She approaches Cheryl in a sympathetic way while also using reverse psychology by stating that since Cheryl was Howard's wife, if anyone would have seen or known about Howard's potential drug problem, it'd be her. This completely breaks Cheryl because the reality of it is that she wouldn't know even if it was true. Kim's implying that she's a great wife who was always there for Howard and supported him, but really she wasn't. Since Howard told Jimmy and Kim that the marriage was failing, Kim seems to be using this to her advantage to guilt Cheryl by making her realize how she wasn't there for Howard when she should have been. Since Cheryl's been distant from Howard and has given him the cold shoulder for over a year, it's very possible she could have missed all the warning signs and was completely oblivious to how much pain and suffering Howard was in due to their failing marriage. Plus, it's just insult to injury considering how hard Howard was trying to repair their marriage while Cheryl wasn't reciprocating that whatsoever. This potentially causes Cheryl to believe that not only did she not notice Howard's problem due to neglecting him, but that her neglection of him could have been the very force driving his drug and adultery problem in the first place. This causes Cheryl to start believing that not only did she not help prevent Howard from taking his own life when she could have, but that she was actively causing him to go down that route without even realizing it. Cheryl then runs off to cry in the bathroom, and Cliff leaves to go find Cheryl's sister so that she can go support her. Now, to give context for what I want to talk about next, Kim's unable to live with herself over what happened, so she quit the law, divorced Jimmy, and completely left her life in Albuquerque behind to instead move to Florida. Meanwhile, with Jimmy's heart broken and Kim gone, there's nothing to hold him back from becoming Saul Goodman full-time, as he accepts all the Sandpiper money to himself and continues his law practice while buying a big mansion with a fancy car due to Kim not wanting any part of the money. This leads us into the Breaking Bad timeline of 2008 to 2010, where throughout this whole time period, everyone believes that Howard took his own life, including Cheryl. Now, since Howard obviously isn't mentioned at all during Breaking Bad, let's jump past the Breaking Bad area as we get thrown into the Gene timeline, which is of course post-Breaking Bad after Saul's gone into hiding. Again, to make a long story short, after Gene hears from Francesca that Kim asked about him, he decides to call her out of the blue. This conversation quickly goes south, however, as Kim's been so stricken with grief and guilt that she's bottled up over the past few years. When she hears Jimmy over the phone, she tells him he should turn himself in, when truly she's projecting how she always wanted to turn herself in, but was never able to due to being in fear of Gus or the cartel retaliating. When Jimmy throws this back at her, telling her to turn herself in instead, as all involved parties preventing her from doing so are now dead, he didn't really mean it, but she decides to do so anyways now with the knowledge that Mike, Gus, and the Salamancas won't be coming after her if she does. So Kim returns to Albuquerque and hands in a full confession to the DA office explaining what truly happened to Howard, including all parties except Jimmy, such as Lalo, Gus, Mike, etc. Not only that, but Kim also makes a personal visit to Cheryl to hand her over a copy of her confession as well, as she believes that Cheryl deserved to learn the truth. Now, I first want to discuss how Cheryl's been dealing with how tainted Howard's legacy has become. Thinking back to the mediation meeting embarrassment, if Howard would have lived on, it would have been nothing more than a huge speed bump in his life. However, since that was the last time he was ever seen publicly, it's become his final impression on everyone that was there or has heard about it. That, combined with the authorities finding drugs in his car and ruling his death as an unaliving while under the influence, really ruined Howard's reputation by causing everyone who's ever known him to believe that his story is but a tragic one of a lawyer who established a drug problem, cheated on his wife with prostitutes, and couldn't live with his life anymore because of it. In order to try and lighten the blow of the truth on Cheryl, Kim tries explaining how he died in an instant and that he didn't feel any pain, but Cheryl becomes incredibly offended at this considering how much mental anguish Jimmy and Kim put Howard through as a result of their schemes harassing him and burning him to the ground, of course also resulting in completely ruining Howard's legacy. Even though Kim wishes to confess the truth and let it be known to everybody, the damage already done to Howard's reputation throughout the years is irreversible. Even if Kim could get the news out about the truth that Howard was murdered, the false narrative about him having a drug problem has been spread so far and wide that it'll never go away, as it's had years to manifest itself to the point that there's no way everyone who originally heard about Howard's supposed drug problem will then hear about the truth. Kim admits that although she wants to try and fix Howard's tainted legacy, she doesn't know if she'll be held responsible in the form of going to trial or getting arrested, as there's no physical evidence to back up her confession, so the DA may not act on it. Since the person who murdered Howard is long dead, Lalo, along with everyone else who helped cover up the murder, Mike and Gus, there's no one to prosecute and slap the cuffs on, meaning that there's no one to punish in order to bring Howard's death to justice. Likewise, since everyone who knew the location of Howard's true burial is now dead as well, even with Kim's confession, they'll still never be able to recover the body, which means that they have no proof of her confession, along with obviously still meaning that Cheryl will never be able to properly put Howard to rest. Cheryl's just now learning the truth, so her desire for justice causes her to threaten to sue Kim in civil court and take everything she has, which Kim doesn't fight against, as she knows what she did was wrong and doesn't want to stand in the way of any course of action that Cheryl sees fit. With everyone else dead and Jimmy still in hiding, Kim's really the only person left to take the blame for Howard's murder, which she seems to be okay with, since even though she didn't pull the trigger, she feels like she's at just as much fault as the person who did. We never truly find out if Cheryl does end up taking Kim to civil court. Even if she did, as you may know, it wouldn't be nearly as life-ruining as Kim being tried in criminal court. That said, we do get a few more details elaborating on it that I'd like to mention. After Jimmy is caught hiding his gene and finds out from the prosecution that Kim has already confessed about Howard, he asks his lawyer, Bill Oakley, for further details. After Oakley catches Jimmy up to speed, he also tells Jimmy that Cheryl's been shopping around for lawyers, meaning that she still plans on taking some form of action as she's opened herself up for a civil suit. Jimmy then tells Oakley how the government doesn't know the half of what truly happened to Howard, and that he wants Oakley to tell the prosecution that he has more information to trade about it. Oakley warns Jimmy that if this information he has involves Kim, it'd be really bad for her, but that's the whole point. As it turns out, Jimmy didn't actually have anything else to admit about Howard's case, he just wanted to lie to the prosecution execution in order to trick Kim to showing up for his hearing. During the hearing, Jimmy mainly focuses on Walt and then Chuck, but he barely speaks about Howard.
I lied to the government about Kim Wexler. Fed him a load of BS about her involvement in Howard Hamlin's murder. I just wanted her to come here today.
Even so, I still want to mention what Jimmy says about Chuck because I find it relevant towards Howard. Jimmy finally admits to the entire courtroom that he was the one who sabotaged Chuck's malpractice insurance, which ultimately led to his death. This is important because Jimmy is admitting to the guilt that he pushed onto Howard, although Howard sadly died never knowing the truth, meaning that Jimmy's confession about it is too little too late. In regard to Howard himself, all Jimmy says is that what happened to Howard was horrible, but that Kim had nothing to do with it, trying to absolve her of any culpability, and that is the final time we hear Howard's name spoken or referred to in the entire show.
What happened to Howard Hamlin? It was... I can't even...
No closure for what will happen between Cheryl and Kim, or Jimmy now that he's been caught. Now, since Jimmy's in prison, is it possible that he could act as a witness for Cheryl about Howard's murder? The two main things hindering the DA from acting upon Kim's confession is the fact that there's no other witnesses and no evidence. Now, there is one exception to that, as Kim even said herself when she gave Cheryl her confession. All other witnesses are dead except Jimmy, if he was even still alive. Well, as it turns out, Jimmy was alive and now he's captured. So couldn't Jimmy act as the star witness in Howard's murder case? Would he even do so, or would he just deny everything? Plus, since Jimmy was completely honest about Walter White and even Chuck during his hearing in the final episode, it's possible Jimmy would be willing to tell the full truth about Howard's murder as well. Granted, it may have already been implied that the reason why Jimmy didn't open up about Howard in his hearing in the final episode is that he didn't want to implicate Kim. Even though Better Call Saul wrapped up everything nicely throughout the final season, there's still a handful of unanswered questions, especially when it comes to Howard of all people. So what do you think? Will Cheryl have anything to say about this? Will she sue Kim in civil court? And does Jimmy's arrest change things? Let me know in the comments and I may give an updated discussion in a future video. Moving on to one final thing though, who's in the mood for a random hypothetical? What if Howard didn't die and continued to live past episode 607? On one hand, looking at it with a glass half full perspective, it would have most likely just cut his losses with the Sandpiper case and moved on to other cases while continuing to rebuild HHM and restoring his reputation. As Howard even said during his final scene, he will bounce back. That said, would he truly be able to move on with his life? Would he have been able to repair his marriage with Cheryl? I'm not too sure, as it seems like the only wake-up call Cheryl got was Howard's death and being gaslit into believing that she was part of the problem. On the other hand though, in Howard's final moments, he vowed to dedicate his life to exposing Jimmy and Kim, which sure sounds like he was starting to develop a vendetta against them, just like Chuck's vendetta against Jimmy. It's possible that Howard would have fixated on Jimmy and Kim instead of moving on with his life, which would have most likely resulted in his downfall in a similar manner to Chuck. Needless to say that Howard was robbed of the chance to show the world the type of people that Jimmy and Kim truly are, but if Chuck's efforts are any indication, it wouldn't have ended up going well for Howard anyways. I'm not usually too into random what if hypotheticals, but I do think the what if Howard wasn't murdered hypothetical is interesting to talk about. He had HHM on the upswing and was ready to work through his public humiliation and bounce back, with the caveat that he may have wasted the opportunity to move on with his life by fixating on exposing Jimmy and Kim. To be fair, Howard was buzzed when he said those things, so who's to say if he would have truly made it his life's mission to expose them, or if he would have eventually just given up and accepted defeat, especially since Jimmy and Kim probably would have fought back and done something dirty in order to defend themselves against him, similar to the battery trick on Chuck during episode 305 Chicanery. Even though Howard did get a lot more recognition from viewers in the final season of the show, I still think his story is somewhat unappreciated, so I'm happy to shed some light on it, as his character is potentially one of the most tragic characters out of both shows. He has a character arc throughout the entirety of the show that's often overlooked, and after the big twist at the end of season 1 revealing that Howard wasn't the true antagonist, thankfully they were able to elaborate on Howard's character in ways they never could have before. Then after Chuck died throughout the second half of the show, Howard becomes way more of a sympathetic character as we explore his depression along with his road to recovery, plus everything he tried to set right afterwards. I'm glad the show gave Howard the spotlight he deserved in the final season by utilizing his character in the best way possible instead of just forgetting about him. Howard was in 43 out of 63 episodes, but all of his scenes compiled together, he has less screen time than I thought. He's a very memorable character that has a great impact on the show. Not only did they keep bringing Howard's character back, but the way they implemented him into season 6 was very grandiose. It not only builds off of Jimmy's childish pranks towards him in the previous season, but they put Howard in the spotlight in season 6 and built him up in such a way that his death arguably became one of the most impactful deaths of the entire show, which would also cause a ripple effect throughout the rest of the final season, even into post-Breaking Bad during the Gene timeline, as Howard's death was the main reason why Jimmy and Kim broke up, which resulted in Jimmy becoming Saul, Kim moving to Florida, along with them both eventually turning themselves in. All in all, it was a lot of fun to cover the entire story of Howard Hamlin, and I am really surprised this video is this long. I knew it was going to be a big one, but I didn't expect it to be larger than my Mike video, for example. Now I gotta give credit to Patrick Fabian, who did an outstanding job portraying this brilliantly written character, as I've always found him to be one of the most interesting characters to discuss if you couldn't already tell. Actually, some of you veterans of the channel may possibly remember, between the airing of seasons 5 and 6 of Better Call Saul, I mentioned how I had planned to do a large 3-part video series about Howard that I never ended up getting around to, so most of those notes actually got absorbed into this video. Since Howard is widely used as a supporting character, the show isn't meant to have its focus solely on Howard, but rather how Howard affects the main characters that are Jimmy, Kim, and Chuck. So it was fascinating to instead look at everything from Howard's perspective and analyze him as the main character of his own story. After doing so many mini videos discussing different parts of Howard's scenes throughout the show, it feels very satisfying to be able to compile them all into one timeline and break it down as one cohesive story. Let me know who you want me to do a full character spotlight retrospective of next. It can be from either Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, or both, no matter how large or small of a role. In the meantime, feel free to check out my most recent Breaking Bad tier list retrospectives, as there's plenty of hours worth of content there to tide you over until my next big project. Oh, and since I haven't mentioned it yet in a video, thank you all so much for 50,000 subscribers to the channel. Your support truly means the world to me, and here's to the road to 100k. Also, to those of you who haven't subscribed yet, hey, how's it going? Thanks for randomly sitting through this multi-hour retrospective about one of my favorite fictional characters. These videos can take a really long time to make, so I'd appreciate a like on the video if you've enjoyed anything I've said today, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet already for more Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul retrospectives in the near future. But most importantly, I thank you all so much for watching, especially to the end of such a long video. It means a lot, and until next time, I'll talk to you all later. Peace out.
So, have you thought any more about the job?